Chapter 6. Mimesis and Praxis. Taking certain precautions in order not to extrapolate, not mistake a risk for a fatality and a hypothesis for truth, let us try to state, according to what we know today, the dangers and possibilities that technology conceals. We may leave aside science fiction, a mixture of curiously archaic themes, telepathy, occultism, spiritism and spiritualism. Vulgar themes, objects and machines that rebel against their human creator, and prospective themes, what to do in a society without labour. What we should look for are real discoveries of a scientific order, ideological interpretations, extrapolations, fabulations. Yet there is an imperceptible transition from one to the other, from science to science fiction, which has the incontestable interest of revealing the most threatening possibilities, by its combination of dramatic depictions of the future with ancient myths. Let us simply consider the science that makes it possible to build automatons. This teaches us first of all that movement is analysed into three types or levels. Spontaneous movement involving a qualitative modification and alteration, mechanical movement involving the movement of a body in space with greater or lesser use of energy, but always considerable, and transition to a final equilibrium in conditions imposed on the moving body, and movement endowed with a self-regulation determining its own conditions of equilibrium in relation to an environment. Now, we can remark that the third kind of movement, which takes place in mechanisms constructed by human thought, reproduces the first as well as adding something to it. The one, an allusion to the masterly Clifford D. Simak, City 1952, London, Victor Gollancz 2011. Self-regulating movement has a spontaneity. It possesses qualities that it essentially preserves throughout the alterations imposed on it. The automaton is no longer simply a mechanical machine. It moves of itself and maintains itself through changes and alterations. It preserves itself. It no longer transforms relatively enormous quantities of energy into mechanical displacements, as do classical machines, locomotives, for example. It captures very small quantities of energy provided by its environment, by its milieu. It uses these to inform and govern the energetic processes it contains. It is constructed to respond to stimuli from this milieu by appropriate action, and adapts itself to this. These automatons are increasingly complex, and there is no advanced limit to their degree of complexity. Mechanical complication no longer answers the definition of complexity, as the latter is definable and even measurable. Information theory quantifies quality, or at least a certain quality. It allows a measurement of novelty and variety. Subsequently, this measurement enters into the mechanisms. Automatons, already capable of adapting to disturbances in their umwelt environment and containing complex autoregulations, homeostatic systems, are perhaps already capable of modifying their own program and repairing themselves in case of accident. The automatic machine is a machine as it is constructed, breaks down into its component parts, and can be rebuilt according to a rule doubly determined, functional and structural. At the same time, it simulates life and thought. To what point does this simulation go, and to what point will it go? To indefinitely approaching the living and thinking model, reaching this, even superseding it in certain aspects, calculating power, intellect, or intelligence, while remaining behind in others' sensation, emotionality. The machine, like art and the artist before it, imitates nature, animals, and man as organisms living and thinking. It reproduces these on the basis of inert material nature, without the possibility of assigning limits to this reproduction. Perhaps the automaton will define and cross the steps and transitions between materiality that is in appearance inert, and thought that appears to proceed from itself alone, between what certain philosophers would call the in itself and the for itself. Cyberneticians raise a certain number of questions for discussion. What indexes make it possible to distinguish an automaton from a living creature, leaving aside operations that would destroy their object, submitting it to radiation, etc.? Are these indexes on the physiological level, the psychological level, or the social level? According to cyberneticians, it is only in terms of the memory of an automaton that this function can be correctly defined. Human memory differs from this as it has gaps. The human being forgets, perhaps because he wants to forget. The memory of the automaton is correct and perfect. In the same way are its intellect and its language, at least virtually. Automatons will speak the universal meta-language, reached by successive approximations, algol, scintille, etc., present-day machine languages. Human discourse differs from this by its imperfections, excessive and useless redundancy, spaces between morphemes, words, silences. In the human being, emotion that seems completely personal and draws it into illusions of subjectivity is simply disturbance, hesitation. The automaton also expects, it examines all possible combinations and makes the right choice. It is more intelligent than the human being. Shall we say that it can neither laugh nor cry? But it can, so long as the programmer has well-defined laughter and tears, the situation for laughter and the corresponding stimulus. And tears likewise. Spontaneity? That is not a distinctive criterion, since the automaton rediscovers it in the only precise meaning of the term, that which moves of itself, containing and preserving the principle of its movement. Dreams? Imagination? Given that these terms are defined as a function of the possible and the aleatory, they can be attributed to the automaton. All that remains for man are the illusions of subjectivity, the gaps, the holes. He would be an inferior automaton, and yet, if the automaton can be programmed to react differentially in relation to sexed beings, it is impossible at the present time to conceive it as having a sex. Would the distinctive criterion be biological, that is to say, in itself, non-human? We know, moreover, that the question of individual and psychophysiological automatism is overlaid, or rather, complemented, by that of social automatism. Social controls, ready-made behavioral models, the influence of patterns, tend, as we know, only too well to robotize humans into groups and by groups. The ability to code them onto punch cards proves this, as both result and effective cause. The question that is raised, therefore, is that of hominization, a term we borrow from Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, to show the determination of his theology of automatons or the robotization of men. Has not the human being, in a parody of the God of Genesis, created the automaton in his own image in order to summon it to him and recognize himself in it? This encounter, this association, this strange couple and its product, we could call the cybernanthrope. Are we already cybernanthropes? W.R. Ashby, in Introduction to Cybernetics, defines this as the science of control and communication in animal and machine like the art of government. He adds, ironically, the truths of cybernetics are autonomous. They do not depend on any other branch of science. Cybernetics has its own foundations. It is to the actual machine, mechanical, electrical, nervous, economic, what geometry is in relation to the objects of our terrestrial space. It has as its particular object the domain of all possible machines. It is thus in a position to indicate new interesting and suggestive parallelisms between machine, brain, and society. In particular, it brings a common language, which enables one branch of science to utilize a discovery by another. Let us note the interest of these declarations by an eminent specialist, the discoverer of celebrated properties and mechanisms, Ashby's quadrupole, on the autonomy of the principles of cybernetics and their totalizing character in relation to the particular sciences. Whether this claim is well-founded or not, the aim of cyberneticians is certainly to constitute a total science of the real, not a particular one, by realizing mechanisms, dispositives machines. 3. William Ross Ashby, An Introduction to Cybernetics, London, Methuen, 1965, p. 1. In this work, Ashby presents, apropos homeostasis, the idea of autonomy and unity in a self-moving technological system. Taking account both of changes in the environment and of changes in the system itself, this makes it possible to connect the notions of automatization, autonomy, and spontaneity. Ashby, An Introduction to Cybernetics, P6, CF, also pp. 101-2, the important definition of the homeostat, P201, and the proposition on systems of complex regulation. According to Norbert Wiener, in cybernetics and society, apprenticeship is essential for man to attain maturity, both as species and as individual. Such apprenticeship, we would say, is mimesis, the mimetic repetition of gestures or behaviors which succeeded in a threatening situation in the face of a danger. What is the essence of this apprenticeship? It has been revealed by machines, according to Wiener. Apprenticeship is a form of feedback, in which the pattern of behavior is modified by past experience. The principle of feedback means that behavior is studied in such a way that the result, whether successful or not, modifies future behavior. Apprenticeship is therefore a complicated form of feedback. Present-day machines are able to incorporate the result of their own behavior. In so-called homeostatic systems, there is a reintroduction into the system of the results of its action. The information returns to it. The performances of such machines thus reproduce very well those of the living organism and the thinking brain. They reproduce the path leading from matter to mind. This reproduction becomes an object of production and a produced object. These propositions, recently vulgarized and extended to society by the inventor of the word cybernetics, are not recent. Before philosophy seized on them, science fiction novelists had followed these hypotheses to their conclusion, sometimes very imaginatively. Several years ago already, Pierre de Latil drew from nascent cybernetics an image of the universe. He described cybernetic animals, complete with their anatomy, robots capable of imitating animal life even in digestion and the appearance of sleep. He described and analyzed retroaction in the wake of the theoretical work of Claude Shannon and Norbert Wiener, simple or complex feedback as the principle. 6. The governing machine appears in a Ivan Vogt, The World of Nallet, London, Simon and Schuster, 1948. On the robot that approaches man by imitating him, cf. Pygmalion 2113 by Edmund Cooper, Paris, Deneuel, 1959. And above all, Clifford Simak's work of Genius City. C. Pierre de Latil, La Pensée Artificielle, Paris, Gallimard, 1953. Secret of Organic Nature, as revealed by automatons, the models of an image of the universe that is formed in this way borrow from Descartes and Julien Offray de la Mettrie, Animal Machines. Locke, The Passivity of the Mind, Condillac, The Animated Statue, Jacques Loeb Tropisms, and even Pavlov, Conditioned Reflexes. What is quite clear is that 18th century materialism, devoid of dialectic, makes a return here. A well-known passage from Condillac's Traité Systèmes is not far from contemporary texts of the structuralist school. Condillac wrote here, "To speak in an understandable manner, one's ideas must be conceived and put forward in the analytical order that decomposes and recomposes each thought. In fact, if I want to understand a machine, I shall decompose it in order to study each part separately. When I have an exact idea of each and can put them back in the same order in which they were, I shall then perfectly conceive this machine because I shall have decomposed and recomposed IU. If we add to this text the concepts of functional and structural, spelled out since Condillac's time, we have a very modern statement. Here is a summary of a lecture given in December 1963 to the Société Française Aisée de Cybernétique by its president, Louis Couffignal. An eminent scientist and the introducer of binary numeration into machines, the calculus that reduces all numbers to combinations of 0 and 1. Cybernetic thought holds itself out as a general method. It proclaims a balanced, harmonious human future. It gives a promising and almost utopian image of this. From the cybernetic method of thinking, we shall retain the following characteristics. The primordial concern for efficiency, which presupposes the definition of aims and a total eclecticism in the choice of means. Analogical reasoning, generally realized by way of models. 7n, Etienne Bonnot de Condillac, Logique Gand van de Gatkov, 1826, pp. 22-3. The analogy between a living being and a human society leads to the notions of economic and enterprise function, defined as a human society whose activity is aided by material means. This predominance of the human element over the material element leads us to discover the importance of professional skill, an enterprise structure made up of self-organizing units, informational circuits, and the role of the government of the enterprise and of administrative organisms. Analysis of the aims leads us to discover, right the way through, the role of the spirit of domination, undoubtedly bound up with the scarcity of the material goods necessary to human life. The advance of technology will make it possible in a very short time to suppress this scarcity. It will then be possible to assign to the whole of human economic activity the aim of assuring all people reasonable satisfactions. Professor François Perroux has formulated a planetary economic policy of this kind and an appropriate ethics. The cybernetics of enterprise functioning briefly described above offers a sure method for attaining this aim at the lowest costs. From this declaration we note the political indifference of technocracy, capable of making use of all means, those of the left as well as those of the right, those of both democracy and monopolistic capitalism, to arrive in power and keep the commandment. The image of the governing machine is therefore not just a theme of science fiction. These machines would subject an already over-organized industrial society by way of institutions. They would group existing systems into a single system, the state, art, philosophy. They would consolidate structural equilibriums determined by operational demands, machines and technologies being clearly an integral and integrating part of these. With von Neumann's propositions having the force of theorems, teaching us that a complex homeostatic self-regulating system can control and even generate a more complex system. Cybernetics transgresses an old philosophical presupposition according to 8n. We have been unable to trace the exact reference, but Louis Couffignal was author of the Introductory Questionnaire, volume Le Cybernétique, the same year, 9 cf. Van Vogt, The World of Nallet, also P. Dubar in Le Monde, 28 December 1948, and finally Wiener, The Human Use of Human Beings, pp. 178 ff. Which the inferior cannot create the superior. The machine, now highly complex, tackles the problems of complexity, reserved up until now for philosophers. Does von Neumann's theorem not apply to the totality of machines, objects, products, human relations, the living body and knowledge, to the great automaton that will be born from the ensemble of mechanisms installed? What has been designed and built by technology can move of itself, reproduce earlier movements of life to thought and produce them in itself. Why then should mimesis not be the first and last operation of nature and thought, simulating pure spontaneity until the day when the subjective illusion collapses and mimesis turns out to be truth? We can go still further. The automaton moves of itself and governs its movements. Are not automatism and autocorrelation and natural spontaneity basically identical to organization? If man is drawn from automation, from the general spontaneity that animates the universe, automatons or reduced models, minuscule duplicates of the automatic power of nature, are we not on the road towards an automatic functional society? Frederick Pollock, in his book on automation, wrote, "An economic system could be maintained automatically in equilibrium thanks to the methods of feedback. As with any feedback, it would be a question of correcting oscillations while these are still minimal. This kind of automatism can only be effective if society has decided to put these formulas into practice. We can characterize the present situation by saying that machines can accomplish on the economic level almost everything of which man is capable, except purchasing the goods produced. Black humor this, and perhaps unintended. Moreover, why not construct robots that would buy and consume products? In fact, we rediscover a familiar idea here. In unexpected form, there is always a 10 Pierre Neville, vers l'automatisme social, Review from Age de Sociologie, 1960 No. 1, p. 280. 11 Frederick Pollock, The Economic and Social Consequences of Automation, Oxford, Blackwell, 1957, p. 199. Residue that resists something irreducible, in this case no more and no less than man as consumer. Pierre Neville, in developing the article cited above into a book, emphasized the spontaneity of the automaton and the fact that social. Man can enter the automatism of society while preserving natural. Spontaneity, in other words, without noticing, or to put it differently, even with satisfaction, a satisfaction that it might be best not to disturb, particularly with the outdated theory of alienation. Philosophy defends itself against this attack. Poorly. For Raymond Royer, free information is the transmission to a conscious being of a meaning, a notion, by way of a more or less conventional message. And a spatio-temporal pattern, M. Royer, seeks to demonstrate that information and information technology depend on consciousness. Presuppose it and do not challenge its metaphysical priority. There is only information, and thus an information machine for and through consciousness. This philosopher seems to underestimate the importance and seriousness of the quantification of the qualitative. The measure of novelty. Where is this consciousness located? In the circuit of information. In this case, it is trapped. From the start, or at 12. It may be that the future will see the establishment of a basic dichotomy, both for industry and for the whole advance of the civilization bound up with it. Between the maintenance of life and the creation of life, Pierre Neville writes in his book Vers l'automatisme social, Paris, Gallimard, 1963, p. 105. Up to this point, we can follow him, but not when he pronounces, it is perhaps its continuance, that is to say, its maintenance in the broadest sense, that constitutes its primordial aspect. In our view, Neville is too quick to accept the convergence between two partial systems, social relations and technological relations in production, in the division of labor, cf. p. 112 of his book. Let us mention that the new Soviet generation, heedless of Marxist philosophy and its prohibitions, proposes above all to win the competition with the Americans. It is accepted that science has directly become a productive force, and that science teaching and the training of technicians needs to be reshaped. The proposal is to teach recent mathematics right from the start, along with machine programming and the general laws of biology and electricity. This scientific propedeutic exactly corresponds to a cybernetizing and technocratizing of scientific teaching. The task remains of combining traditional humanism with cybernetics in Soviet Marxist ideology, or alternatively, of liquidating it. Raymond Royer, La cybernétique et l'origine de Information, Paris, Flammarion, 1954, Paris. But then, what is the exact relationship of creative activity to its product, to its work? We know that this relationship no longer corresponds to the models proposed by classical philosophy, subject-object, artisan-work-thing, value to something that bears or supports it. Not only can the dead take hold of the living, it may well be that the thing is no longer exactly dead or exactly alive in the strict sense, but intermediate and transitional between these poles. That it is animated, imitates the living and thinking, which in turn imitates it. Being and nature, becoming and action, would then be in no way given to man in apoiesis, nor even in praxis, but in mimesis. Truth would be discovered at the heart of appearance, in an unexpected fashion. Machines have taught men how far they proceed by disjunctions and dichotomies, binary oppositions, contrarieties by yes and no, in language and decisions. The machine reveals the truth of the structures of body and brain, of discourse, action and consciousness. Discovery of these structures, in turn, permits the unlimited perfecting of the machine. By imitating nature, it imitates man who forms part of this objective nature. Thus appearance and simulation, mimesis, would be at the same time real and bearers of truth. The appearance and imitation of thought and life would lead to the truth of life and thought. Man knows himself, recognizes himself, realizes himself in his work, his being other, the machine. The other being, his image, would also be himself. Information theory would contain a philosophical or quasi-philosophical conception of mimesis. Redundancy, the repetition of elements of the repertoire that is indispensable to all communication, makes for the intelligible form of the message. Information contrasts with redundancy in the same way as surprise to the expected, diversity to repetition, disorder to established order, and the aleatory to the accomplished fact recorded in memory. Any message, simple or complex, any communication, would thus stand between the banality of the intelligible that repeats and is repeated, and absolute novelty, unintelligible simply by reason of. 14 Ibid, p. 225, the conclusion of the book, its excessive novelty, yet well defined by the disorder equi-probability of signs used. With the message occupying intermediate place between overly strict order and excessive disorder, between rigid form and the unformed, the privileged domain of mimesis is determined. Between repetitive praxis that is necessary but insufficient and the pure event. Mimesis is double. It reproduces an acquisition and aims at something inaccessible that it incompletely attains. The quality of information gained over the inaccessible that is too complex, chaotic and prolific can be calculated. This makes it possible to quantify the complexity of any message, and even each new combination of distinct elements, objects, acts, atoms of meaning, etc. Quantification accompanies the transition from the unstructured to the structural. In the name of quality itself, it moves in a dialectic of quality from qualitative data to the quantitative system. That would be the structure of all information, in other words, every message. Information theory brings a concept of intelligibility. Redundancy, repetition of elements of the repertoire, always made up of distinct and discrete atoms of meaning, defines the intelligible. This definition has a very general scope, as it is possible to consider as a message not only language and discourse, but no matter what interaction between two natural or social beings, and likewise as a consequence relations between two or more things, as well as sense perception among human individuals and relationships between them by way of discourse, images and symbols, the mediation of objects, the communication of acts and situations. The generality of the theory is shown by the fact that the fundamental magnitudes and equations present a remarkable analogy with those of thermodynamics or the theory of equilibrium and exchange of energy. Knowledge as constructor of mechanisms and machines in the wake of operatory calculations, and subsequently basing itself on these mechanisms and machines, has unquestionably made possible immense strides forward. Cybernetics is a science in full growth. The long opposition of Marxist philosophers who viewed cybernetics as mechanistic and formal logic as idealist has been unable to halt this growth. It only brought ridicule on Marxist dogmatism and played a bad trick on science in the Soviet Union. In this orientation, we see the dawn of a worldview based on a linkage between structural linguistics, information and communications theory, and perception theory. At a time when the use of the word structure is diversifying without always being made clear, when it is receiving ever new meanings, a new philosophy is also emerging, structuralism. Whether this actually is a philosophy we shall see. We would first like to distinguish between structuralism in practice and structuralism as ideology, that is, as philosophy. The specialist who dismantles and rebuilds a motor, who conceives it, repairs it, or improves it, thinks structurally. He views each component part in terms of its form and its function. The set of parts is more for him than their mere juxtaposition or sum it functions. Yet the motor breaks down analytically into these parts, each of which has its meaning in the whole that is built up from them. The parts are classified according to form or function, according to their differences and their relations of inclusion or exclusion. The technician who analyses and reconstructs functional systems is a structuralist in practice. Structuralism as ideology, however, tends to become a logic, a general method, an anthropology, even an ontology, links up with all sectors of knowledge, and presents itself as the link between the human sciences and those of nature. It also links up with aesthetic creation and sees itself as the link between the arts. In a brilliant article which appears like a manifesto of the young structuralist school, Roland Barthes elegantly sketches the difficulty. He presents structuralism as a style of activity, thought, life, rather than a philosophical doctrine. He speaks of structuralist activity. We see why it is necessary to speak of structuralist activity. Creation and reflection here are not an original impression of the world, but the making of a world that resembles the former, not to copy it, but to render it intelligible. Tactivite Structuralist, Lettres Nouvelles, number 32, February 1963, p. 74. The Structuralist Activity, Critical Essays, Evanston, Illinois, Northwestern University Press, 1972, U123-30. What he says of it, however, immediately assumes a philosophical scope and tone. Structuralist activity is that of structural man, meaning contemporary man, modern, not passé. This structural man takes the real, dissects it, recomposes it, yet he does not reproduce the real, he simulates it. Techne does not proceed according to poiesis, continuing physis, but according to mimesis. Structural man adds to the natural world a prefabricated world that does not copy nature, rather substituting for it intelligibility. This structural man is the man of technology and technicity, as technology is supposedly the essence of all creation. Structuralist activity is thus always bound up with the technology. It combines two fundamental operations, dissection into discrete units, atoms of meaning, and arrangement, agencement. Barthes thus defines at the same time the subject, man, the active intellect, the object, on the one hand the given real, on the other hand the constructed object, and their formal relations, analysis, technicality, disposition, simulation, intelligibility. Is he not proposing a methodology, an anthropology, a theory of the world, which is freighted with meanings and forms but can be simulated by technologies, in other words a philosophy? Unless it is simply a new mythology, bound up with the predominance of technology, it's autonomizing in relation to the world and human being. A philosophy of what? Implying what? Who is this structural man? What does he look like? That is our question, even if it parodies a bit the thought of this new structural man. We can say that he ostensibly prefers the prosthetic limb to the living one. Naturally, the prosthetic limb is useful and functional. It is incontestably more intelligible than the living limb, which it replaces for the injured person. It simulates this as well as possible. We cannot even rule out that it reveals some hidden structures. But can we not reply to our structural man that only the living limb has a meaning, that of life, despite not having the finished and dismantleable character of its artificial simulation? The living limb possessed this meaning before the construction of the simulacrum as part of a living whole. Not only does it have functions and a form, it forms itself. It has a history and refers to a history, that of the individual and that of the species. Could life and its history be reduced to an unintelligible and irrational residue left by the construction of simulacra? Still in a humorous mode, we can say that Roland Barthes introduces a cool style opposed to the hot style, tragic, bumpy, often impassioned of dialectical thought, that of becoming. But is this new style really a style? Is it not something else, or quite simply an absence of style, a degree zero of style which presents itself as a style? The conflict that has blown up between the structural and the historical dates from the beginnings of sociology. Starting from the thesis put forward by St. Simon that society constitutes an organic whole, Auguste Comte disassociated this whole and distinguished between social statics and social dynamics, placing priority on the former. For him, dynamics was subordinated to statics. This seeks the principles common to all societies, the laws of stable relations between the elements and the whole. Thus, empiricism and positivism from their beginnings have not been content to observe given facts, accepting them uncritically, without a perspective of profound transformations, which would already be enough to mark this thought with a reactionary character. They set out above all to find invariances, definitive stabilities, conditions of equilibrium. They sought to reveal and formulate the laws of all societies, to make the society of their time conform to their laws, and to do so against history. What becomes of history in such a conception? A series of illusions, errors, or oscillations around the terminal equilibrium, except perhaps when the history of mind and knowledge is presented. This attitude is expressed in Comte's famous attack on Napoleon, a man of history. By a curious internal contradiction, positivism was a philosophy, even a philosophy of history, directed against history and historical thought. This conflict, latent for more than a century, broke out when a society was established, contemporary American society, that did not have much history behind its actuality or its culture, and whose ideologists claimed to set up against the science of history a different science, empirical and quantitative sociology. A conflict of this kind also tended to break out because a society was heralded that claimed to have no other history than that of its technology, a society characterized in particular by cybernetics and automation, which has been given various names, none of which has particularly prevailed: industrial society, consumer society, affluent society, leisure society, mass society, technical society, etc. In these conditions, empiricism and positivism, reinforced by the use of new mathematical forms, believe they have carried the day. It is true that the conjuncture is favorable to them. Historical thought is uncertain, losing ground. Marxists who should represent and deepen it are lost in sterile philosophical controversies between proletarian and socialist materialism and bourgeois idealism. If not between proletarian science and bourgeois science, they neglect the real theoretical questions. Historical thought is then caught between bourgeois ideology and Stalinist ideology or its sequels. One side wants to liquidate history or have it liquidated. The other side rewrites it for the purposes of propaganda, which has made no small contribution to a crisis of historical objectivity. If it is true that we are still in the age of worldviews, and that such philosophical Weltanschauungen are not superseded, whereas Marx proposed the superseding of classical philosophy by realizing it, in and through revolutionary praxis, why not a structuralist worldview? The occasion is all the more favorable, given that structuralist thought proves flexible enough to envisage superseding the antinomy between statics and dynamics. And it does so by drawing inspiration more or less faithfully from Marxism. This is what Gaston Gilles Granger attempts in distinguishing several forms of equilibrium and elaborating the notion of balanced growth or balanced accumulation. 7. The structuralist worldview would then be defined as follows: R, structural or semantic reduction. The human being consists essentially of an analytical intellect. Man is above all a creator of forms and meanings. The rest, the content, is an irrational residue manifested only in the gaps and lacunae between forms. Systems and structures, B. This intellect has an essentially classificatory and combinatory function. It breaks down ensembles into elements and reconstitutes them, prevails over the invariances that it attains or constitutes. The capacity to combine arrangements and permutations simultaneously determines intellect and the intelligible instrument and object. What does this reduction bracket out? A good deal. The concrete complexity of praxis, that of man and that of the world. Dialectics, tragedy, emotion and passion. The individual certainly, and perhaps a large part of the social, and then history. All this falls into the residual, which has to bend itself to globalized technicality and disappear. The source and prototype of intelligibility is situated neither in individual consciousness, the classic Cartesian position continued in existential philosophy by Sartre, nor in being, the classic metaphysical position, continued and transformed by Heidegger, nor again in praxis, the Marxist position. This source and prototype is situated in language. 18. The formal operation of the structuralist intellect is dichotomy. This separates, divides, classifies into genres and kinds, determines formal differences, paradigms, conjunctions and disjunctions, binary oppositions, questions that it answers by a yes or a no. Leibniz already asserted, building on Lull's ars combinatoria, that the whole world, numbers and beings, arose from the opposition and combination of zero and unity. 19. We have to recognize that this conception has received powerful support in terms of calculating and translation machines built effectively on the binary principle, structural linguistics, development in pure and applied logic with games theory, decision theory, operational research, information theory. The definition of the intellect by separation, differences and dichotomy seeks to be functional and operational, which indeed it is. It undoubtedly corresponds to the fundamental. 19n. Ramon Lull, Raymundus Lullus, was a 13th century philosopher. Leibniz gave his theory of logic the name ars combinatoria, activity of technical thought. It thus links up with operationalism, a doctrine of efficacy, a praxeology. It enables nervous and cerebral activity to be presented as an activity of distinguishing, of choice, of oppositions in particular that between form and base, and consequently to connect physiological with psychological research, particularly that of the Gestalt theorists. We know only too well, moreover, that the metaphysics of becoming Hegelian and Marxist, or rather pseudo-Marxist, ended up forgetting that this becoming constitutes beings, and thus coherencies, provisional stabilities, precarious equilibriums, in a word, structures, before dissolving or breaking them. This chair, for example, will certainly not be around for all eternity. It will come to an end, worn out, broken up, burned. Becoming will carry it away, is already carrying it away. While waiting to disappear, it has 4 legs, a back, a surface for sitting, a structure, and a function. It cannot tolerate certain modifications without ceasing to be a chair, without losing its structure and function. As a stable object, it has a name and a concept. It corresponds to a sign that signifies its concept. It pertains to discourse and logic, despite remaining a chair. No one can say both that it is and is not a chair, until the painful moment when it ceases to be a chair, even though something remains of its form in the deteriorated object. The same can be said of every object, every technological arrangement, and even the Earth, Sun and Solar System, not to mention each heavenly body wandering in space until destroyed by cosmic becoming. Does restoring these considerations, stability, equilibrium, coherence, into cosmic and human becoming, involve a depreciation or elimination of this becoming? Is consideration of stabilities of things necessarily a symptom of reification? Must we remain with an evolutionism more or less complicated by the introduction of dialectical thought, contradictions, leaps, changes of quantity into quality? This is now our question. Paradoxes. Language, logos, discourse become prototypes of intelligibility and privileged sites of philosophical reflection. At the 20 Alphonse de Violon, Perspectives sur le langage, les temps modernes, number 205, June 1963, p. 529, moments when in social practice, around us, language dissolves, deteriorates, retreats to make way for the image. Language is fetishized at the same time as it is threatened. Communication and reflection on communication become fashionable at the very time that each conscious individual complains of the absence of genuine communication, of solitude, of the avalanche of pseudo-events. By combining into a synthesis, or rather, a syncretism, the functionalist and operationalist contentions, the new philosophy of structure offers itself, whether consciously or not, as the worldview of technocrats. Presents its candidacy for this disputed post, again whether consciously or not. It designates an extensive, perhaps unlimited domain of manipulations of men, of language, of objects. It wants to construct a world for us, or rather a simulacrum of a world. It is rather like what today's housing estates, simulacra that are the present-day products of technocracy, represent in relation to both historic towns and possible ones. This philosophy is not free of a certain risk, that of a cybernetizing of social man, oriented from within and controlled from without by machines on the basis of what is most essential, language. Is man treated in this way anything but a simulacrum of the human? Technocracy today needs an ideology that justifies it and makes possible the integration of the society that it seeks to construct. Now the mondialization of technology and the technocratic conception presupposes a reduction and even a liquidation of the historical scene as dead weight residue more embarrassing than picturesque. With the reign of pure technicality and technocrats, with the cybernetizing of society, we would no longer have a future in this historical sense, a temporality in the customary sense. We would enter a kind of eternal present, probably very monotonous and boring, that of machines, combinations, arrangements and permutations of given elements. There would be no other events than the introduction of new technologies, which moreover could make great demands. Unless deviants, who would be pursued with barbaric cruelty, intervene to derail the system. Unless destruction and self-destruction one day put an end to this world. Historical thought, on the other hand, maintains that contents have as much importance and interest as forms, if not more. It says that forms and structures are made and unmade, dissolve or break up. It places on the same level in time the formation of structures, structuration, and their disappearance, destructuration. Shows within structuration the commencing dissolution or inevitable explosion. For it, the historic past is not reduced to a dead weight or a picturesque superfluity. Differences manifest themselves as they have always done within worldwide technology, due to the history of societies, groups, classes, peoples, nations. History continues. The seemingly irrational demands its integration, not into a philosophy or forms that reject it, but into a conception of man as a whole, in the absence of which it rebels. The theory of alienation denounces fetishisms, splits, mutilations of the total human being. It particularly denounces technical, technological, technocratic alienation, recently promoted to the rank of major human alienation. And time? In the structuralist conception, it disappears as becoming, genesis and formation. It is reduced to the order of appearance of more or less probable combinations, with a lower limit in pure repetition and an upper limit in unpredictable combinations involving the most unusual elements. The notion of temporality disappears into that of entropy, measure of the degree of irreversibility, between the lower limit of the immutable and immobile order, absolute cold, and the upper limit, the frenetically disordered agitation of molecules. The aleatory enters into the calculation and is envisaged as such. Along with time, it is history that disappears in the world, or acquires a new aspect, opening onto a kind of technological temporality without history, or with its only history, that of combinations between technological operations. Technological rationality, then, goes a long way. It challenges and undermines many theoretical and practical elements that seem to form part of the definition of man, whether considered as Faber, Sapiens, or Ludens. It attacks time. This is far more than a matter of history considered as science of time, and heralds attacks on real practical time and its mutation into technological time, if this is allowed. It is scarcely a caricature of technological and cybernetic rationality, a rationality that, as we see ever more clearly, defines itself as understanding rather than reason to say that for it. Nature, or what passes for nature, scarcely counts for anything. It is an obstacle. It should be got rid of, the time devoted to these functions reduced or even substitutes found for them. Vital and cosmic rhythms? They are a kind of enemy to pursue in favor of a linear time broken into well-defined atoms semantemes. Technological and structuralist thought is culturalist. Like culturalism, it deprecates nature. Like structuralism, it brackets it out. Nature is simply residual, and history likewise. Man's relationship with his work would no longer be problematic. Man would no longer be lost in his work, but would rediscover himself in it. He would go from the machine to self-encounter. No more alienation in work and being other. On the contrary, knowledge and mastery are accomplished simultaneously, by way of mimesis. Philosophy comes to an end. It arose from an illusion about poiesis. Man sought to produce himself by thought alone, whereas it was in a different way and elsewhere that he encountered himself, in the works of labour, the tool becoming machine. And alienation, inasmuch as we can still speak of it, it is found in philosophy, in ideology and in art, traditional, not combinatory and operatory, in the form of erroneous interpretations of productive activity. Marxism, inasmuch as it contributed something, overcomes itself. Dialectic falls, and bare materialism with an ascetic and misanthropic tendency, as denounced by Marx, returns to the surface. The discovery of technology, of the machine, of labour, opens up a new era, that of technology and machinery liberated from any obstacle, liberatory. Technology is the very being of all creation. Structuralist activity, bound up with technicality, is defined by two operations, decomposition and arrangement. If robots converge with men, and man recognizes himself in this mimetic image, the spontaneity of the automaton, this is because man was already a robot. He did not know this. He is learning it. The nervous system and other biological physiological systems are self-regulating systems. The living body, a network of such systems, a complex homeostatic system of which Ashby's quadrupole offers a simplified model. The brain, a complex and imperfect machine for 22 are but the structuralist activity, P75. Recording, combining, disjoining, and arranging. Thought, a succession of yeses and nos, dichotomies, action, a series of strategic decisions in a complex play with nature and other social groups. If society can subsist, it is because it contains self-regulating systems. It is because it is already a homeostatic system. In the new sciences of information and communications, the combinatory essence of the real, its fundamental structure, is discovered and recognized. As for nature, it does not even exist. It was also just illusion and myth, still more, a residue.
Mimesis turns out to be the essence of praxis.
The appearances of appearance or of appearing fall away, those of poiesis, those of transcendence, of subjectivity and subjective freedom, of temporality and historicity, of nature as a whole. The robot is no threat to man, for the excellent reason that individual and social man is already a robot, and the threatening image of the robot is mere illusion. The figure of the monstrous and untamable golem, rebelling against the sorcerer's apprentice, would be simply a myth of the machine, and the myth of the robotic inhuman a myth of man. The two entities, automaton and human, meet up in a single category, the cybernanthrope. Marx's ideas on machinery are scattered throughout Capital, and the preparatory works towards this, but essentially in the second chapter of The Poverty of Philosophy. If there is a theory that overflows the competence of philosophy, it is that of the tool and the machine taken in praxis, in relations of production. As against Proudhon, the philosopher of poverty, Marx establishes first of all the practical and historical character of the division of labour. This was transformed from the 16th and 17th centuries on, particularly from the invention of machinery in the 18th century. It is unacceptable, therefore, to weigh as Proudhon does the advantages and inconveniences of the division of labour, its good and bad sides, on the basis of a general categorical definition. Machinery is no more an economic category than the ox that pulls a cart. Machinery is a productive force. The modern workshop, on the other hand, based on the use of machinery, is a social relation of production, a specifically economic category. Historically, it presupposes the market and the accumulation of capital. Marx clearly distinguishes between the technical division of labour and its social division. The technical division is constituted and commanded by the productive forces, instruments and machines and their utilization. The social division is grafted onto this technical division and adds something to it, for example, an ideology, professional narrow-mindedness. It is determined by the entire existing society. The automaton reduces labour to a few gestures, so it is liberating. Machinery, as such, is not alienating, on the contrary. It is simply its social use in class society, its insertion into contradictory social relations, that makes it a means for enslaving labour. In itself, having become automatic, it can take over all labour. It unites the total labour that was technologically divided and fragmented. Nothing less, but nothing more. It does not assure the full development of the individual. It makes this possible. The need for development grows together with automatism. The problem, therefore, is not to stop technology, but to take it to its conclusion. Writing some time later, Marx did not go back on these predictions. Along with the power of the instruments of production, the role of material labour and human labour time has to change. As soon as labour in the direct form has ceased to be the great wellspring of wealth, labour time ceases and must cease to be its measure. The surplus labour of the mass has ceased to be the condition for the development of general wealth, just as the non-labour of the few for the development of the general powers of the human head. With that, production based on exchange value breaks down. 23. It goes without saying that there were certain facts, events and conflicts that Marx could not see. How could he have supposed that the automatic machine would go so far as to imitate life and thought and incorporate analytical understanding, though his ironic reflections on the internal automatism of the Hegelian system contain some shadowy presentiment of this? No more could he foresee the extraordinary situation of modernity, technology bringing abundance and non-labour close and almost. 23. Critique of Political Economy. N. Karl Marx, Grundrisse, London, Allen Lane, 1973, p. Imminent for an almost unlimited number of human beings. And this proximity provoking the planetary drama of a transition in which no one knows what to do with millions and billions of these human beings, peasants, workers in ailing industries, bureaucrats and others. We rediscover here a familiar idea. For Marx, the revolution that with one bound crosses the gulf between blind necessity and the full freedom of rational man was to proceed and permit the liberation of technologies through their mastery. But history has not proceeded according to the envisaged pattern. It is richer in inventions and difficulties than Marx's dialectic proclaimed. And dialectical thought cannot dispense with the idea of an unlimited inventive wealth of history. Marx could not know, despite having proclaimed the process, that the law of uneven development would dominate a long transitional period. He could not know that the conflict between possible non-labor, the extension of leisure, and the demands of labor and indispensable accumulation would become one of the principal conflicts during this mutation. For the whole world, our planet, finds itself facing the necessity of a gigantic labor and colossal accumulation in order to realize the conditions of non-labor. How can hundreds of millions of peasants be absorbed when the production that is urgently needed demands fewer and fewer productive personnel? How are tens of millions of workers to be transformed into non-proletarians? Peasants are virtually suppressed, and the peasant problem becomes acute, all the more so in countries and regions that are less developed, and where the demands of accumulation are more urgent. The proletarian condition is virtually superseded, but nowhere is this virtuality realized. Abundance is possible, but the spectre of hunger still stalks the planet. Leisure is close, and this closeness translates into an obstinate labor more oppressive and exploited than previously, to the point that all some countries in the course of development can do is manage their uneven development, guard against too great ambitions, reject the establishment of industries that are too advanced or too intense, that eliminate too many workers, and content themselves with backward means. In the course of his research, Marx had to abandon the theorization, originating in Hegel and Adam Smith, of labor as the sole foundation, sole root, and sole meaning of human activity. Discovering the automatic machine, he also discovered non-labor, leisure, and the demand for leisure, starting with the reduction of the working day. He also had to abandon the idea of overcoming the division of labor within this division, by permitting each person to change their labor as they liked, to exercise in turn and freely this or that productive activity, this or that occupation. This project, still visible in the German ideology, disappeared before the full automatism of productive labor. From 1845 on, accordingly, Marx completely and definitively superseded the earlier communism with an artisan origin, ascetic communism. He conceived socio-economic conditions for a radical transformation of society in their totality. And yet, something of this still remains. If he eliminates liberation by way of change of occupation, he still imagines a future man who would choose in turn among creative activities that are determined and specialized, who would freely be painter, poet, sculptor, musician, philosopher. Freely in the sense of one day one thing, the next day another, seeking to proclaim the concrete modalities of the future society, utopian despite his denials. Marx oscillated between this aesthetic view and the ethical view of a society constituted by the reciprocal free recognition of conscious beings. Did he completely escape the framework of the division of labor? No. Today machinery harshly reminds us of this, when it becomes machinery for making music, for painting, for art, and when ethical values collapse, reduced to the state of compromised ideologies. Much could be said on the pages that Marx wrote in the mid-19th century, both for and against. In recent decades, a good part of the research of industrial sociology has been devoted to commenting on them, refuting them, amending them, extending them. Let us say, by way of summary, that today they strike us as amazingly prospective, especially when reinstated in their context. The machine, for Marx, was no longer what it was for Hegel, an instrument, a tool, or a set of tools. It is already the automaton that overcomes the division of labor, or permits this to be overcome. Did Marx grasp the essence of technology? Yes. Schematically, the automaton makes possible non-labor. We are now in this transition leading from the society of labor to the society of leisure. We are no longer, in 1965, in the society of labor, as some still believe, though we are not yet, as others claim. In the society of leisure. A difficult transition, a difficult mutation. The automaton has not yet made it possible to overcome the existence of working masses and classes. It demands from them ultimate efforts for the accumulation of enormous capitals and gigantic resources for the construction of gigantic mechanisms. And yet, it is there. It functions. As a consequence, the number of manual workers is dwindling and will continue to do so. The number of technicians, white-collar employees, bureaucrats increases. And yet the labourer is more exploited than ever, even if his material lot improves, more subordinated than ever, delivered to the demands of technological ensemble and automatic mechanisms from the firm to the state. As for the bureaucrats, they are imprisoned in bureaucracy. The values of labour are in full crisis, those of non-labour are hard to discover. The automatic machine could well take over many things, all kinds of things perhaps. The end point of this program will be the automaton that maintains and constructs other automatons. For the moment, neither technological specialization and fragmentary labour for human individuals nor the gestures of the machine are abolished. Would the unskilled worker be available for the full development of the individual? What he is available for in bourgeois society is rather prefabricated leisure activities, cinema, organized holidays. It is not even certain that a polytechnic training could give him the development desired. This seems more appropriate for labour in the fully automatic factory, in continuous flux, but is not without its problems. The automaton has not yet taken over technically fragmented productive labour, still less the totality of this productive labour itself. The deskilling of certain groups of workers continues, and their exploitation, despite being concealed by technical rationality, gets worse. Added to exploitation, meaning an increase in relative surplus value, are the control mechanisms at various levels, from the workshop and the firm to the state, and the remoteness from centres of decision. The possibility that Marx perceived comes onto the horizon. The transition is nonetheless terribly difficult. In order to think the new possibility, we perhaps have to go further and elsewhere than Marx. Already, when we want to imagine a leisure society, we are stopped short by enigmas. Marx thought that every man would become a painter, or poet, a musician, or all of these. Even if we reject the theory of innate aptitudes, the predetermined genius or stupidity of individuals, and accept the unlimited plasticity of the human brain, we doubt today that a man could become equally painter, musician, poet, and scholar. Because encyclopedic knowledge and total activity are needed? No. Because the abstract and the immediate are increasingly divided? Not only that, because machinery and technology manufacture music and discourse and painting, automatically or nearly so, and we may very well imagine machines for listening to music or looking at paintings done by machines. The good programmer, with other gifts than those of the classical musician and painter, will perhaps shortly replace the latter. Because making paintings abstract or figurative, or music traditional or electronic, does not seem to us an aim capable of giving meaning to life, occupying it. Because we see the entire art of the past being consumed, rather than new works being produced. Because art will be overcome as a specialist activity, like philosophy. Thus, the evocation of human possibilities cannot arouse either euphoria or the ecstatic admiration that technocrats and official Marxists affect. Fortunately, it gives a certain frisson, and actively disturbs a thought too easily optimistic and too assured of itself when it does not fall into anguished passivity. If on the one hand we have the proclamation of a future man prey to robots, his own work, we also evoke by contrast the image of a free man, boundlessly free, too free. How should we depict his figure? Like Marx in his time, we reflect by reflecting conditions hard to overcome. Like Marx in his time? No. It is harder for us. Marx could attribute to the proletariat an immediate negativity, determining and determined, destructive and creative. We have to open up the possible by theoretical decisions. And yet, there is mediation only in superseding, in the movement that supersedes. We are accustomed to a humanity formed by labour, in labour, for labour. In case we forget this, official Marxism and the ideology of productivist socialism remind us of it. How are the man and woman of non-labour to be represented? The analytical understanding, to stick to Hegelian and Marxist terminology, the term understanding or intelligence imposes itself. For Hegel and Marx, there is no analytical reason. Reason for them is dialectical, and dialectic is rational. The understanding separates and divides. As a lantern with the head of an ant Eluard, it meticulously illuminates with an immediate aim. 24. It breaks connections, and in particular, the unity of contradictions. It determines and fixes what it has determined. After having distinguished and enumerated, the understanding reconstitutes sums and series. These ensembles differ from dialectical superseding as determination by the understanding differs from dialectical contradiction. It is the Cartesian method, with its philosophical implications, general theory of the act of thinking, proceeding from the simple to the complex. This analytical understanding has its own laws. As a rigorous and operatory form, it links up both with formal logic and with the laws and structures of discourse. From logical and algebraic operations, the understanding moves on to arrangements, permutations, and combinations of elements that operators manipulate. It advances along this line with no limitation of complexity. On the basis of distinct and discrete units, atoms of reality and meaning, it grasps ensembles and forms. We come back here to a particularly difficult question. How and why was this analytical understanding born? What are the relations between its formal laws and dialectical reason? How does the dialectical movement traverse and take up in it the analytical determinations? The problem, left in suspense by Hegel, of the relationship between formal logic in our definition, the general theory of stabilities and dialectical reason, has constantly aggravated the difficulties of a philosophy reduced to varied reflections on questions of method. Marx skirted round this problem and bypassed it. Engels got bogged down in it, simultaneously asserting that the old philosophy handed down the legacy of formal logic across the ages. And that formal logic no longer had anything but a domestic use trivial and everyday in naming and discussing fixed objects. This problem recurs at the centre of Sartre's difficulties in his critique of dialectical reason. He does not define either the domain or the level of logic or the categories of understanding. No more does he manage to define the level and domain of dialectical reason, and this despite the fact that for him, the practico-inert is inexplicitly logic, the domain of the understanding and stability, while the agitation of the for itself and consciousness is the becoming of dialectical reason, now defined as a function of acts of consciousness which does not define it in a satisfactory manner, either in itself or in relation to the logic of stabilities. The chapter of Marx's Poverty of Philosophy mentioned above shows how, in praxis, a wide dialectical movement runs through the determinations of the understanding fixed in things, tools, and machines. And this is, of course, without the human actors, inventors, organizers, laborers being aware of it. These determinations are subordinated to those of the dialectical movement, carried away by them in becoming. What then is happening today? The machine, the automaton, does not only virtually take over productive labor and the division of labor, the automaton takes over the whole of analytical understanding, that is to say, the understanding becomes automatic. Technology has always been operatory, as long as there has been technology in the modern sense, which does not coincide with the ancient meaning of techne, Heidegger. Today, every operation becomes technology, and every technology sooner or later becomes machine. Machines calculate, reason, translate, discourse. With operational logic, with games theory and decision theory, the science of the understanding seeks also to be a praxeology, theory of operational and real action. 26. The understanding, therefore, does not only have an object, the world of stable objects, in which it operates effectively and acts. Practically, it constitutes itself as totality. Totalized, it objectivizes itself, over-determining the objectivity of objects and the world of objects. It forms a block. It detaches itself from man and the human being. Either it draws and fixes them in the hardness of this block, or they free themselves from it. We come to an alternative in praxis, which praxis has to resolve. Either man is essentially constituted by the analytical understanding, with its operatory modes, the concepts of structure and function. Technological thought then prevails over dialectical thought. Its effectiveness is discovered at the bottom of all praxis, at the bottom of history, which, moreover, once recognized, it abandons to the past. In this case, the effective operation is defined as mimesis. Or, if you like, mimesis reciprocally defines the effectiveness of the technological operation. From the clay doll to the statue, from the hut made of branches to the analogical models that modern machines work with, mimesis has established and consolidated stabilities within the real, in the chaos of phenomena, between the established order and inaccessible disorder. It intervenes and constitutes the world. Technology and art have imitated nature and man as natural being, each with its own means. Those of technology are stronger. Technology, mingled initially with praxis and poiesis, or with the poetic illusion, frees itself and becomes predominant. It relegates the other aspects of praxis to illusion or shadow. Analogy and simulation penetrate the real and even establish it. Objective evidence, the new towns and estates, these simulacra of cities, perfect evidence for the disappearance of genuine inhabiting, in which people simply reside instead of inhabiting, in which the everyday presents itself in a clinically pure state. The theory of the real is founded on mimesis. Objectification is basically mimetic. Still more, physis appears as mimesis. Suppose nature imitates itself, repeating itself by spontaneously constructing increasingly ordered ensembles with elements that are initially in disorder, chaotic, dispersed, and incoherent. Once certain conditions favourable to stability, which partly escape us, meet together and combine. Nature, as we already observed, disappears in the face of technology and technical thought. Let man then accept himself as automaton, integrate himself into the general automation, individual and social. Enlightened about himself by machinery and mimesis, he can cease to believe himself a creative and transcendent God. The summit of reification bears within it the end of reification, the end of the opposition between the thing and the non-thing, consent to the spontaneity of that which moves of itself, the automaton. Or, in an alternative scenario, man frees himself from the automaton within him. He extracts himself from this, and finally appears in his being. In the course of his history, man constitutes what we can call a block with a large part of himself, detaches it, and places it externally so as to overcome it. Dialectical and poetical thought cease to be enclosed in technological structures, functions, and operations. They finally shine with their brilliance. Praxis ceases to be the closed field in which obscure forces, now finally enlightened, struggle among themselves. Mimesis, techne, physis, poiesis. Defined in its full scope by the automaton, repetitive praxis becomes the terrain from which creative praxis takes flight. In other words, a poiesis finally returned to itself. An enormous, gigantic reality has been established, consolidated, stabilized. It is made up of stabilities, taken to the point of self-correlation and self-regulation. Can this stable world serve as a springboard for advance towards a different world, which, however, will be nowhere but in this one? Which world? We do not yet know, but we do know that nature, or being, will form part of it. Let us return to the fate of philosophy, and the relationship between philosophy and mimesis. The problem of the relationship between logic and dialectic is resolved in praxis. Whatever the side taken, in a praxis that verifies theory, and which this theory founds, machinery as product of the understanding embodies it. Science, along with cybernetics, effectively becomes what Heidegger called a theory of the real, and even a theory of operatory, that is, effective praxis, praxeology. Perhaps it would be more exact to formulate the inverse of Heidegger's contention, the realization of man, by means of his analytical understanding. Takes the form of a theory of the real that includes realizing or ordering praxis. As theoretical realization, modern science, considered with the gigantic technological mechanisms it has established across the planet, puts an end in its own way to the split between the representation and the real. It realizes the essence of representation, does it not? Thereby suppress the philosophical need, as Hegel defines this, born from the gap between the real and representations? Would this science, accordingly, and the mimesis that it presses forward, be what supersedes philosophy? In philosophy, which is bourgeois and withering away, the theory of knowledge has replaced ontology, or the theory of being. It concerns itself with the supposed general forms of knowledge, without taking account of the material at hand, or of the decoupage already effected on material and social nature. It arrogates itself the privilege of establishing the general conditions of knowing, conditions of possibility. Hegel strongly criticized, in the name of the philosophical metaphysical absolute, this way of posing the problem of knowledge on the basis of the separation between being and knowing. He established that this split pertains to the analytical understanding rather than to dialectical reason. Either all knowledge already contains the absolute, and there is no need for a distinct theory of knowledge, or else it is irredeemably separated from it, and philosophy loses the right to speak of either a metaphysical absolute or a finished knowledge. Despite the Hegelian critique, the neo-Kantian schools in France, Germany, and England have taken up the theory. This speculative effort, ashamed of itself, has sealed the distancing of the object in decaying philosophy, its loss in the in itself, its volatilizing in empiriocriticism, its drowning in intuition, and the philosophy of the lived. The germ of this process was there in the theory of knowledge right from its start. It took as its object pure abstraction form without content, concept, and category in the pure state. The effort to grasp this inaccessible form could only lead to proclaiming the nothingness of conceptual thought, the destruction of categories, adherence to irrational neo-mysticism. Bourgeoisified philosophy proved incapable of using the concept of totality, including its enriching negations, the partial, open, broken totality. It proved equally incapable of overcoming the crisis of this concept by using that of world-wideness's mondialite. It would be derisory, however, to attribute this impotence to a weakness of the thinkers concerned, who never showed so much subtlety and refinement. And still more false to follow those who, accepting in philosophy the splits of the individual and the social in bourgeois society, maintain that the world is not totality, but plurality. Philosophers, in this sense, have even gloried in voluntarily ceding their place to the specialized sciences of human reality, with their cleavages and their ruptures of level. With the real having become relative, metaphysics was dismissed, a good pretext to get rid of the philosophical problem, that is, the problem of philosophy. As well as radical critique based on the rehabilitation of the sensuous and the restitution of its richness, a critique whose philosophical name is materialist. The reason for the failure is something quite different from a weakness of thinkers. It lies in the situation of Philowand. Ophi, decaying and sceptical in the context of bourgeois society, decaying and dogmatic in the context of socialist society. Its orientation towards knowledge was an illusory orientation that generated falsehood. Withering philosophy cannot manage to conduct itself critically towards its fundamental categories and presuppositions. It cannot free itself of fetishisms. It does not view the acquired culture as a moment to supersede, but views itself, not without reason, as an important element of this culture. The materialist theory of knowledge sought to stand from the start in an objective world. It left behind the implicit subjectivism or superficial objectivism of so-called bourgeois philosophers. It did not give itself the aim of a veiled deduction of categories by starting from an unconscious acceptance of these very categories within a vast tautology. It accepted human knowledge just as it is, in its historical reality. It not only proposed to establish the validity of knowledge, but also to explain errors as both illusions and dialectical moments of truth. In particular, in this perspective, it would not have been bad to show the dialectical movement in modern thought and knowledge. From metaphysical immobilism that freezes beings and categories to the conception of universal movement, and from this conception to research on relative stability's general problems of stability, and stability as a problem. Here, a new cleavage intervened. On one path, materialism remained a philosophy, a system. Then it had to take up the theory of knowledge, starting from the thesis of a materiality posited and presupposed anterior to all knowledge, an insoluble problem. The dissociation of object and subject, being and knowing, made a paradoxical reappearance, positing a being or a matter entirely external to knowledge, led inevitably to ignoring knowledge as activity, grafting it onto being and matter as a double that is at the same time phantom-like, and stuck in a place hard to locate a reflection, which determines knowledge as imitation of being without, for all that, defining it clearly as such. On the other path, materialism was continued in the sense of Diderot and Marx, recovery of the sensuous as rich object of perception, critique of ideological abstraction. But then philosophy was transformed into radical critique of ideological mystifications, critique of everyday life, critique of the representations that men make of their lives, along with attempts to justify and systematize these representations. This radical critique had to show that, in societies divided into classes, representations undergo the effects of a tendential law of polarization that converges or diverges them from their content, according to class interests. In particular when human life is concerned, which the representations of praxis reduce to an abstract life, leading to the following result. As a result, man, the worker, only feels himself freely active in his animal functions, eating, drinking, procreating, or at most in his dwelling and dressing up, etc. And in his human functions, he no longer feels himself to be anything but an animal. What is animal becomes human, and what is human becomes animal. Certainly eating, drinking, procreating, etc. are also genuinely human functions, but taken abstractly, separated from the sphere of all other human activity and turned into sole and ultimate ends they are animal functions. 27. Hegel's phenomenology already contained this striking theory of the abstract animal. Man who, taking the abstraction and split of his activity, specialization as reality and thing, into which to absorb his consciousness in a seeming self-realization, becomes again animal, but an animal without spontaneous life, deprived of vital impulses and confined to the spiritual animal kingdom. A profound theory this airs. 28 cf. Hegel, Phenomenology of Spirit, p. 237 ff. Much so as Marx's theory of the alienates and reifies activity. We glimpse in this the theory of theoretical realization. With the automaton, with theoretical realizatio, does knowledge remain in the air, without foundation, as philosophers fear in the absence of a theory of knowledge? Certainly not. The technological object guarantees its objectivity. It realizes this, practically, in technological praxis. Classical Western philosophy, we will say, broke the connection between subject and object right from the start. This then had to be re-established, which was attempted on two levels, that of metaphysics, and that of theory of knowledge, the relationship between the two remaining ill-defined. Metaphysics did not succeed, as it borrowed its principles either from a hypostasis of the subject, the absolute I, the transcendental ego of Fichte, Husserl, and, in his own way, Sartre's for itself, or a hypostasis of the object substance, the in itself matter. These hyperboles could not bring the separate terms into harmony, as they presupposed this separation. Nor did the theory of knowledge, gnosiology, or general methodology succeed any better. They shifted the problem, which became that of the relationship between the given and the constructed, the pure fact and scientific observation. Today, the problem has disappeared because it has been resolved in scientific practice. A certain methodological and theoretical notion has acquired growing importance, that of simulation. We already know this. We find it here better illuminated and in a wider perspective. The notion of simulation accompanies contemporary advances in microphysics, molecular chemistry, the construction of electronic machines, cybernetics. It is a very broad and powerful concept, susceptible moreover to a rigorous, axiomatized definition. We presuppose an observer, external to an object, a given reality. This scientific observer differs from the witness or judge, who, physicist or philosopher, or both at once, passively observed empirical facts or relationships. As active observer, he disposes of technologies and operations that enable him to apprehend the real, the object, as ensemble of phenomena, dimensions, perspectives. These means then enable the observer to construct an object that reproduces the initial object, initially posited as external and real. Constructive activity supersedes classical empiricism. This activity is not rational in the sense of classical relativism. It does something, it constructs not just concepts and representations, but the real. Effective realization plays the role of experience in the methodology accepted up to now. Simulation thus includes the reproduction of a set of phenomena by technological mechanisms, dispositives. These means may be crude, little metal balls, wires and threads, as in the oldest models of modern physics, or again painted paper bits of wood. They may be refined, for example if the observer has several cameras available, or a perfected camera capable of grasping an object in the four dimensions of spacetime and projecting an image in relief. Simulation or reproduction acquires its greatest effectiveness when the means it has available grasp combinations and sets of elements, or distinct and discrete units, atoms of meaning, composition and arrangement. All reproduction or reconstruction is necessarily incomplete. In its way, it breaks the unity of the real that it reproduces, it varies it arbitrarily, it modifies and distorts its form, its gestalt. So it is never complete and total. However, its uncertainties and weaknesses are conceived and perceived only as a function of the reproduced object, and its distance in relation to the constructed analogue. Each time a difference is noted, this observation makes it possible to refine the simulacrum. It is essential to note that reproduction must itself be able to reproduce itself. Iteration or repetition plays an essential role. It is this that furnishes the practical criterion of validity. If successive reproductions differ from the first, there is said to have been a mistake. Study of mistakes makes it possible to define and classify the types of mistake and to correct them. In fact, since the initial object is posited as external and by hypothesis inaccessible, it is in the course of successive iterations that the simulacrum is refined and converges with the model. Repetition as distinct from relationship to the object thus plays an analogous role to that of the experiment carried out in defined conditions in the laboratory, according to classic methodology. Repetition verifies, difference reveals. Mistakes are always fruitful, making possible changes in points of view and mechanisms. Simulation reconstructs and reconstitutes life and thought ever more closely. The automaton simulates these. The procedure of knowledge and action postulates objective processes in the reproduced real and a rational explanation of this real. And yet it does not claim to establish itself there and hold them. It targets them by successive approximations in reproduction, by operations effectively accomplished on the basis of denumerable and measurable elements. The notions of simulacrum and simulation thus include both a critique and a transformation of the concepts classically accepted by philosophy and the theory of knowledge, the gnosiology and methodology established by philosophers. The simulacrum, whether functional or structural, is neither true nor false in the old sense of these terms. It is not even exact or inexact in the customary sense. It is more or less analogous to the object. It approaches it to a greater or lesser extent and reconstitutes it more or less completely. It is useful to emphasize strongly that the simulacrum is itself an object, the product of a positive and imaginative act Abraham Moles. In this sense, it overflows the concepts of analogy and resemblance, even though presupposing and enveloping these. It is a creation, but determined by an external model. The methodology of the model thus defined is modified, and this modification passes into the terminology. What is called model is not the simulacrum, but the object. The apparent and the real, the phenomenal and the objective, no longer have the relationships that they assumed in classical philosophy and theory of knowledge. They do not diverge, they converge. Being and appearing are not confused, they are not opposed. Appearing becomes the apparition of the real existing without there being appearance in the classic sense of a phenomenon. Detachable from the object, deceptive or illusory. Appearance is conceived as effective simulation, and bit by bit approaches the object, the substantial existent. The true and the false are replaced by the possible and the impossible, the probable and the improbable. The possible does not offer itself as a third value between the true and the false, or beyond them. It is possible to approach the object indefinitely, by chance, by corrected trial and error. It's impossible to place oneself in the object. We say here that with the construction of simulacra and automatons with theoretical realization, scientific knowledge abolishes the theory of knowledge by making it useless. It establishes itself in a domain that it contributes to defining, that of mimesis, a domain that we have already determined on the basis of machinery, which the concepts of simulacrum and simulation make more precise, and information theory, analysis of any message. In our view, these definitions converge. They, the domain in question. They limit it. They do not yet say everything that it contains, everything that its contents mean. The automaton takes upon itself knowing science as theoretical realization. In its own way, it suppresses the split between object and subject, between knowing and being, between the real and the representation. Having become practical act and reality, knowledge no longer demands a distinct philosophical theory. The automaton tends to capture and incorporate the totality of knowing and representations, thus freeing the human being from his objective part, yet enabling him to draw support from this consolidation. He is himself the great automaton, the abstract animal in its full comprehension and full extension, fascinating parody of complete man, almost perfect simulacrum of the totality apprehended experience. Reconstructed reality and appearance unified. Is he not at the same time in full synchronized simultaneity, both realization and alienation? Which enables some people to say that he reconciles these, suppressing both as opposition and problem. And others, including us, to maintain that he drives the conflict to a paroxysm and heralds the great superseding. In both perspectives, the philosophical problem of knowledge disappears. For some, mimesis is knowledge in action, known and recognized, realized, thus dispensing with a problematic or a theoretical response to these problems. Even outside the automaton viewed as reality, structuralist neo-positivism responds, as we know, to the problem of knowledge by abolishing it. It defines the subject, the object, and the form of their relations. Philosophy disappears in the face of, or within, this philosophy of structure. The theory of knowledge collapses in the face of a theoretical knowledge that claims to express the real process of knowledge and thus incorporate itself into the real. In the other perspective, that which we opt for, we know ever more clearly that it is neither a question of knowledge nor a philosophical theory of knowledge, nor again of philosophy and problematic in the philosophical sense. What the situation demands, in fact, are acts and decisions in praxis, even if we term these acts and decisions poetic, for example, the decision to transform everyday life and the actions that might follow from this. It is only a question of praxis, and it is only a certain praxis that is put in question. We take our stand beyond the theory of knowledge and philosophy. And now, to continue this exploration of the field of mimesis, let us examine the famous problem of values. What is social consciousness in bourgeois society?
We can leave aside here socialist society, politicized or depoliticized according to representations little known.
Journalists say that it is public opinion. But no, moralists reply, public opinion is vulgar and uncertain and contradictory, manipulated by propaganda, bought and sold by advertising and the mass media. Opinion, from the time of Socrates and Plato, means the sum of representations that are false because unreflected and limited. Only the highest culture deserves the name of consciousness, that is philosophy, the elaborated representation of the real world, such as it is in life, such as that is true representation. It is exact that the representations of the world and those of life are different. They are different and separate, like science and will, knowledge and desire. There are those that deplore the fact that the will cannot stay the advance of science, the science that creates the automatic machine and chronic unemployment, space exploration and the atom bomb. That gives more power to the rich individuals and countries than to the poor individuals and peoples. The representation of the will would be unequal to the will, and the representation of human things inadequate to what these things are in reality. On the one hand, bourgeoisified thought recognizes that it no longer grasps things. It denies that consciousness reflects being. It is pragmatic. It says that consciousness is the condition of being, or the author of being, or the shadow of being. Which amounts to saying that the social consciousness of bourgeois society and the representation of life are something other than real life and real being. As against this, socialist thought claims to be a reflection of the real. This philosophy of reflection also leads to pragmatism, but political and social, rather than individual, commercial and marketing pragmatism as on the other side. To the extent that the idea of truth is abandoned, people cling to value. Axiology is separated from ontology and, for lack of the true, maintains the good and the beautiful. Value insinuates itself into the fissure between real and representation. What is value? It is what is worth wanting. It is the valid aim of will as will. An object of value is an object that one wishes to possess. A value is the representation of what one wishes to be. The bourgeois, as such, is disassociated. This disassociation forms part of his being. He perceives himself as this or that, as individual, as man, as citizen, as paterfamilias, as boss or engineer, as aesthete, and so forth. Each as is differently valorized. The bourgeois expects unification from will and supreme value. Will? His own? Or that of a hero? A leader? Will? Or the will to the second degree? The bourgeois individual will admit with a smile that his everyday life is on a low level. What do you want? Everyone has to earn a living. What do you want? You have to be a slave, serve the state, society, prosperity. What do you want? In order to live, you have to do things that you would rather not do. You would like to give your wallet to every beggar, but you realize this would be stupid. Life is hard, very hard. There are wife and children to feed, to educate, to establish. But does this mean you are simply an animal, a machine, a robot, someone or something that reproduces for want of creating and persists in this reproduction? No. The bourgeois does not believe himself such. To those who believe him so, who criticize his system, capitalism, and wish to overthrow it, he replies humble and proud, there are values. He possesses these values, masses of them. He creates and recreates them each day, when he can, otherwise everything would collapse. Previously, values were small in number, arranged in hierarchical order, sacred and consecrated. Today, countless values have been created, invading even what seemed above all valuation, beauty, art, love, invading them, shaking them, and destroying them. For centuries, as gold, we picturesquely say gold here instead of capital, this abstract thing broke down guild barriers and reduced peasants. And artisans, to the necessity of selling themselves, it proclaimed the value of liberty. And also of dignity. Replacing narrow and real liberties with liberty general and vague, abstractly available, money lodged the corpse of this liberty in the Museum of Values. Death spoke from its tomb, it spoke of the ideal. Regret changed into promise and hope. Crucified man made himself divine. Each time a fragment of life was broken by the great pirate crusade of gold and annexed to its venal domain, value sprung up on its tomb. Value was the glorification of life by itself at the moment of death. Value was also the triumphal cry of gold proclaiming its victory. By paying homage to the beauty that he subjugated, the victor glorified himself for having made such a fine conquest. Each time the bourgeoisie, through its philosophers and literary men, proclaimed a new value, this signaled the end of that value in the real. When love is possible, love is not a value. Romanticism decreed the supreme value of love, which meant that love, increasingly rare, became dream, ideal, utopia, and that in reality every man was for sale and every woman could be bought. The bourgeois who bought women, the women who afforded husbands or lovers, consoled themselves because in the theatre, in the novel, and today in the cinema, people died of love and honor was thus safe. 30. When André Malraux wrote about the human condition, it was because there no longer was a human condition. When he proclaimed solitude and refusal, it was because there was no more solitude for the individual caught in the mass of individual consumers. Held by the throat in the demographic upsurge and the socialization of society, incapable of escaping, except in the dream offered the masses by a capitalist society that arouses this dream and assuages it in images. Solitude, this final pride, this final dignity, vanished. In modern cities or in the explosion of these cities and the housing estates that are there. 31N. André Malraux's À la condition humaine is better known in English as Man's Fate, translated by Håkon Chevalier, New York, Modern Library, 1936, or Man's Estate, translated by Alistair MacDonald, London, Hamilton, 1968. Ghost, people have lost both solitude and social life. They find both promiscuity and the privation of private life. The individual has survived as value, as abstract individual, the period when there still was the possibility of individual enterprise. Individualism presides over mass society, over organized society as a value. When philosophy, Heidegger and Sinon Zeit, then existentialism, started speaking of authenticity, there no longer was authenticity, except perhaps in the will for nothingness and rejection. Values? The world of values? The philosophy of values? Axiology as opposed to ontology? It was in this form that the bourgeoisie became conscious of its life, sought to impose this consciousness and still does seek to. In bourgeois society, consciousness reflects life, despite the denials of philosophy. It reflects it because it does not create it. Consciousness is outside of poetry, and poetry is only a small sector of consciousness, a specialization in the use of verbal material, that is, language as material. The sum of economic, political, moral, spiritual values, private and personal, is what constitutes bourgeois social consciousness, even in the present period when competitive capitalism has disappeared. Mystified consciousness, but consciousness all the same. An inverted, broken, mutilated reflection. Consciousness, and thus meaning of what no longer has meaning. Life is no longer unique, and no longer tends towards totality. It has been broken into 1,000 contradictory values. As supreme expression of alienation and fetishism, life has 1,000 meanings. One can choose freely, has 1,000 meanings, but it no longer has meaning, and this is the point of departure for philosophical discourse on meaning and signification. Unicity is broken in the prism of fetishisms, and fragmented into 1,000 specialized reflections. For this life to be understood, it has long been necessary for the mirror of value to be broken. The path taken by alienation and disalienation has to be reconstructed, following Marx in the 1,844 manuscripts. The life that lies beneath each value has to be rediscovered, a life opposed to this value, the culture of values becoming the other pole. In the course of this complex process, alienation and disalienation, the problem of values arises. It is transformed, with each value becoming problematic. It becomes a reflection on values, a reflection more or less critical and apologetic. It is then that the philosopher takes over. As long as values impose themselves, they are unconscious or preconscious. When they pass into language and consciousness, they are already dissolving. It is the beginning of their end. The specifically philosophical problematic always lies between the two, apogee and dissolution, reflection, discourse on discourse. The problem of values is then formulated as a problem of the value of values. This expression can be taken in two senses, general value of values or supreme value among values. As regards value in the general sense, there no longer is one that spontaneously imposes or insinuates itself. Art, for example, is valorized at the moment when it is externalized in relation to everyday life and no longer intervenes. It was, and still is, art for art's sake, a second-degree assertion that envelops a second-degree alienation, in the wake of which art in the traditional sense collapses, undergoing a radical mutation that gives it notice to disappear in the face of the machine as producer of art, music, painting, etc., or else serving the transformation of everyday life in an entirely new way. As regards the supreme value, is this not technology itself? This is the end of values, except those supported by institutionalization or displayed by an ideology that is equally devalorized. The path of alienation and disalienation has long since needed to be remade, but this critique, radical as it set out to be, was still philosophical despite itself. And this is where the great automaton is born. The abstract animal concretizes itself. It rises and grows. Irony and derision. It denies all values, threatens them in action. It supplants them. It is itself the superior value, technology preeminent and seemingly final human work. It fascinates, it dominates social consciousness, and incorporates itself into this. Like the grand automaton itself, its ideology, structuralism, also destroys values. What does the structural reduction bracket out? Emotion and passion, along with dialectic. Everything passes into the residual that is itself supposed to disappear into worlded technicality. Everything, values and supports of values, appearance and reality, drama and melodrama. Spilled out by the mass media, values lose prestige and force in favor of images. Art, massively consumed, is devalorized by acquiring a value that is not just aesthetic but social, political and commercial. The world of values erodes on all sides and collapses. Philosophy and philosophical critique no longer have a rationale. We can let the automaton act. It will get through the tasks that a still philosophical or overly philosophical critique proposes without accounting for them. Value asserts itself as pure value, without base or foundation. Value is value. And so value dissolves into pleonasm, tautology, a robotic halo. Gold is relegated to second place in the hierarchy of great fetishes, but the new great fetish no longer directly arouses a fetishism. It recreates human beings in its image and renders them similar to itself, this being strictly speaking neither thing nor consciousness, but ambiguous. The automaton combines in itself spontaneity and constraint, self-movement and self-correlation. It establishes these simultaneously around it. The pleonasm, its halo, the fact that it is what it is and does not refer to anything else, as the thing does to consciousness, and consciousness to the thing, is not seen by anyone for what it is. Caught in the mimesis that they are born to first place, people can enter it with satisfaction. Art is art. Value is value. The state is the state. Signals are signals, behaviors are behaviors. And so on. The automaton thus reconciles in itself master and slave. Does it not force us to choose between a new slavery and a new freedom, between the new poverty and the new wealth? If it tends towards the greatest alienation by erasing consciousness of alienation, controlling even consciousness of alienation, so long as this persists, the new consciousness will only be the more ardent, the more explosive. Having thus determined the scope of mimesis and the importance of its concept, with implications that we are far from having exhausted, we shall now turn back. As Marx did, starting from the concept of social labor, elaborated by 18th century thought, we shall retrospectively illuminate the past of human development and its contradictions by starting from mimesis. In this way, we shall add some features, nothing more, to the sketch of total history already proposed. Formerly, when styles reigned before cultures or culture, there were only few objects, few activities, few situations. And yet these were diverse. They formed part of very different systems, clothing, diet, furniture.
These systems changed from one locality, region or nationality to another.
What is happening in the era we are in now, where A, monotonous and disjointed every day has established itself as the generalized way of life? There are ever more objects, more activities, more situations. Quantitative growth is accompanied by an increased diversity. And yet old diversities have fallen away, the old systems have disappeared, having become folkloric and anecdotal. Technologies have imposed themselves that are similar to the point of identity, similar cars on similar motorways throughout the world, similar planes at similar airports. And then masculinization of women, feminization of males, infantilization of adults, precociousness of youth, and so forth. All these phenomena we shall examine under the sign of mimesis. A dual process pervades the modern world, complexification and homogenization. It is not easy, moreover, to see the relationship between these two aspects. Some people see only complexification and hymn the diversity of modernism. Others see only homogenization and fall into nostalgia for the past, for dead significations, into folkloric romanticism. We have to grasp the unity of the dual process and perhaps the conflicts inherent to it. Complexification dissimulates homogenization, that is, mimesis. And yet it is not inconceivable that qualitative complexification may one day prevail over the reign of the homogeneous, within which diversity is only apparent. At the dawn of our civilization, if we credit Huizinga, poiesis was a ludic functionary. It stood in a ludic space, its own universe where things were connected by different ties than those of logic. Ancient civilization is now being understood anew in the light of this fundamental unit of poetry, esoteric doctrine, wisdom, and ritua. Primitive poiesis was both entertainment, social game, know-how, enigma, and solution to enigma, the teaching of wisdom, persuasion, sorcery, divination, prophecy, and competition, thus challenge. It is in this sense that the Greek poets, before literate poetry reserved for the literary public, exercised a social function, and philosophers were not distinguished from poets and musicians. 34. At that time, play, knowledge, religious cosmology, poetry, and political activity were not separated from one another. The men in poiesis, in fact, is a play function. Johann Huizinga, Homo Ludens, Boston, Beacon Press, 1971, p. 33 ibid. p. 120-34. Huizinga rather neglects music as unity of the cosmic and the human. Their assembly citizens reproduced in play the heroic and creative acts of the founders. Gods and demigods inscribed in the practical memory of foundations, legend and creative activity being undifferentiable. The action that was played and sacred was more than the realization of an appearance, the performance of a fiction, the concretization of a symbol. Its participants believed that the action brought into play a higher order of things. And yet the participant realization kept the formal characteristics of a game. It was played, staged within the limits of a circumscribed space, like a festival, which means joy and freedom. A universe of its own, of temporary value, was marked out for its purpose. And yet its action did not stop being exerted after the game was finished. It projected its splendor out onto the ordinary world, preparing security, order, and prosperity for the group that had celebrated the festival. 35. In this way, mimesis was not yet distinguished from poiesis, at least in Greece. Mimesis reproduced the creative act, that of the real or supposed foundation. It became in its turn creator of gatherings, works of art, thought, and poetry in the narrower sense of the word. How did man, his reason or his understanding, we do not yet know, invent the wheel? Certain civilizations are marked by its absence, this being as little explained as its discovery, increasing the enigma. Certainly we may think that the populations of sub-Saharan Africa who lacked the wheel had no need for it. Portage in the forests was more useful to them than carts, although some of them, settled and using fire to clear patches for cultivation, could have done with wheeled vehicles. But the Aztecs? Their ignorance of the wheel may be explained by their origins, oarsmen on the Mexico Lake, warriors making war into a ritual. Besides, they lacked draft animals. Finally, they were ignorant of anything of the nature of abstraction or hypothesis, money for example. And yet the absence of the wheel is remarkable, particularly as they interpreted magically and mystically the heavenly movements and cosmic rhythms remarkably represented as such. We cannot prevent ourselves from saying that technological and practical causes are not enough to explain the absence of the wheel. Perhaps they worship the sun too much, its circular form and movement. To dare to inscribe it in a material object, palpable, tangible, usable, they did not profane the sacred and accursed form, that of higher powers that were favorable or threatening. The forms of the city from its birth to its explosion in the modern world are reducible to two, the circular, radial concentric form and the grid-formed square or rectangle divided like a chessboard. From the beginning, settlements and agglomerations took one or other of these forms. The circular form seems more spontaneous for cities growing naturally around a fortified place, citadel, area, castle, crossroads, bridge, and so forth. It would be inexact, all the same, to maintain that the grid form followed the radial concentric form as the reflected follows the spontaneous. On the contrary, the grid form seems older than the circular. Contrary to what one might believe, it preceded rational thought. Belatedly, the grid system proved practical, simple and useful for the construction of camps, new towns, colonies. Reflecting thought imitated. The grid pattern was adopted by the analytical understanding for rational reasons. And yet there is room to believe that it goes back to the origins of cities arising from a foundation. This form offers human constructions to the rays of the sun. It is oriented towards the rising sun at the solstice, towards the place where a planet rises. A correspondence has been observed between the chessboard form and the strict orientation of the megalithic ensembles at Karnak, for example. Rather than just a form of the city, the founders seem to have grasped an imago mundi and projected it onto the ground, terrain. The circular city imitates the world, the sun, the moon, circular movement, stars and planets, the successive spheres. The grid city offers itself to the rays of the sun, which cut through its center at the favored and sacred moment of the solstice. There is no doubt that the inventors of the wheel imitated the sun and its supposed movement. Before or after this invention, they constructed circular cities after the model of the wheel. The primitive network of roads, paths, and tracks around the agglomeration fixes and imitates the tree. The roads around the city imitate the spokes of the wheel, which imitate the rays of the sun. The city itself appears at the center of the world, its navel. At the center of the circular city, as the hub at the center of the wheel, rise the temple and the palace, seen as the pivots of the world. The wheel, that of the cart, that of space, represented and appropriated in the city, was, it seems, the practical origin of the circle thought by reflection. As the practical grid marking of countryside and towns into a chessboard lay at the origin of the square and rectangle as formerly geometrically defined. The wheel is thus found, not without multiple mediations, at the birth of both a number of material machines and the circularity of abstract systems. 37. The wheel of carts for transport and chariots for war, the wheel of torture, the wheel of time and eternal recurrence, the sphere of space and thought, the harmony of the world, the figure of perfection and thought for Parmenides, and likewise with the infernal circles of sorcery, accursed spheres, vicious circles, the wheel opened and determined a long period. It was as revolutionary as carved stone or Promethean fire. It defined a mimesis whose consequences are still not exhausted, in which the primordial symbol governs actions or series of actions that resemble it. Disjunction bound up with formal logic, discourse and structures of discourse, halts or sudden changes in material movements, today acquires a growing function in fact and thought, determining another form of mimesis. Plato has preserved for us the traces of this primitive history, in which mimesis and poiesis are mingled before being distinguished in terms of the particular sciences. Cosmogony, religion and technology were not yet differentiated. Among the various kinds of movement, philosophy discerned that of the will as a privileged one. In rotation, this movement is propagated, amplified, multiplied from the starting point of the immobile center. And yet the movable form is maintained without alteration, whereas translation distorts. The 38 Plato, Laws, Book 10, 893-4. Movement of the wheel symbolizes the movement of the soul and its relationship with the body. Still more, the soul of the world sustains and animates the world, as the hub holds together and moves the wheel as a whole. It leads the round of all things, all states, from the sun to the moon and sublunary earthly creations. All movements of the cosmos imitate, closely or not, the soul of the world, more or less capable of its central and fundamental perfection. All that there is in the heavens, on earth and in the sea, the soul leads them by way of these movements that are its own. These immobile movements are first causes. The peripheral movements, those of the bodies, are both effects and secondary causes. We know, according to the Timaeus, that the demiurge organizes the cosmos by contemplating and imitating the intelligible. The ideas provide the eternal model that he reproduces by shaping the imperfect mass of the sensuous, temporal, and perishable. The demiurge is in a position of mediation. Derived actions, and words that are not primary and creative, are also mediated and mediating. All that is said by any of us can only be by imitation, declares Critias at the start of the dialogue, or rather the long monologue that bears his name. The text describes the ideal city, that of Atlanteans. According to Plato, this city reproduced the imago mundi by the action of the gods and divine men. It even reproduced two imagines mundi, circular and rectangular, juxtaposing them on the island of Atlantis. Plato admirably defines, under the name of metexis participation, the original mimesis as we have conceived it, with two aspects, one facing an inaccessible aim that it seeks to grasp and incorporate, embodying it in a sensuous work, the other facing what is repeated and escapes into disorder, the chaotic and unformed. It is therefore a mediation, a participation that does not copy in the fashion of the potter when he reproduces a vase placed before and outside of him. It is an active and creative participation, despite Aristotle's debatable remark in the second book of the Metaphysics that contrasts the Platonic metexis with Pythagorean mimesis. According to him, only the Pythagoreans believed that things and ideas imitate higher essences, the numbers. But this is not the sense in which we have conceived mimesis metexis. Aristotle was no longer able to grasp the full profundity of the Platonic concept. The times had changed. Foundations and founders, myths, were now more remote. The predominance of logos in the praxis of the city and action over men, pragmata, and the pragmatic in a word, business, acquired ever greater importance to the detriment of poiesis' creative action on things. Reduced to the products of artisans and slaves, Aristotle similarly restricted poiesis and mimesis to modalities of discourse. Poetry was simply something spoken. The poet, like any artist, imitates an object of nature or a human action. As regards man, the poet imitates customs and characters, and what is permanent in him. The two verbs, poiein and mimistai, thus sum up artistic activity, framed by nature and praxis, and limited by them. Poiesis and mimesis are defined in this way, but are separated, restricted, and demeaned. 41 Systematic philosophy does not understand them. It reduces them to the level of logos and pragmata, associated with the practical and political life of the city, disassociated from foundations and fundamentals. For Aristotle, mimesis has become a literary activity, a psychological and discursive function, imitation. The great images of the soul of the world, the celestial spheres, the earth, and the harmonies have almost disappeared. Symbols dissolve, making way for signs, for verbal and written discourse. It goes without saying that the historian can continue indefinitely to excavate the foundations of the Greek and Roman city. He perceives a historical process whose study he can deepen by going back to its origins or following its results. He will never come up against a barrier. No unknown power or occult force, mystical, theological, philosophical, will ever tell him, "Here, historian, you must stop. You will not go further. Here was the place of invention, creation." And yet, however far he goes back, however deep he penetrates, the historian will discover a form whose future no one in these distant times could divine. We have already remarked on this, and will further emphasize it here. The historian may attribute the thing invention, creation, discovery to chance, determinism, or will. It matters little. What is interesting for us is what had to come about. This necessity supersedes the event. The possible overspills actuality, and still more, the past. Who knew at the time of their birth? Who could know what would become of the Greek city and the agora, of the Roman city with its pomerium and its forum? Without giving a magical mystery resonance to this term, we have spoken, and will speak further, of a poiesis, a creation half blind and half conscious. According to Pierre Lavedan, the Roman city derived from the Etruscans and, via them, from the Oriental city essentially consisted of a sacred precinct, with gates that were likewise sacred. The foundation of the city was a voluntary act. Etruria did not have spontaneous settlements, which is explained when we understand that the Etruscans were conquerors who arrived from Asia Minor. The city and its foundation resulted from a religious system. When the site had been chosen, the founders, after taking the auspices, traced the contours of the city with a bronze plough, drawn by a pair of animals, male and female, a white bull and cow. The plough had to spill soil inwards. The furrow was interrupted for the placing for gates, where the founder raised the ploughshare with his hands. The pomerium, pon muros, was the space that the Etruscans, when they built a city, reserved on either side of the furrow of the precinct, where it was in principle forbidden to build. The pomerium represented the religious boundary of the city. The sacred obligation coincided with technical and military requirements to maintain a zone free of cultivation and construction in the vicinity of the walls. The foundation of the Etruscan city was accompanied by sacrifices in honor of the gods of Hades, sacrifices that included establishing the mundus. Bloody libations were poured and victims burned. The first fruits were laid down as offerings. The pomerium was only open 3 times a year. In sum, the Etruscan and Roman city implied a precinct not to be crossed, with the prohibition lifted for the gates, the pomerium, a forbidden space. The mundus, a sacred site, heart point and figure of the celestial vault, a summary of the world, the area, preeminence or citadel, a site inviolable because favourable to defence, and a site of meeting, the forum. Mimesis and praxis, 211. Likewise, the object of prohibitions, particularly concerning the bearing of weapons. This city was well and truly a microcosm, characterized above all by prohibitions and sacralizations that were minutely ritualized and bound up with practical acts. The Italic Etruscan and Roman city founded by ritual ritu seems to have been initially circular, with 3 streets, 3 temples, 3 gates, the number 3 being sacred and structural for this ritual foundation. Only later came the rectangular Roman city with 4 regions determined by the intersection of 2 main roads, the Cardo and the Decumanus, drawn from north to south, and from east to west with the help of a geodesic instrument groma that made it possible to point at the sun. We emphasize here the circularity of the earliest Italic city and its consequences. The magic circle is above all the object of prohibitions. It is certainly not sufficient to explain the military and conquering temperament of the Romans by this constitution of their city. We may accept that it played a certain role, especially in the birth of their state and legal conceptions. Right from the start, power and property acquired a magical sense. The urban territory was the space in which the aruspices would examine the entrails of victims and influence the decisions of the magistrates, where magistrates with defined and limited powers could consult the aruspices, where neither foreign gods nor armed soldiers could penetrate, where it was forbidden to sully life by death. This was the native context of a state with a conception of law. We could say that the space of the pomerium, and what it contained including the forum, was severely closed, but that time opened up unlimited possibilities for action, conquest, organization. Hence the importance of auguries. The Greek agora, on the other hand, was an open space, welcoming but determining a limited time for the assembly of free citizens who gathered there. This a posteriori interpretation arises from the fact that we know the consequence of this advent. Sacralization and solemnization had immediate meanings and more distant significations common to all foundations, particularly the Etrusco-Roman. With the latter, they accompanied inauguration, the preparation by the augurs of the sacred perimeter, demarcation of the placing of gates and the day when the precinct would be traced, and so forth. By the solemnization of these moments, the decisions of the authorities became accepted and recognized facts, irrevocably adopted by the popular community. These founding decisions passed into praxis. The people confirmed the choice of the site and the wager on the future, thus they accepted the risk. By accepting the consequences of the inaugural act, those present committed themselves and their posterity to perpetuate the enterprise to safeguard the nascent city. Sacralization changed the territory into the exclusive possession of the group, represented by the priests and by civil and military leaders. It proclaimed the privative appropriation of the land, that is, the exclusion of foreigners, the rights of the participating citizens, the future of tensions and conquests. Sacralization and malediction thus have a function in connection with the birth of a city.
We can say that they express and signify poiesis by their transposition into a social language, words, gestures.
Ritual forms, after which the social language permits imitation, mimesis. At the beginning, practical action bears within it expression and meaning. The emotion of the sacred signifies this inherence of meaning. Later on, sacralization and malediction degenerate into official performance, corteges and processions, aesthetic forms, and political and ideological uses, such as legends, folklore, etc., leading on to pure and simple comedies and parodies in which no one any longer believes. Foundation and risks, acceptance and commitment are remote. In antiquity, it took centuries for this split to be completed. Then, the expression disappeared, and the meaning of the gestures and acts performed fell away. Mimesis follows poiesis, but separates from it only slowly. Poiesis is characterized by the primordial unity of the elements that disassociate. Technicality, world image, action on things and on the group, presence of the people, decision of the leaders, solemnity. It gives way to a gestural compromise, that is, one lived in a certain practice, between ritual and technical demand, between the mysterious power attributed to the founding decisions and practical cleverness, itself double. About things and men. Jerome Carcopino, an excellent scholar of Roman antiquity, recalls in his book La Vie quotidienne a Rome the ceremonial of foundation and its meaning. The sacred orbit, thus described in anticipation of the fortifications and walls to come, formed the abbreviated ground plan, the prophetic image of the future city. From the pomerium, the herbs derived its name, its original definition, and its supernatural protection, although it preserved its religious character and continued to protect the citizens by remaining closed to gatherings of the legions. By classic times, it had ceased to form the limit of the city. 42. It had become symbolic. Carcopino shows the magical, sacred, accursed function of the circle and the formation of the symbolism on the basis of initial reality as well as its religious interpretation. Further on in this highly suggestive book, a relationship is brought to light between town, habitation, and clothing. The Roman toga, from a word cognate with tegere, to cover, was the segment of a circle of white wall 2.72 meters in diameter. Its roundness distinguished the toga from all the varieties of clothing derived from the Hellenic himation. The Greeks expressed in their manner of dress their predilection for rectilinear architecture. They left in the piece of cloth in which they draped themselves the straight edges and sharp angles that it had on the loom. The Greeks, Carcopino continues, citing Leon Hussey, drew admirable effects from these elementary forms, which pleased the simplicity of their taste and the cleanness of their minds.
We may say in passing that the reader will not understand why the circular form is less simple and less clean than the square or rectangular form.
The difference is elsewhere, in the context. The circle is closed in space and open to time. The rectilinear grid is open in space and closed to time. At all events, the Etruscans, followed by the Romans, who early on brought the arch into their system of construction, and who liked to raise their temples on a circular plan, likewise rounded the angles of their clothing. This suggests an initial form, then its echo and repercussion in all familiar domains. There is no repetition. There is no imitation in the strict sense. Invention takes place in all domains. Architecture. 42. Jerome Carcopino. Daily life in ancient Rome. The People and the City at the Height of the Empire, edited by Henry T. Rowell, translated by Emily Overend Lorimer, New Haven, Yale University Press, pp. 12-13. 43. Carcopino, Daily Life in Ancient Rome, p. 154. Clothing, perhaps the diverse objects of everyday life, with the mind's eye fixed on the dominant and primordial form. These indications could and should be confirmed by detailed archaeological and historical studies. They still fail to explain to us in a satisfactory fashion the difference between the agora and the forum, between the Greek city and the Roman. Likewise, the conditions in which the great forms of logic and law resulted from them. They simply put us on the right path. They show us a mimesis, created and yet creative, flowing and deriving from a poiesis. The gods of ancient Olympus were in no way allegorical. On the one hand, they were attached to a location, terroir. They depended on local cults. The most important were worshipped in many places, but never became completely detached from particular sites and definite events rituals. On the other hand, they denoted human powers, love, courage, technical skill, aptitude for material or intellectual exchange, and so forth. They could thus preside over activities. They inspired works. Invocations and evocations were not reducible to words. Even having become symbolic, when written discourse and signs came to prevail, these divine figures and the specific sites that held them, sky, earth, sea, sex, Athens, Cyprus, Delphi, Olympus. Deloses lived on in the language of the Greeks. They influenced time and space, objects, acts, situations. Antique mythology re-established the unity between man and nature that had been disassociated by the city, by abstraction, by the use of signs and numbers. It played the role of a living and lived mediation, both fantastic and practical, images and activities themselves, both natural and social. It was thus far more than a system of significations, or a combination of significant elements. It was a style of life, political and religious, at the same time, with specifically pagan features. Hence the creative power of this mythology, far above that of ideological illusion that might include beliefs, far above the magical illusion of taming nature by the use of divine names and gestures. Greek art presupposes Greek mythology, that is nature, and the social forms already reworked in an unconsciously artistic way by the popular imagination marks. Antique mythology gives us an admirable example of spontaneous poiesis, initial and primordial creation in itself, unconscious followed by mimesis that is itself, living, creative, reflecting and extending the poiesis from which it derives. On many occasions, we have employed the expression, social language. Does this forget that all language is social? No. By the added adjective, we mean to emphasize certain points in real language, real society, in praxis. This social language differs from soliloquy, and likewise from pure discourse, logic, and literary language. It is acted and lived as well as spoken. Gestures support it and comment on words. With partners who enter into a relationship, these gestures are often regulated on both sides, even ritualized. Context even becomes custom. For example, the advocate's robe, the priest's surplice, etc. Social language is both mimicry and mimetic. We may assume that the ritual gestures go back to the most distant archaisms, and that ethnologists can follow their desacralization. Ritual gestures and words, it seems, were deemed to act on nature by way of a kind of supernature, made up of occult forces and qualities. Reciprocally, an effective action on this supernature was obtained and sought by way of real or fictitious action on nature, first of all by way of gestures and phrases. The ambiguity of the sacred and the accursed serves as a starting point. A multiple ambiguity, the sacred and the biological, have a primordial and obscure relation. Effectiveness is sought by way of a succession of words and gestures that are linked, isolatable, repeatable, both ambiguous and rigorous. Ambiguous in sense and rigorous in form. In this way, a formalism is defined within a confusion, sacred curse, nature, supernature, and even a totality, economic, social, ethical, etc. It seems that the gestures best linked and founded, the best rhythmed, separate out from the others and constitute the best and purest form. They are thereby profaned by their own action. Paradoxically, this formalized and ritualized convention determines a natural that stands between raw nature and awkward facticity. By desacralizing, leaving aside both religious liturgies and the magical formulas of sorcery, these formalisms serve, as it were, as support and mold for the chaos of gestures and words in human relations. They give form to the unformed. By defining a natural, they define an agreeability, a charm, and thus a beauty, a perfection, a harmony. The most successful become exemplary. The philosophy that naturally links up with these social formalizations is Platonism, but outside of all philosophy, they enter into town planning, into civility, and consequently into civilization. This charm actualizes a mediation both fictitious and real between man and nature, between culture and biological reality. A kind of appropriation of nature by way of the social is accomplished, and of the social by way of nature, an appropriation that is incomplete, alienated, but which can always be said to be better than nothing. Among these formalisms that have entered into everyday life and are encrusted in use by time, we can mention the rituals and forms of politeness. With their particular symbolism that has come down from the age of feudalism, the handshake and hand-kissing, their magic formulas good health, Godspeed, offerings, a cigarette. Initially then, the idea or project of communication by way of contact, communion in the reciprocal and simultaneous gesture, in the mind drama of the meeting. We may also mention the strange formalisms of justice and its apparatus, and the still stranger ones that govern the transfer of property, formulas of notarized acts. These are systems of meaning established on the basis of forms that are all institutionalized, directly or indirectly, thus perpetuating the regulated and mined acts. These formalisms determine several particular kinds or types of mimicry and mimetism, thus mimesis, which we shall simply list. Etiquette, ceremonial, the code of manners, hence mannerism and aestheticism, which confers on acts, objects, and situations a parody of style. The form must always be capable of repetition. This is its solidity and rigor. However, it is never purely and simply repeated. It is adapted. The general must take account of the particular, and even of the inaccessible singularities of beings and situations. We evolve in the mixed zone of mimesis. Both constraint on nature and orientation of gestures, formalism can supply an ethics. Finally, it can either be charged with an ideology or replace one. Things may lead to a dramatization or even open onto the tragic. Risks and perils are dominated in both fiction and reality by way of a noble gesture. Was not the nobility of the gesture, maintained in danger, mastering emotion, the wellspring of tragedy for the French playwrights of the 17th century? Is it not the secret of panache, display? An aestheticism that has become natural or passes for such is made into tradition and custom. In France it runs down the centuries, transmitted from one class to another. Among the major forms that have come down to us and include law and logic, should we not count the strangest of formalisms of courtly love? Originally, at its birth, or its foundation if you like, a mad idea, the maddest of ideas and most delirious of projects, the unique love of one unique being for another. The impossible, conceived and posited as impossible, was at the same time posited as absolute possibility, as rationale of the palpable. The other being is known to be inaccessible, and the absolute can be attained only in the relative. The beloved being is doubly distant, in both body and soul. The lover commits himself to realize this impossibility, to bend all his forces towards the inaccessible, to live constantly in the desire for the absolute. To put an end to separation and split, here, in his madness, the initial poiesis is evident. What mysterious cruelty, what strength must one not possess in order to attempt this love? The great Western madness, creator of a limitless number of sensations, prevents us from dwelling in platitude. It has been until now the only style of this West its grandeur, along with its opposite, accumulation of knowledge of capital. Let us now consider, under the sign of culture that has replaced style, the gaps and distortions characteristic of the great separation. We already know that the dissociations into separate sectors are accompanied by growing uniformity, common to all sectors. This is how it is in everyday life, labour, private life, leisure. Hence the other three elements of everydayness, objects, activities, situations, each follow their own course. But the same law of quantitative growth and mimetic uniformity applies in each sector. The role of technological objects becomes predominant and determinant. The automobile, a technological object of use, comes to the fore and is transformed before our eyes in our Western society into leading object. It determines important significations, it demands colossal investments, the transformation of towns, their evisceration. The automobile is the head of the system, insofar as there is a system, and not simply a succession of compulsions empirically undergone. During this time, consumption is profoundly refashioned. Larger-scale capitalism concerns itself with rationalizing the system of distribution in its own way. As distribution is seen as essential, rationality seems to extend to the entirety of economic activities. We have gone further than studies that prospect the market or act on needs by way of advertising. The chain stores and supermarkets, according to their apologists, represent the new style of consumption. In the world of objects, thus presented in a total spectacle, in this objectal chain store Uniprix world, everyday objects copy the technical object, a model in itself inaccessibly. The distance between the everyday object and the high-tech is that between the electric mixer and the missile. At their lower level, familiar objects are structured and functional, like technical objects. That is, they require a double analysis to be exhaustive. Analysis of their structure and the operation of their component parts, and analysis of the function performed by this combination of elements. The mimetic character of the ensemble of everyday objects, moreover, is accentuated as their very manufacture becomes mimesis, with molecular chemistry and plastics molding moulage replaces assembly montage. The object is produced by direct reproduction. These mimetic objects constitute a complete assortment, as seen in the chain stores Uniprix and supermarkets, and possess a characteristic style or absence of style. The Uniprix style, from furniture through to cheeses, they are neither good nor bad, neither ugly nor beautiful, they are useful. Do these objects form systems? Yes and no. Yes, in that they constitute a vast system determined by the operatory, structural and functional character of the analytical understanding in action. There are even partial systems, inasmuch as pilot objects dominate, imposing options the automobile or having consequences for everyday life television. But these partial systems, unless they are institutionalized and bureaucratized, are broken and integrated into the general system of the object in our society. And we no longer know if there is a systemi, that is a rational coherence, for we know that there can be the appearance of a system, a deceptive appearance, half fictitious and half real. An illusion of rationality that invites a search for rationality and coherence, without these ever revealing themselves except by reference to the absurd. For example, in the state and bureaucracy, examination of small technical objects, gadgets, leads to perplexity. The technical rationality of each does not extend to their ensemble, which may well be quite absurd. It is with the ensemble of pseudo-technical objects, gadgets, and functional useful objects that high technology and the leaders of society treat everyday life as a colonized and underdeveloped sector of praxis. The chain stores and supermarkets are analogous to the old colonial trading counters. Technical objects command rational behaviors. In relation to these behaviors, the affectivity and emotionality frequently attached to them are always absurd. Thus, it is absurd to see the automobile as an instrument of power, as opportunity for sportive play on the roads, as a companion, spouse, or mistress. It is lamentable that people become rude and abandon culture and civility as soon as they are at the steering wheel. And yet these residues of emotionality and affectivity bring a little fantasy and variety to behavior. Rational progress consists in their elimination. In other words, behaviors tend toward uniformity. They are copied. Under the sign of analytical separation and disassociation, a reign of uniformity is established. This is more paradoxical than it might seem. We know that complexity covers up homogeneity, that distinction veils argument. People imitate. Imitation is not an individual phenomenon, a relationship between one individual and another. It is a social relation, a form that produces conformity and a vast conformist mentality. Attitudes have replaced autonomous activities, and attitudes are mimicry. Just as attitudes and mimicry have replaced activities, in the same way, roles have replaced perceived and experienced situations. It is curious that psychologists and sociologists observe attitudes, behaviors, roles. They study them in an uncritical manner, thus confirming mimesis and the reign of mimesis, that of the analytical understanding, discourse and rationality, without discerning the fundamentals and therefore without spelling out and explaining. They thus accept without any kind of investigation, as an eternal requirement of society, the general tendency to stereotype, and the tendency to imitate the idols and pantheon of the modern world. For us, on the other hand, this ambiguous aim, this intermediary between reproduction and the inaccessible, is what defines mimesis. 220 millions eat a philosophy. Can people be reproached in the modern world for wagering unconsciously on mimesis, living by imitating and imitating to survive? No. They are free. Too free. Abandoned. Individualism dies and the individual triumphs. In this Pyrrhic victory, he no longer knows whom to blame for his failures and defeats. Individuation and massification do not exclude one another, as was believed in the Belle Epoque. On the contrary, the individual constitutes himself as such by borrowing a general image of individuality from other individuals, whose individuality he supposes to be complete and perfect. And the latter act likewise, conforming either to an external image or to the image they wish to give of themselves, the image that is demanded. David Riesman's analyses in The Lonely Crowd are interesting but insufficient, relative to a certain period of Americanism. It is true that when there was still a living community, the members of this community corresponded, communicated, and even communed with one another without having to imitate or resemble each other, except in appearance. They were fashioned formed by the tight conditions, limiting but formative, of the community, of the style, of the organic unity, which was in no way a system. In such conditions, individuals, despite being little individualized and knowing nothing of individualism, had characteristics and character. The age of community was also that of characters. A shadow or trace of poiesis remains in the very notion of character. We know very well that character, good or bad, tends to disappear in the age of patterns. After the community, there was, according to Riesman, the period of autonomous consciousness, but was not this autonomous consciousness already commanded from outside, with an autonomy that was fictional as much as real? In other words, semi-real and semi-illusory. And when other directed man arrived, was the social orientation and social organization he accepts, not demanded, claimed at the very bottom of individualized consciousness, that of the lost and bewildered individual, unrealized and abandoned to himself, without an ethic to rebel against, without a palpable adversary, and without 46 EN, David Riesman with Nathan Glazer, and Royal Denny, The Lonely Crowd, a study of the changing American character, New Haven, Yale University Press, 1950. 47 of Inner Directed Man, English in Original, Mimesis and Praxis 221, God to Play the Devil Against. This direction that supposedly comes from without, which is what sociologists believe they observe, and actually do observe, as the bureaucratic organization of industrial society, comes in fact from within, from the uncertain freedom, emptied of meaning, that is devoted to freely reproducing, democratically copying. Under the reign of mimesis, the individual tends to disappear. We do not say that he actually does disappear, still less that he would disappear by decree of implacable fate. We describe and explain a tendency and a tension. The individual is no longer anything but residual. With the dissolution of character, what is left is the personage, the man or woman who compose role, face and mask, gestures and words as a function of what is expected of him or her, a function of the demands of their status or standing, the imperatives of career and hierarchy. This personage in flesh and blood does not have the clarity of the personae of a novel, of the cinema, figures that are behind the times and too close to actual characters. The personage of today has no outlines except those he takes on by following what is beyond him. This real personage has little reality. He is no longer the persona of classical literature, but a figure in search of an author, who finds no other author but himself, and whose own drama overwhelms him. There is something very disturbing in the analogy or homology between the three following elements: the importance of the methodology of models and simulations in the sciences of today, and particularly in the social sciences, the importance of patterns in contemporary social life, and the importance of acting social groups that, consciously or not, count on mimesis, the bureaucracy and technocracy. The correspondence is such that scientific representatives of the technocracy believe they represent knowledge of the social real, by virtue of the fact that they use models and study patterns. However, the uncritical character of this cognition, which is more a recognition, arouses attention. Positivism always bears with it acceptance. Science as envisaged in this way forms part of the positive reality that it claims to know, and that it actually does know to the extent that it participates in it. As in Marx's time, however, the situation is turned upside down, and thought put back on its feet. It resumes its course, by way of a procedure of criticism. It remains nonetheless that the new sciences are totalizing information theory, cybernetics, the methodology of models and simulations, and that the totalizing knowledge of conformities in relation to patterns, as well as the existence of social groups that live from this conformity and strive to gain power by totalizing activity, technocratic planning, deserves our attention. Structuralism tends to actually structure society. All the more so in that these groups possess not only theoretical sciences, but also totalizing techniques in praxis, for example, punch card indexes of the population. Given the discrepancy between objects, situations and activities, or rather, between things, signals, roles and attitudes, mediations are needed between these disjointed elements which each has its own uniformity. Language has always played the role of mediation, means, instrument and something more, element and milieu of reflexive thought, in the sense that water is the element in which fish live. Today the mediation of language is supplemented by the mediation of the image. Does the image provide a language, and to what extent can one speak of a language of images or of sounds? The abuse of language, of discourse seen as prototype of reality and intelligibility in contemporary reflection, forces us to pose this question. It is hard to give an answer. Certainly people, photographers, filmmakers, editors and page designers on newspapers, etc., make use of images in order to say what they want to say. As image serves as a sign, it involves the relationship of signified. And it is possible to speak of cinematic discourse and its rhetoric, Gilbert Cohen-seat. There is in the image an expressive character and a signifying character, and among the images there are active symbols and signs. Finally, image as well as language lends itself to a lived experience that is simultaneously individual and collective, acted and signified. All the same, it is possible to wonder whether the relationship of signifier to signified is the same in the image as in language. Words and phrases signify generalities, and only with difficulty, by way of the Mimesis and Praxis 223. General reach the particular and singular. Only speech, unique, living, poetic, unites the singular, the particular, and the general in the universal. Whereas the image designates or denotes singularity and particularity, reaching the general only by way of these. In lived experience, imaged or imaginary, and on an emotional rather than a representative level, processes are effected that discourse arouses only indirectly and by way of gesture, mimicry, costume, emphasizing the discourse and adding a substitute for living speech. Finally, a last point, the image seems not to lend itself to dichotomies, binary oppositions, syntagmatic contrasts, and paradigmatic oppositions, which, according to the contemporary linguistics of phonemes and the operation of sentences, are what characterize discourse. As a consequence, we express some reservations about a forced analogy between image and verbal language, the same as between music and language reservations that apply also to abuse of the term world. If one may, with caution, speak of a world of the image and a world of words, their superposition, interaction, unity, and conflicts, it is an exaggeration to define our civilization by the image. The term civilization of the image is as equally true and false as a dozen others. Civilization of the gadget, of the jukebox, of nylon, of technology, of leisure, and so forth. If it is abusive to draw a historical and sociological definition from it, there can be no doubt as to the importance of the image. From photography in the mid-19th century through to television mid-20th, the extension of the image has been prodigious. The image seems comparable with the fact. It appears as a given, analogously to the sensation and perception of classical psychology, something objective, in short, a fragment of the real. Yet the image, whether a single photo or a succession of photos, is ambiguous and more than ambiguous. It is dream and memory, escape from the real without losing reference to this palpable real, without dissolving into a transcendent other world. It floats between the real and the unreal, or surreal, without ever coinciding with any of these terms which place inaccessible boundaries on it. It always has several meanings and leaves people in a disturbed expectation, sometimes flattering and agreeable, sometimes painful. There is thus, up to a certain point, a world of the image. This is no longer the imaginary of old, based on symbols, their power of evocation and participation. It was in Romanticism that the magic of symbolisms cast its last rays, which were often blinding before the great promotion of the image we are trying to understand. The imaginary of the image is no longer a magic. There is no longer the power and freshness of romantic poiesis, that of Hoffmann's The Golden Pot, or the poetry of Hölderlin that transported the reader into a dream. Abolished distances, identified with ancient heroes. The modern imaginary is a social imaginary. It does not escape ambiguity. The projection and identification described by Edgar Morin have no freshness, no power. They scarcely go beyond the bounds of a compensating and compensated unease. They do not transport. What is most important for our radical critical analysis is that the image is reproduction of someone or something, of a fact, an act, a real or fictitious event. Reproduction as such has no limits. A photo can circulate in millions of copies, a film can be duplicated as many times as needed, the number is determined only by cost. And yet, the reproduced figure, whether a classic painting, a car accident, Marilyn Monroe, or the Queen of England, is inaccessible as such. The image is located between the repetitive, as its lower boundary, and the inaccessible, a higher pole. At the lower boundary, it falls into banality. Approaching the upper limit, it borders on the uniqueness of being and event, primordially and initially given. We recognize here the general definition of mimesis. The world of words, discourse, is taken as true or false. It is certainly either quite coherent or quite incoherent. And the world of images, it deceives or undeceives. It exalts or depreciates. It distances into marvelous remoteness and transcendence or insolently intrudes into familiarity. This is its particular rhetoric. It only appears to denote, to designate this or that, and it connotes. To the extent that it escapes mimesis and Praxis 225. From ambiguity, it completely mystifies with the illusion of objectivity or demystifies with the appearance of establishing a fact. It falls into banality or goes off into the extraordinary, the peculiar. In order to astonish, it is enough for it to approach the vicinity of the event, the figure, the fact, their uniqueness, though this astonishment does not last. Banality does last. A paradoxical consequence is that those works that make use of the image, films, photo exhibitions, reproductions, have little influence. What emerges is the star, the contrast between the ephemeral character of the work, even when repeated after being forgotten for a long enough period, the effacement of the author, and the importance of the star. The cover girl, 51 the model, deserves our attention. The star becomes a social stereotype, both effect and cause of a mimetism. The child-woman type existed among women, and in men's representations, Brigitte Bardot crystallized it into a model. The woman who aspires to accomplishment exists in society, and Marilyn Monroe gave it a face. The good little girl who becomes a good wife and mother is here in front of our eyes in 1965. Comic detail, she emerged from the comic rebellion of the yes, her name is Sylvie Vartan. Films pass, figures remain. Works live only through figures, models. Outside this crystallizing influence, moreover, the world of the image is marvelously deceptive. There is in this dupery the ultimate reflection of poiesis, a very remote one. Millions of women in millions of images, cinema, women's magazines, and romance novels believe they are encountering the reflection of their reality, their promotion, their beauty, their being, whereas all they have before their eyes, transformed into technologies, is the reflection of the oldest and most primitive procedures of femininity, of appearance, of seduction, to excite the nerves of the male. It is quite right that the social imaginary, one of the sectors of mimesis, should be also the domain of myths. And even more right that this has never been said, on condition, however, that we do not omit other sectors, including the ensemble of praxis and contestations, as well as poiesis. S152TN, Les Yes, was a nickname given to the English pop music of the Beatles era, as in, she loves you, yeah. Sylvie Vartan was a pop singer of the 1960s, little known outside France, married at this time to Johnny Halliday. It is useful here, the better to situate and define the reign of mimesis, to recall that the majority of machines that enter everyday life are machines for reproducing, from printing through to moulding plastic. Mimesis thus becomes a technological process. It reveals the essence of the machine, while the machine in turn reveals the social essence of mimesis. Records and record players, tape recorders reproduce music, voices, discourse on an unlimited scale. Photography was already a reproductive imitation of objects and existent beings. It is in this way, seen from another angle, that the world of the image is a mimetic world, mimesis become world. It is in no way surprising that in these conditions there should be models, patterns directing other directed man 53 from inside, while appearing to do so from without. Technological mechanisms, dispositives, have thus run through different phases and made clear their mimetic nature in a short period of time. The automaton of the 17th and 18th centuries, the chess player, that was a false automaton, artificial animals imitated, with or without trickery, the living and thinking being. This was only the advance signal for what would follow. Mimesis and its reign were announced by these small toy automatons, the first works, still charming ones, of combinatorial intelligence. Then came photography, sound recording, cinema, the worlds of the image and of molding, the key perfecting of mass production, change from production to reproduction. The place was prepared for cybernetic machines and mechanisms that imitate organisms, simulate discourse, and bring to life Mr. Everyman, this natural logician, Benjamin Lee Whorf. The world of mimesis in general, and that of the image in particular, was bound to have a reaction on art, and particularly on painting, as a unique image bound up with the uniqueness of object and act, thus with a poiesis. On the other hand, painting connects with the subjective side, with the gaze lay regard. Now this pure gaze ceases to be a gaze. The pure gaze at a pure spectacle is lost as gaze. What gazes is the object. The signal object and the image object have dissolved painting and destroyed art. Modern painting, with a certain delay in mimesis and praxis 227, relation to poetry, but actually with a certain advance in relation to philosophy, has made this truth visible and palpable to us. By opening our eyes, it has revealed to us that there was nothing to see. 55. Obstinately, without letting itself be stayed by repeated defeats, we can say here, it has committed itself to reinventing presences, to attaining inaccessible presences, to rediscovering poiesis by denying mimesis. A labour of Sisyphus. But we shall see below how the mimetic gaze, whether it focuses on the other gaze or only on itself, becomes redundancy, tautology, and pleonasm. Certain sociologists have discovered a modern pantheon Olympians moderns. The historical fact that this should have been discovered, while pertaining as it does to contemporary sociology, does not lack a certain humorous aspect. The gods of today are well known to everyone. They are commonplaces of contemporary society, the dominant images, the perfect stereotypes, the preeminent patterns. All that is needed is precisely to discover them as such, thus first of all to escape from them and grasp the banality of this imaginary transcendence. The modern pantheon differs radically from the pantheon of antiquity. What could be said of the old gods is that they presented human powers attached to particular times and places, stories, actions. The gods of today are no more than general representations, not presences. They are not, as is too often believed, even by those who accept this pantheon when they imagine themselves to be reflecting it. The product of publicity and journalism, they are the products of modern society as a whole, of its way of producing and devouring, on an everyday life that is masked and dissimulated because too painful. Through a fictitious society that calls itself mass and not class, one of consumption and abundance, not penury, of leisure, not work, they extend the second degree of illusion, the dream of illusion. To attain the pantheon, it is necessary to transcend everyday life. Power, money, and glory are not enough. A relationship with everyday life, and with people immersed in everyday life, must also be re-established. It is necessary to become human, by way of some weakness, some. 55.
Octavio Paz, presentation of the Nieco exhibition at the Galerie de France, January 1964.
We differ from him in that he refuses to acknowledge the social death of art, and its future mutation into the instrument of a metamorphosis of everyday life. Vulnerable side, some human suffering or misfortune, imminent to the everyday. If someone asks in what way socialist society differs from capitalist society in the respect that concerns us here, it is hard to find a response. The chemistry of plastic materials, the technology of moulding, the commercialization of products of this technology are more advanced on the capitalist side. There are probably more tape recorders and individual cameras in service among the bourgeoisie than among the leading strata of socialism. The same holds for individual cars. The temptation to the commonplace and identity seems identical. Both societies find themselves under the sign of mimesis rather than that of technology in general. Combinatorial intelligence rages on both sides, if seemingly more accentuated, more analytic, more dichotomous on the bourgeois side, because it has not been corrected by a residue of dialectical thought, or because it is less subject to a naive Manichaeism. What is certain is that the pantheons do not coincide. Neither Grace Kelly, nor Maria Callas, nor Aristotle Onassis are part of the socialist pantheon, nor the Aga Khan, nor Queen Elizabeth, nor Faradiba. And yet, the socialist pantheon and the capitalist pantheon do have some common divinities. Picasso, the Kennedys, perhaps Pope John XXM. Sylvie Vartan and Brigitte Bardot, if they were allowed to penetrate there, would take the proletarian real by storm, which is why they are so strictly prohibited from entry. A remarkable fact, Stalin, a socialist divinity, has become part of the bourgeois pantheon, likewise Khrushchev and Yuri Gagarin, and Fidel Castro. Let us hope that the war of the gods replaces that of men. If we believe their horoscope and predictions, socialism is already victorious. The bourgeoisie lacks strength. It would not have worshipped such a strong and cruel divinity as Stalin. What a power, that of socialism. The severity of God the Father is enough for the bourgeoisie. The capitalist pantheon in its decadence opens itself to the gods of the enemy. But what enemy? What socialism? One that needs divinities? That lives in mimesis, in the praxis of combinatorial and operational intelligence, below the level of revolutionary praxis, of renewed poiesis? Having thus explored the domain of mimesis, we can return to the concept. Our argument is that it renders transparent, that is, intelligible, but not in the sense of the analytical understanding, a large number of social and historical facts that were formerly opaque. Mimesis, as we can see, is not a phenomenon or a function limited to the individual, his psychological or psychosocial life. It is a modality of praxis. We distinguish it, therefore, from notions with which it might be confused. Imitation is a psychological concept that presupposes extreme passivity on the part of the subject in the face of the object that he imitates from. Outside, as well as the one-sidedness and simplicity of the imitative act, since this is only defined at the sensory and perceptual level, imitation is simple and copies an object or a being posited before the subject. As generally conceived, it reduces to psychological or psychosociological repetition. Repetition, however, we see as the lower limit, the pole that makes it possible to define mimesis, but where this is erased and disappears. Our critique of mimesis, fundamental and radical, demands that the concept be fully restored or constituted. It cannot be reduced to imitation in the sense explained above. Mimesis is active. It decomposes and recomposes the real. Structure is nothing but the operation or operatory protocol that, by analyzing and reconstructing the object, yields a simulacrum of it, Abraham Moles. There is a structuralist and mimetic activity, Roland Barthes, analysed by Levi Strauss in The Savage Mind on the subject of bricolage, with the result that this bricolage could be taken as symbolic of mimesis. The operation divides into decomposition and reconstruction, in the course of which what the object aims at becomes apparent. The intelligible, the simulacrum, or more generally perhaps description, does describing a landscape not presuppose that the writer has decomposed and recomposed it at the level of his discourse, introducing not so much his sensibility as its own intelligibility? Are not the writer, the painter, the sculptor, who failed to discover the source of poiesis in fact bricoleur, arranging a reduced model of reality and proposing this to those who view with amazement and admiration? The relation between this reduced object and the external model, a relation of resemblance or dissemblance, analogy or distancing perceived as such? Does a child imitate his father? Yes and no. He admires him, he follows him, he believes that he copies his gestures, his words. At the lower limit, he repeats what he hears and sees, he is close to pathological identification. At the upper limit, the model seems to him so inaccessible and transcendent that he abandons it as model, and a different morbid situation then lies in wait for the child or adolescent. In fact, the child who imitates his father or mother constitutes himself in an alienated and often deceptive manner by way of this imitation. He starts from his situation as a child, from his needs, his gestures and his words. He refashions these and enriches them or impoverishes them, equally on the basis of the image that he has of the adult. He aims at the world of adults, by way of representations and myths, the myth of the father, the myth of adulthood. In this way he becomes other than he was, other than he sees, not without alienation. We can say that pure and simple imitation is a pseudo-mimesis, or that mimesis is a pseudo-imitation. Mimesis thus conceived envelops imitative activity in the customary sense of psychologists and sociologists, but it goes further. It shows its internal functions and structures. The psychological simplification comes from Aristotle. Art, which for him is no longer poiesis, imitates nature, which is no longer physis. Mimesis is thus no longer anything but a modality of the spectacle. Mimesis is not conceived in its double determination, which the philosophical and psychological concepts of immanence and transcendence, repetition and aim, copy and resemblance, express only poorly. If on the one hand it is close to repetition and recommencement, of what? Of the acquired, the stereotype, the redundant, the established. Gestures, words, movements. On the other hand, it proposes for itself a term that escapes it, but is not transcendent in the classical sense of this term in philosophy. Mimesis is ambiguous, or rather double. In it, and in this zone, activity partially manages to grasp the turfy, to incorporate it, to put the image to work and follow the model. Thus, mimesis becomes creative and participates in praxis, without for all that being identified with a rediscovered poiesis. It encompasses what psychologists and sociologists call creativity, which must be carefully distinguished from creative power from poiesis. Conceived in this way, mimesis supersedes the psycho-sociological theory of individual consciousness, Tard, and the sociological theory of collective consciousness, Durkheim. The mimetic is social, since it is a modality of praxis. But it opens onto individuals, because individual consciousness is open onto it. It thus encompasses a multitude of familiar phenomena, such as the imitation of the upper classes by the lower classes, which presupposes classes, a hierarchy and a struggle, a latent conflict between mimetism and class consciousness. Let us now fix the limits of the general theory of mimesis. It bears essentially on forms. By presenting it in its main lines, we have successively encountered the forms of the city, those of discourse and law, those of social languages and accumulation. Without the necessity of emphasizing it too much, it is clear that the theory of these forms is not exhausted, and likewise that these forms and their theory do not exhaust historical and social reality, praxis. We have only given one way among others of analyzing praxis by connecting it with a primordial determination, poiesis, and going on to show how it separates itself incompletely from this as mimesis. Despite this notion having a relationship with those of function and structure, as also with that of form, we do not think that from this starting point it is possible to attain all the forms, all the functions, all the structures. We are careful here not to present a philosophy of mimesis, a system. We refuse to erase the differences in mimesis, and particularly those between functions, forms, and structures. We expressly refuse to reduce human reality, including the possible, to the theory of mimesis. Can we not say that reality, that is, praxis, is described and analysed in a new light? It contains forms, functions, structures. It can only be grasped conceptually at its various levels as an interaction of these three terms. Forms act on functions and structures and vice versa. The elements in interaction and transformation can be neither disassociated nor confused. Systematization privileges one of the elements, driving it to the absolute, absorbing the others into it. It totalizes praxis, or rather, tries to totalize it. There were thus, and still are, real systems, constituted or maintained by totalizing activity of praxis. This is how formalism, functionalism, structuralism are posited today, strongly and vigorously, but narrowly. It would be easy to show, in a case relatively close at hand and concrete, that of the city and its inhabitants, the motives and advantages of such systematizations, their limits, the aberrations that they lead to arrive in praxis, and finally, their ideological characteristics. We reject such a systematization. When need arises, we have emphasized separation, which never goes so far as making a complete break between the elements of interaction. For example, between the aspects of everydayness, labor, private life, leisure, or again objects, activities, situations, or what corresponds to them. We have also emphasized the uneven development of real systems, their disappearance, their dissolution, their ruptures, their mutations, the replacement by new systems, in a word, their non-convergence. A process of this kind is masked by ideological systematization, precisely by driving theory to the absolute and consolidating in practice this or that system, these or those forms. Functions or structures seen as foundations of a system. The theory of mimesis thus constitutes, among other things, an analysis of praxis. It would be interesting to make a comparison between these analyses. It is possible to distinguish the dominated from the non-dominated sector in natural, material facts. Does not mimesis establish a bridge, a transition between the sector dominated by instruments and technologies and the sector not dominated? Does it not mean the dominated sector embarking on an appropriation by man of his own nature, still uncertain and incomplete? It is also possible to distinguish what arises from determinism, chance will. Is mimesis not a determinism that encompasses varied chances and envelops will, yet which increases the domain of will? We have distinguished a mimesis still attached to an initial poiesis from mimesis that separates from this. Above all, we have emphasized a mimesis that becomes autonomous and automatic, which is sufficient for itself, or seeks to be so. On this account, it extends and grows. It becomes the general form of increase and accumulation. One of the strangest stages in this process, which indicates the proximity of its conclusion, is the pleonasm. In familiar terms, the mimesis in praxis 233, round-robin tourniquet. Mimesis tends in this direction. Is this by a law analogous to those of physics, closer to those of thermodynamics than to those of entropy? Would it not rather be because logic, the formal kernel of mimesis, tends towards tautology and establishes itself around pure identity, equal to A? The one does not rule out the other, and perhaps there is a relationship between the general logical form of stability and the physical laws that determine order and disorder, that is to say, precisely the conditions of the stabilities of nature. Activities that acquire autonomy tend towards pleonasm. From the moment that art sets itself up as a domain of its own, above and outside everyday life, as culture and not style of life, how should it be defined? One may say, art is art. In the same way, science is science. Philosophy is philosophy. Politics is politics. And so on. This tendency is accentuated when we move to the second degree, discourse on discourse, will to will, love of love, poetry on the poet and poetry, quintessences of essences, and so forth. Critics have often pointed out this fact, though rarely following it through. Paintings are made about paintings, painting on painting, images on images. This succession, which in the past sometimes seemed to offer art and thought an eminent dignity, that of reflection and purity, reduces them to tautological duplication. We shall not dwell here on the logology and egology of the philosophers. We have mentioned these in passing. We shall also have the opportunity to return to the circularity of the processes by which social systems arouse energies that may overflow them and manage subsequently to control and integrate these energies' feedback, self-regulation. Let us emphasize the palpable figures of pleonasm. There are little figures and little pleonasms. The crowd attracts the crowd very materially by a spontaneous mimetism at the entrance to a shop or a cinema, around an incident in the street. Success breeds success. The number of readers of a magazine provides an advertising theme. In competitions organized by newspapers, there is often a question on the number of respondents, often the decisive one. There is also the mirror that reflects the mirror, for example, the wife who reflects the husband, and the husband who duplicates the wife. And love that reflects love without a third term, world, rival, child, action. The pleonasm here is already more serious. It becomes important in our eyes when we consider woman, queen of the market, buyer, supreme devouring consumer, and supreme commodity, advertisement of advertisement, commercialized model. And it is the same woman who is duplicated with a real and an abstract existence, actual and symbolic, pleonasmic. Woman is woman. Cherchez la femme. La femme, c'est la femme. Cherchez-la. Take a motorway. In Europe, or better still in the United States, you'll come across restaurants and motels that straddle the road. People stop in their cars to watch the passage of others in their cars, and besides, motorways hide the landscape. Bypass cities are empty in an ever similar way. Everywhere the same cars, the same people. The same places that are abstract because denatured, and the same moments. Parisians on their Sunday outings are on the right track, stopping on the roadside to eat, wash their car and watch the other cars. Another disturbing figure of pleonasm is the enormous information apparatus known as the mass media, which produce fodder when real food is lacking. The machine for conveying news creates pseudo-news and pseudo-events, which the consumer cannot distinguish from true or real ones. Daniel J. Boorstin explains very well how this happens. A politician visits a town. A crowd turns out to see him. 1 million people are in the street, and 4 million in front of their television screens. The camera shows the figure of the great man stepping out of his car for 15 seconds, and shows the crowd for several minutes. For the television spectators, the crowd serves as spectacle. If we suppose that all these people stayed at home to see better, there would no longer be anything to see. In this way, the world of the gaze and pure spectacle contains within it the germ of its negation and self-destruction, at the moment when it sets itself up as self-sufficient, pleonasmy. As C. Wright Mills writes in The Power Elite, the immediate experience of the mass media only leads to confirming their success. The further one goes into the experience of significations. That is to say, the more one reveals them, the more radical is the critique. Contained within narrow limits, the notion of signification can serve a neo-positivist or structuralist systematization. For us, the world of significations. Inasmuch as it is a question of a world, is a world without substance, without certainty, even that of uncertainties. It sways between safety and adventure, between stability and aimless wandering, between the banal and the tragic, without support, without end, without expression. But at a given moment, so to speak, the notion of signification turns against itself. If we go far enough, we reveal the elements of a radical critique not only of the mass media, but of the social praxis that the mass media express, that is to say, that they dissimulate by unveiling and veil by showing. The man of communications continues to communicate, even when there is no longer anything to communicate. Above all, when there is no longer anything to say, he simulates communication, having destroyed its content. He becomes the automaton of communication as this is realized in the mass media. The man of signification, when he no longer has anything to express, signifies the insignificant. He simulates, he creates meanings out of thin air. He parodies poiesis. He reproduces himself. It is in this direction that we could pursue the exegesis of Superman, Mandrake, and many other comics that invade the press. Radical critique respects the appearance that moderate criticism sticks to, but goes much further in its analysis. Beneath the sexuality on display, it shows the asexuality of the modern hero, his devirilization under the surface of the exorbitant magic powers that are granted him. This Superman is nothing more than a robot. The automaton has no sex, or has only an external and borrowed one, a simulacrum of sex. It is transsexual, just as it is transcultural. Is sex necessary? An American writer joked. Not at all. It disturbs pragmatic rationality and effectiveness. It is a waste of time. Let us eliminate sex by a completely logical reduction. We shall attain identity, perfect coherence, supreme equilibrium, higher tautology, pleonasm. It could be maintained that this pleonasm consists in the fact that people find no other meaning to their life than reproducing and having an ever greater number of children, whose life will have no more and no other meaning than their own. Life is reduced to survival, which simulates life. Have men ever lived? The myths of survival continue the immortality of the soul. Survival masks life. Thus, the meaning of life, and the search for this meaning perish by self-destruction. The idea that life has another meaning than to be lived. The honor of providing the most perfect model of pleonasm falls to the cyberneticians. An electrode is placed in the brain of a rat. This electrode affects a region that gives pleasure when excited. When the rat touches a pedal in its cage, it triggers the stimulus and feels pleasure. The experiment thus creates a looped system. Only exhaustion and sleep prevent the rat from continuing until it dies of fatigue, this scientifically perfected onanism that simulates and reproduces pleasure. The looping and self-excitation of pleasure is the symbol and conclusion of robotized man in an optimistic version, one that does not suppress pleasure, which has become useless for stereotyped gestures and established structures. This is the palpable figure of the perfected automaton in a transsexuality that falls below sex and thus resolves the problem of sex need and desire. The reflection of the behavior that is reflected in it, replaces desire and even need arising from nature. The robot man is caught in his systems unless protest and challenge break the loop, unless desire is one day regained, unless man's domination over his works is poetically asserted. The organization office that develops and creates and regulates offices is not a bad figure of pleonasm. In a more general way, bureaucracy the world over has 3 levels: counters open to the public, reception bureaus for difficult cases, and finally, the hidden offices where decisions are taken. These decisions particularly include the defense and extension of the bureaucracy's interests. It has also acquired 3 very general dimensions: the organization of offices in the strict sense, the system of knowledge marks, that is to say, the hierarchy of competences and titles, the privileges of the mandarins, and finally, the relationship to the state. Among the general knowledges that make up the privilege of the mandarin is knowledge of itself, knowledge of the functioning of the bureaucracy and its hierarchy, knowledge inherent in the mandarin and impenetrable, secret, mysterious to people outside, and the lower degrees of the hierarchy. Finally, the bureaucracy supports and maintains the state. The state consecrates the bureaucracy.
This is the pleonasm, the vicious circle, impossible in appearance to break.
At the state's summit reigns the supreme. Tautology, the state is the state, or again, l'état c'est moi, as power is power, and things too are what they are. And men likewise, rulers or ruled, governors or governed. The pleonasm is approached by various routes. That of the analytical understanding of logic and its implications, of mimesis. That of discourse and the world of discourse, where discourse imitates discourse according to its forms and rules. That of bureaucracy and the state. That of the eye, of the pure gaze, or of objects that gaze. That of the image, a mediation that becomes sovereign. That of philosophy. That of technology. And finally, that of everyday life, in which circularities are established according to the following pattern: vital rhythms, behavior, reflexes, mechanical rhythms and gestures reflected in behaviors. This real or illusory substantiality is asserted by concealing from oneself and others the process of its tautological autonomization. Would there then be only one pleonasm, the great pleonasm, the ultimate tautology in which rationality and absurdity are one and the same? This question anticipates a subsequent argument and will only be answered completely in the conclusion. If there was a convergence of these paths, if we were faced with the empty enormity of the great pleonasm, the perfect loop would be completed sooner or later. We would all be caught in the depth of a blind alley on the perfect round robin. But we have in fact already replied to this question in the negative, putting forward the law of uneven development of systems, of autonomizations. What happens in the vicinity of the pleonasm, which we may now assume is threatening, but cannot be completely attained or actualized? The real situation in this vicinity adds something to the old theory of alienation and its limit, reification. We find here second-degree alienations. This limit is the pure and absolute form. It differs from reification, although it is analogous to it in its structure. In this vicinity, in each sector, each system of what the sociologists call limited rationality tends towards achieve coherence. It becomes closed. It changes into identity. This is the success of the system. We are at the opposite pole of the contradiction. Everything here is true, transparent, clear, and so everything is false, apparent, illusory. Reality here can be defined by a finite series of questions to which the answer is yes or no. The operational determination of the real imposes itself. This is accomplished, in fact, on the basis of the pleonasm that defines the sector, language, mimesis, state, bureaucracy, etc. This operational definition signifies that the operator manufactures the real that he deals with and claims or believes he confirms. Everything in this context can be put onto punch cards. The technico-bureaucratic dream approaches realization. This accomplishment, carried out with handicraft means by specialists in fragmentary activities in their various domains, could be extended by machines to large numbers of individuals, of determinations. Using electronic calculators, it would be possible to put large populations onto punch cards, onto matrices, with their attitudes, behaviors, roles, and functions. We have been able to define logic as a general theory, abstract and formal, of stabilities, that is to say of coherent forms, self-regulating systems. In this sense, by separating it from philosophy to which it was long attached, logic has enabled us to dominate the partial results of the sciences and to conceive the sciences, in particular those of human reality, as theories of the real and realizations of theory. Here we grasp the full amplitude of the logic of realization, that is, logic in realization, the constitutive tautology. In this vicinity, the individual and history pass into the residual, which the boldest among the rationalists of technology driven to absurdity conceive as indefinitely reducible by way of new procedures. Likewise, tragedy, dialectics, and so forth. Fortunately, this dangerous region is also that of the self-destruction of autonomized powers. Fetishism of language and destruction of language go strangely hand in hand. Modern art posits itself as supreme meaning, meaning of meaning in all senses of the term, that is, perception and sensuous organizations, directions, significations. And this is the moment when all arts and all artists practice a flamboyant destruction in and through their works. 58. They do so in different ways, through pure technique, through parody, through stammering, through heroic temptation to renovate, through silence. The real, constituted by science and technology with the blessing of art, leads to the consolidation of everyday life. But art cannot tolerate this everydayness, which it does not manage as externality and cultural speciality to encounter, transpose, metamorphose. In the general uneven development, the everyday is consolidated as a backward and underdeveloped sector, a substitute in the highly industrialized countries for the former colonized and backward sector. The everyday, as such, challenges art and culture, because they remain external to it. Likewise, science and technology, because they create it and leave it far behind. After having subjected it to their structural and functional rules, which leads to disturbance by this particularly tough real, the everyday, of the real as a whole, the real is duplicated and split more cruelly than before. On the one hand, it is what cannot be escaped, what brings satisfactions, what must be accepted, what should be grasped in a participatory and active fashion. On the other hand, it is what provokes an unbearable malaise, what must be defied or fled from, what can only impose itself on an imbecile passivity. In mass consumption and through the mass media, mimesis is reduced to the imitation of wealth, power, knowledge. It involves making the world into a spectacle, and the world of the spectacle, with the imitation of objects caught in the general spectacle, objects that are human beings. Spectacle and conditioning, images and stereotype behaviors go together, and yet, crude, clumsy, distorted by business and advertising, a kind of enormous ludic invention is attempted in this mimesis. Running through it, derisorily inspiring it, there is in mass communications a vast and wretched spirit, play on words, play with violence and eroticism, games of chance and death. In this monstrous mortal seriousness, everything becomes frivolous, everything becomes a game, although this game does not link up with invention. The critique of everyday life emphasizes the same tendency, which runs through the constraining banality of the everyday without. Under the volcano, where the self-destruction of the work and the artist becomes the theme of a work of art. In music, the line is marked by serialism, musique concrete, electronic and purely combinatory music and so forth. Metamorphosing it. Are we saying that these games must be redeemed, pursued further, and brought into convergence with the great poetic games? Are we remembering here and now that play is a moment? Are we asking if it has an ontological privilege, as Heidegger believed? No, we simply suggest that the self-destruction of autonomized powers presents an essential aspect of poiesis for our time. This destruction and this self-destruction are the poetic act par excellence, the conflagration that inserts itself in a striking and invisible way at the heart of our praxis, that which the powers in question divide up in order to seemingly dominate it. Under the sign of ever-possible general self-destruction and the atomic danger, the self-destruction of these autonomized powers is beginning. Thus, the tragic regains its place, rang. Our poiesis is still tragic. Criticism most commonly takes up an unjust and unjustifiable position without being aware of this. It criticizes the present in the name of the past, the town in the name of the countryside, industrial life in the name of patriarchal life, modernity in the name of survivals, the division of labor in the name of what preceded it, harsh reality in the name of nostalgia, and the memory of blue-remembered hills. Criticism never reaches radicality by limiting itself in this way. It floats indecisively between left-wing criticism and right-wing criticism, tending towards the latter. We can observe in the works of Marx, and particularly the so-called philosophical works of his youth, some traces of this hesitation. Yet Marx escaped from this. He took the real in the grip of a double critique, in the name of the future and the possible, in the name of the past and memory. The former encompasses the latter, and the latter links up with the former, but to the exact extent that the superseded subsists as past within the superseding. Now, unless the contrary is proved, our critique links up with that of Marx by taking the reality of the 20th century as its object. It does not set the past up against the present, but the possible against what obstructs it. It recognizes nostalgia only to the extent that nostalgia illuminates, that regret for a time before the division of labor proclaims that this separation can be overcome. The possible calls the past to it, and gives it a historical meaning. The possible prevails in the order of reasons and will, the past having its place in the series of. Mimesis and Praxis 241, causes determinisms. Thus criticism attains its full radicality and is strongly distinguished from any kind of passéism, although some people, particularly among technocrats, stubbornly dismiss in these terms everything opposed to their designs. The complexity of praxis appears ever more clearly. It is polarized. It relates in part to repetition and the repetitive redundant, in part to the combinatory mimesis, and in part, finally, to destruction and creation, poiesis. The mixture is decanted. After a long period in which mimesis prevailed, a renewed unity is indicated in the fragmented totality of its moments. A vast block soon separates out, a partial totality, mimesis in praxis. Another dialectical unity, partial and open, poiesis in praxis, would attain the moment of a decisive promulgation. The predominance of mimesis would have served as intermediary, the aim of poetry being, across time, practical truth, Paul Eluard. This horizon, both close and distant, is not however bright. It rises problematically. New themes are sketched, such as those of the relationship between repetition and creation. We have already considered these themes as metaphilosophical, in the sense that their elucidation must result from an investigation of praxis in its totality, and not from an ideology juxtaposed with the real and the theory of the real. We have in mind a new unity of the totality, grasped fragmentarily. This involves a unity in the difference between mastery and wandering, between domination and contestation, between safety and adventure. Thus, between mimesis and poiesis, between achieved being and inexhaustible being, between absence and presence. Human beings, individually and as a group, assert themselves both with and against nature, and such was poiesis, both with and against other men, such was praxis. Some cleared the ground for planting, invented handicrafts, others invented trade, industry, politics. Others again were conquerors. Sometimes certain peoples happily combined the various means of assertion, the Greeks, for example. Relationships bound up with domination, defiance, challenge, courage, always had two distinct terms, sometimes complementary, sometimes contradictory, one relating to nature, the other relating to men. Up to now there have been three terms in play and at stake: nature, other humans, and autonomized technology, the automaton. The second term, the bitter struggle between human groups, peoples, and classes, will attenuate after some explosive convulsions. In any case, we know pretty well the problems that this struggle raises. The third term will one day raise the most serious questions. It already does raise them. It faces man with his fundamental question, the appropriation of nature, and above all of his own nature. Either poiesis will move to the front rank in the direct relationship re-established between man and nature or being, or else man will be caught by his own work. Once again, the dead will have seized the living. This time, death imitates life. It caricatures it. In social reality, mimesis has always been important by conferring importance on this or that, but it was profound and productive when great symbolic images were offered for imitation. It is in modern everyday life that mimesis becomes flat imitation of models, posited as abstract objects, patterns, stereotypes, and images, the spectacular representations of the great of this world. By losing its depth, by becoming fact with one or two reduced dimensions, mimesis ridiculously populates the everyday and modernity. In this modernity, what is not simulacrum? What is not simulation? A few moments, a few dramas, death? Even that gives rise to comedies, histrionics. It does not guarantee any authenticity. In this modernity, mimesis reduced to the clearest and most complete expression reigns supreme, even while machines take over and realize it materially. Between man and nature, between man and his own nature, technology interposes a second nature. This second naturality is no longer the city, art, language, or even the world of objects in general, but technology that is at the same time instrument, means, mediation, screen, and disturbed, rather than diaphanous milieu. Technology imitates nature and man, who imitate one another, and men seem to find satisfaction and happiness in this. The time of the masses, the time of buddies, the time of pleonasm, the time also of protests, refusals, frustrations, and an ever more generalized malaise, which cannot be challenged in mimesis, yet could be crystallized beyond cleavages of class and demands defined in economic and political terms. Mimesis and Praxis 243. Along the way, we have encountered several familiar definitions of man: Homo faber, Homo sapiens, Homo ludens. We have stressed the anthropology of Marx, despite the fact that his thought cannot be reduced to an anthropology. Man is the being who founds a praxis, who acts and produces, who alienates and disalienates himself, loses himself, goes astray, rediscovers himself in his works and his products. According to Marx, this is Homo faber, deepening the concept of this. To the definitions and dimensions we have encountered, we added several others, resulting from anthropological research and a critique of anthropology. An elaboration that continues philosophy while contesting it and using concepts taken from philosophy. Man is everyday. Man has to accomplish himself in everyday life, in an everydayness other than that which establishes itself around us. Man is mimetic. He changes by imitating and imitates by changing. He imitates himself, by acting, by living pragmatically. He creates by imitating and imitates by creating. What does he imitate? The sun, the gods, the masters, celebrities, idols, and finally machines. He parodies nature in facticity. He caricatures himself by copying human models, setting himself rules and norms for imitation, morality, philosophy, and so forth. And yet man is poetic. He is born from poiesis, with it. He dies far from poiesis, his homeland. He has to rediscover poiesis. With the recognition of poiesis as foundation of man, we go further than the opposition of the rational and the irrational, further than anthropology, towards nature or being, and towards the most distant possible, the horizon of horizons. The struggle against nature, however primordial it may be, does not exhaust the relationship of man with nature. This struggle is waged with technological means, with instruments. But the relationship envisaged is also unity, appropriation, even in struggle and conflict. It is poise. It is heralded in his works, with a share of uncertainty, unpredictability, and the unforeseen. And now, let refusal reject mimesis. Let restored desire lead to the theoretical decision to refuse, inevitably by way of despair in maturity or dissipation in youth, by way of unease and revolt, and by way of self-destruction. In this sense, the political and philosophy, with a revolutionary praxis of which would, from elsewhere. In this sense, poetry will have its chance. We shall wager on poetry, this residue of mimesis, in the very long term. Chapter 7. Philosophy as message. We shall now consider philosophy as a message. Not in the vague sense of a testimony in which philosophy would be an angelic messenger of some kind of hope, but in the precise sense of this term in semantics and communication or information theory. In other words, we shall apply to philosophy the methods of semantic and semiological analysis. We shall ask the question, what are the structures of philosophical discourse? And try to answer it without dissimulating two intentions, two objectives. First of all, to use the concept of structure up to the limits of its zone of validity. And secondly, to determine and delimit philosophical discourse by defining it, or philosophy as discourse if you prefer, an approach that is indispensable in order to offer an objective balance sheet of philosophy in terms of what it has that is positive, a positive that may subsequently appear as negative, and vice versa, without abandoning anything of radical critique. The approach is equally necessary as a support for the metaphilosophical meditation that is born in the course of the superseding of philosophy, its contestation and dialectical negation. By superseding philosophy, in the course of this superseding, we shall say what philosophy was. Along the way, we have already introduced certain notions from semantics, semiology, information theory, and structuralist thought. These notions are not new, and most of them are familiar. We shall find them again here. We shall be able to ask up to what point philosophy can be said to be a metalanguage, a universal language, or claim that it is the quest for this. Does not the philosopher sometimes suffer from a hypertrophy of signifiers, somewhat detached from the signified? Does he not seek to accumulate what cannot be accumulated? What are the roles of redundancy, intelligibility, and novelty information in philosophical discourse? What does philosophical discourse denote? What are its connotations? In the modification of philosophical systems, what can be understood according to diachrony, and what pertains to synchrony? Each concept can be of use to us in questioning the philosopher and philosophy. As an effort towards system and totality, as a quest for meanings in facts and concepts, philosophy undeniably relates to semiology. On the other hand, it is neither obvious nor certain that semantics and semiology exhaust philosophy or completely explain it. If philosophy is a system of meanings, is it only that? The application of semiological analysis to philosophy may well allow us to discern a residue, something irreducible, by way of which philosophy in general refuses to be completely contained in a system of meanings that is closed and given, a system like others, by way of which, therefore, every philosophy opens onto something other. Would this irreducible be a poetry or poiesis, or the project, perhaps? Would it be the alliance and reconciliation that is glimpsed with nature, with being? Possibly. Perhaps philosophy in some respects, as pure discourse logos, approaches in other respects forms that accept those elements arising from nature symbols, expressive gestures, natural expressivity, which Saussure indicates as difficulties facing his method of analysis. Before embarking on this examination, let us pay some attention to semantic reduction.
This is the operation by which the linguist distinguishes a language from speech and from the chaos of linguistic facts.
Within this general phenomenon, two aspects are separated, language and speech. Language in this sense is what remains after speech is subtracted. Everything that does not enter into the system of signs is. Saussure cites the example of the Chinese who salute the emperor by prostrating themselves 9 times on the ground. The signs of politeness, endowed with a natural expressiveness, are nonetheless fixed by a rule, and it is this rule, according to Saussure, that obliges their use rather than their intrinsic value. Dismissed and bracketed out. By semantic reduction, language becomes a well-defined object, extracted from the heteroclite set of facts, and it is an object that can be studied separately. Language thus delimited is a system of signs in which all that is essential is the unity of signifiers and signified meanings and acoustic images. Language is a form, but a concrete one, as evidenced by writing. Semantic reduction thus contains dichotomous oppositions, that between language and speech. Language is always virtual and speech always actual, between the signifier and the signified, the union of which makes up the sign. And between synchrony and diachrony, linguistics has first to study language in its functioning as a system of signs used by a definite human group, with diachronic or historical study intervening only later, and subordinated to the former. Let us consider the semantic reduction as given. It reveals a concrete abstraction, language. This operation corresponds to the phenomenological reduction of Husserl, by which reflection brackets out those aspects of the real, or the idea that it does not for the moment place at the center of its analytical or descriptive research. The semantic reduction also seems analogous to that which enabled Marx to reveal a concrete abstraction, the commodity, outside of the chaos of human acts of consumption, production, and exchange. Above the diversity of needs and goods, the analogy or possible homology goes a long way. Like the commodity, does not language as such have an alienating and even reifying power which individuals and groups accept, use, or obscurely combat? Like the commodity, language is caught in dialectical movements. It is not dialectical in itself. It is a form, a structure, to be analysed as such. We propose here and elsewhere to dialectically reverse the semantic reduction, that is to say, to restore as closely as possible what it dismisses and brackets out. From the linguistic chaos, which is not praxis and study of which suspends praxis, we shall return towards praxis as a whole. It is possible to rediscover and recuperate the dismissed elements without falling back into the initial chaos by situating these in relation to the revealed abstraction, language discourse. This is rather like what Marx did in Capital. After analysing the commodity as formal structure, he returned to the division of labour and the real groups and classes that constitute society. The reverse. Operation of semantic reduction, conducted starting from the latter, would enable us to take back speech, gestures, expressive elements, systems that contain natural givens. Instead of dismissing from language and discourse speech and linguistic chaos with their diversities, voices, mimicry, etc., we rediscover these interactions. Do they return in the concepts, the categories? That is the question that immediately comes to mind. Yes, we can reply. The intonations of speech that animate and diversify discourse, these particularities bound up with individuals, do nonetheless enter into classified and familiar generalities, the figures of rhetoric. It would be easy to show how Saussure indicates this movement in his lectures on general linguistics. His reflection follows a double movement of reduction and of return, layer by layer, element by element, towards what the reduction dismisses. In this way, he posits simultaneously the principles of semantics, which presupposes reduction, and of semiology, which rediscovers the concrete dismissed by this reduction. The double movement has continued since then, with interdependencies and interactions between semantics and structural linguistics on the one hand, and semiology on the other. In his essays on general linguistics, Roman Jakobson reintegrates the figures of rhetoric into language without following this movement through to an end, since he restricts it to the two figures of metaphor and metonymy. Even if these are particularly important, as a whole, the studies and writings of linguists and semiologists complement each other. We may well be able to determine places, zones, sites, or situations that are occupied by systems in relation to the marker and referential that is language in the full sense, and without fetishizing this. On the contrary, ceasing to take it as a structural prototype of intelligibility and reality, while on the other hand not dislocating it or dissolving it. 5 in particular, Roland Barthes, cf. T'Imagination du Cygne, Arguments, Nos 27-8, pp. 118-20. Charles Peirce established the program of the semiotics. Cf. Also Émile Benveniste, Remarques sur la fonction de langage dans la découverte freudienne, la psychanalyse. No. 1 pp. 14-16 ff. Keeping a kind of respect for it, preserving in it its eminent dignity, on condition that we cease to take it as an end, and consider it simply as a mediation, something more than an instrument or simple means, but something less than the human essence. Without forgetting, finally, what has previously been stated so as to fully reintegrate diachrony history into synchrony, that is to say, the law of uneven development of systems. Perspectives on the explosion or dissolution of structures, equilibriums, coherency, self-regulations, which includes the idea of a collapse eclatement of philosophy as a system since the 19th century. The topology and typology of systems could thus be determined and located in an image of reality, both abstract and concrete. That said, we shall try to answer some particular questions. Should philosophy be seen as a metalanguage? Can it be taken as the quest for a metalanguage? Ever since philosophy established itself, in fact, Philosophers have always sought to find the common measure of all the works of man, aesthetic, literary, artistic, scientific, political, and so forth. They tried to elaborate a general language, making it possible to translate in its system disciplines, sectors, domains, branches of knowledge, the most varied modalities of action. How is the decoding and deciphering of all these partial and divided activities to be accomplished? By philosophy as general and clear language. The philosophical attitude postulates that this general translation is effected without betrayal naturally, and moreover without residue. Philosophical discourse would thus become a common language, one that all specialized men can and even must one day use. Whether they adopt the standpoint of thinking thought or thought, philosophers presuppose that their thought and their discourse attain the other attributes of human beings: will, emotion, passion, action, creation, and the very being of man, and that they exhaust these in the expression of substantialities or the explanation of meanings. Philosophers, in other words, each seeking to constitute their own system, believe that all other systems and activities are homologous to this and are formulated in their paradigm, substance, accident, subject, object, infinite, finite, in itself, for itself, etc.
By using the word paradigm in this way, we distort the sense of the word somewhat, as it was developed by grammarians.
For these, it denotes a purely formal set of significant oppositions. Secondly, we note that the philosopher reflects on words. Philosophy returns periodically to intuition, the philosopher taking a cure of immediacy. He seeks to brush aside the veil of words, go directly to things, plunge into the depths. For most of the time, he proceeds on concepts and signs, signifiers and signified. He takes them either in isolation or in their linkages, but always in language. The philosopher accordingly changes language into an object. He reflects on it, even if he is essentially interested in objects, beings, the signified. His procedure is thus analogous to that of the linguist, the semanticist, the semiologist. The latter do indeed seek to constitute a second language, in which or with which they speak of the first. The philosopher, all the same, wants to create his own language. He takes hold of common symbols, heaven and earth, light and darkness, surface and depth, and so forth. But he overburdens these, he overdetermines them, he makes them say something other than current language does. Does he create symbols and symbolisms? Only the detailed examination of philosophies and the whole history of philosophy would make possible a response. On the other hand, the syntagmatic connection sought by the philosopher differs from the connections of language only by its search for rigor. Philosophy would like to approach logic, algebra, geometry, the various forms of mathematical calculation with their clear and evident order of reasons. On this point, and in this way, the philosopher attempts a metalanguage, and yet he possesses a paradigm of his own, which does not coincide with any of the linguistic paradigms, and sees itself as containing a privileged content, not a form or list of formally distinct and pertinent differences determined by their opposition alone. Philosophy as such, accordingly, does not escape a curious ambiguity. It both seeks and seeks not to be a metalanguage. It has this ambition, but fails to carry the ambition through. Who takes it up? The semanticist and semiologist? Certainly, but there is an abyss between the procedure that transforms language into an object and the constitution of a universal language. The inventors of machines for translating and accumulating knowledge are closer to metalanguage, along with pure logicians. And yet the machine languages that exist today, Algol, Sintal, etc., are only steps on the road to this general metalanguage. And we do not know whether this can be realized, or is only the horizon and ultimate limit of an indefinite research. We know from Benoit Mandelbrot that a language containing discontinuous signifying units, words separated by gaps, stops, cannot be totally deciphered. Absolute and total discourse, accordingly, would not exist. It would be impossible despite being dreamed as possible by philosophers and logicians. At all events in philosophy there is discourse doubly systematized according to connections as rigorous as possible and a paradigm as complete as possible, and speech. This speech seeks to be living, creative, to proclaim a truth or produce a satisfaction, happiness among people. It makes use of symbols, it metamorphoses, it transfigures. In other words, each philosopher has a certain style. Inasmuch as philosophy seeks to be metalanguage, it fails. To the extent that it seeks to be something other than metalanguage, it lacks one of its aims, rigor, demonstration. As reflection or reflect, philosophy seeks to be metalanguage. As proposition and projection project, it belies this intention. As speech and style, it destroys it. By way of this procedure, the philosopher challenges the alienating and reifying power of language as such a power crystallized and fixed by the semantic reduction. Philosophy thus establishes itself in the duality discourse and more than discourse, alienation and disalienation. We rediscover here in a different fashion the aporias previously discussed. B. By refusing philosophy the capacity to elaborate a metalanguage is thought not condemned to impotence? How is it possible to move from one domain to the other? Do we not leave the results of the division of labour, the distinct works, simply juxtaposed? On the other hand, inasmuch as the proposition of a metaphilosophy has any meaning, does this new form of thought not consist precisely in semantics and semiology, which view language as essential to man, and linguistics as a fundamental science? Let us remark, first of all, that the relations between sectors in knowledge are not simply a matter of terminology. It is not enough to decode or decipher, to translate. That would mean posing the question in a formal manner that neglected the content, the movements of thought, the real interactions and interferences. When a discovery or an invention is made, and there is a productive encounter between different directions of research, something happens that is different from a new use of a word. We may maintain that a contradiction within knowledge, or indeed between thought and facts, finds a solution provisional, relative. As far as vocabulary is concerned, each user must be able at any moment to release all the meanings of each word, and tie words to their accepted common use. Naturally enough, this demand is unusual, and more than one user, even in the social sciences where it is a fundamental condition, is unable to meet it, with the result that we have a kind of fiction or utopia. It remains nonetheless that semantics here depends clearly on diachrony, on history, on knowledge. For example, how to explain the meaning of the word atom without recalling that it signified a simple and indivisible physical reality before going on to denote, through a remarkable reversal, a highly complex one? The semantics of knowledge may develop within knowledge, without depending on any kind of philosophy, provided that the entire set of movements of thought is taken into consideration. The importance acquired by semantics and semiology goes hand in hand with the withering away of philosophy. Subordinating philosophy to these fields of research, asserting the relevance of philosophy as a system of interpretation of the world in relation to semiology, means accentuating this withering, even if analysis detects something irreducible in philosophy. Semantics and semiology, however, if they do not end up in a neo-positivism that accepts and confirms the facts of language, and along with them the social fates accomplice, lead toward a reconstruction of philosophy. Structuralism hesitates and sways between scientism and worldview, between how and why, between superscience and Weltanschauung. Metaphilosophical mediation seeks to be far more strongly challenging. It has radical critique as its foundation. It does not confirm any fait accompli, any existent. It grasps everything, things and beings, works and activities by their ephemeral side. It places itself in the movement of destruction, of self-destruction, of dissolution, of stabilities, structures, equilibriums, feedbacks, autoregulations, etc., thus in a restored historicity. In a diachrony put back above synchrony. It is not only death and the consciousness of death that resists structure, operationalism, it is ending in general, and thus becoming. Here, the line of argument takes a precise form. Metaphilosophical mediation, which proclaims itself meditation rather than reflection, the word appropriate to philosophy rejects the principle of immanence formulated by Saussure and accepted by the semanticists, semiologists and structuralists that have followed him. According to this principle, the study is situated within systems. The analyst must grasp each system from within. He places himself, according to Saussure, in the situation of the chess player, accepting the number of pieces, their rules of displacement, in short, the grammar of the game, and is uninterested in the material that the pieces are made of, whether wood or ivory. The notion of system is bound up with that of an internal exploration of this system that grasps it in itself as communication and message, with its repertoire and memory. Metaphilosophy rejects and refutes the postulate of immanence, as a consequence of the postulate of system. But this is not in the name of totality. Such a refutation would be in vain, since totality conceived in this way can itself only be postulated, and postulated as the largest system of systems of the world. That is to say, as philosophy of totality. Metaphilosophy challenges the principle in the name of negativity. It introduces totality only with precautions: fragmented or broken totality, open and partial totality, virtual totality, and so forth. Semanticists and semiologists leave aside praxis, or even defy it. They withdraw to the formal, non-dialectical character of language, and also to the fact that language is not praxis, discoursing is not acting or producing. It is true that language, like analytical understanding and formal logic, such close neighbours, is not dialectical. To bring contradictions into language, it is sometimes necessary to twist it, to violate it, to inflict tensions on it. Structuralists reject praxis and dialectic, along with history and historicity. They do not find there the solid ground that they desire, and that the semantic reduction offers them. We think that by going further in the reverse movement to this reduction, that is to say, precisely by accepting it as reduction and rejecting its principle of immanence that fetishizes the systemic characters one seeks to apprehend, this will give a better grasp of systems, and still more so of the laws of systems. Is it not curious and significant that the most eminent semiologists, Roland Barthes, have hesitated before philosophy, confining themselves to studying one or other secondary system, for example, fashion? In particular, we shall perhaps discover laws, those of dissolutions, of explosions. It is in this sense that we bring into consideration the unclassifiable or even apparently insignificant residual elements which amounts, in relation to semantics and semiology, to a kind of rehabilitation of the supra- and infralinguistic, of nature as well as history, and also of the symbol, to which we do not unconditionally attribute depth and emotional participation, but which resists being reduced to a modality of the sign or a kind of consciousness of signification, without for all that making language or concepts into simple reflections of more profound realities. A final point. Metaphilosophical meditation repudiates the characteristics and features relevant or otherwise of the system. It is not a new systematization that would recuperate certain significations of philosophical systems or of philosophy as system, instead of letting these be lost. This is not the way, in our view, that it reprises, illuminates, continues philosophy after a radical break and an explosion of the latter. What can recent information theory bring to the comprehension of philosophy, apart from a scientific claim to supplant it? Let us recall that information theory cannot pass for either a scientific theory of knowledge or a substitute for the philosophical theory of knowledge. It likewise acts to dislocate this latter theory and render it useless. But it does represent a theory of the real. Along with its complement, cybernetics, it contains a program of realization. It accomplishes in the domain of the social sciences what the analysts of the natural sciences Bachelard and the critics of the philosophy of science Heidegger had foreshadowed. It does not study a reality, it constitutes it, it tends to produce it. It does not simply produce this or that object, this or that combination of objects, along the lines of regular science that is realized in an object, the scales, the lever, the Atwood machine, the retort, the pendulum, etc. It tends to be realized globally and literally occupy praxis. This is how it falls under the blow of a radical critique arising from praxis. This radical critique shows, for example, that at the very moment that communication is theorized and a human reality is to be produced according to the schemas of communication, reality is attenuated and communication disappears. The same holds for language, fetishism, and self-destruction. Analysis of the message does nonetheless have a considerable importance. We discern here, first of all, the dichotomous opposition, redundancy, information. The agreement between linguists Jacobson and information theorists Abraham Moles is remarkable here. Redundancy, as we know, constitutes the intelligibility of the message. At the lower limit, repetition, there is no longer a message and yet complete intelligibility. At the upper threshold, the excess of novelty and surprise makes the message unintelligible and also destroys it as such. Let us now consider philosophy. The philosophical message is necessarily redundant. It refers to what is familiar and acquired, experience, concepts, symbols. It seeks to contribute, or rather to capture, what is new in the world. We suspect that it oscillates between the lower threshold, repetition, rechristened for the occasion, recognition, or return to the original and primordial, and the upper threshold, named intuitio, supreme knowledge. But perhaps there is more. Does the philosopher not often confuse, in an eminent or rather transcendent unity, the intelligible and the surprising? Let us consider the Platonic idea, Aristotle's pure act, the transcendent one of several other philosophers. These absolutes are inherent in relative truths and existences. They are repeated in each act of thought and each apprehension of the real. They thus constitute the redundancy, intelligibility of the real, form of forms, unity of multiplicity. And yet, as sources of being and the diversity of beings, these speculative entities are deemed to bring the indefinite surprise, the decisive information always renewed by the intervention of the philosopher. Can this frequent confusion explain the very particular tension of certain philosophical styles, where redundancy appears surprising? Here again, the philosopher places upside down something that should walk on its feet. D. What can the famous distinction elaborated by Saussurean linguists between the signifier and the signified contribute to the critical comprehension of philosophy? We shall now examine accordingly the philosophical message as a sign charged with significations, that is to say, as a system of significations. Who makes these significations explicit? Someone who uses semiological analysis in a critical manner. This someone does not form part of a transcendent mind that would judge the totality of the world or the world as totality, with the result that the problem and its situation in or before this totality would have a meaning. This someone we call here, by way of hypothesis, metaphilosophical meditation, implying a radical critique of philosophy as ideology, as utopia, as mythology, and yet one that extracts from philosophy as such the forms and contents, the theoretical kernels, that it has constituted and that survive it. The philosopher drew signifiers from a collective repertoire, belonging to the general memory of men in society or defining this memory. These signifiers are of two kinds, symbols and concepts. Concepts come either directly or indirectly from praxis. They may indeed come by way of earlier philosophies. At all events, they are in the process of elaboration and belong to a history, for example, the concept of the state, or that of labour, or that of detachment, along with its opposite, commitment. It is in this way that philosophy has a relationship with praxis. It is partly born out of it. It returns to it and inserts itself in it. It has practical consequences, both false and true, illusory or real. It can claim to be invested and verified in praxis. As for symbols, these are initially phenomena of nature, light, fire, stream, height, and so forth. Or else they result from a simple, elementary, archaic action of men on nature, path, hearth, horn, Heidegger's dwelling, and so forth. These symbols have first of all been lived experience, in an immediate vicinity with the real. At this stage they were not yet symbols. Perhaps in archaic myths, these signifiers, fire, path, star, etc., had only a differential and combinatory role. Magic and religion, which philosophy follows, only overburdened their meaning by singling them out. The symbolism thus seems profound, though it is not profound. Psychologists or sociologists who believe in the inherent profundity of symbolism let themselves be misled by the distancing indispensable to the prestige of symbols. The specific distancing, also an abused term. And yet, symbols only act and endure if they give the impression of depth, poetic, psychic, philosophical, and only if they maintain this impression or allow it to be maintained. In this domain, however, appearance and reality are neighbours. For there to be a symbol, this symbol has to be accepted, so it has to have a symbolic power in a recognition that is reciprocal between subjects. The depth of symbols, illusory and real at the same time, comes from what they say and do not say, or suggest, or express. They come to form part of the content despite not having a content. It is in this sense that they are not just words or signs like any other. They say and do not say, they reveal and do not reveal. Words such as the fires of love, the line from Racine, it is Venus herself fastened to her prey, or the standards floating in the breeze. Everyone knows what such things mean, and yet they do not mean very much. Inasmuch as they denote powers, capacities, the Greek myths form part of a symbolism that is still living today. By developing this analysis, we would manage to understand the double nature of symbolism, depth and co-minatory, obscure symbolisms and logico-mathematical ones. We would resolve some questions arising from misunderstandings about this duality or double determination. The signifiers of philosophy are the fragments of man as he emerges from nature, takes hold of it and appropriates it, yet does not succeed, accomplishes only a portion of himself, or fails. Man and the human in general seeks himself by way of philosophy that seeks his truth. They provide him with signifiers, repertoire, memory. The signified is man-defined, situated in the world in relation to nature. It is therefore man-made, accomplished. Philosophical discourse differs from everyday language in that it is not learned by way of a practical apprenticeship. It forms part of culture, of what comes at the second degree. As discourse on the symbols and concepts of everyday language, philosophical reflection is even the model of this second degree knowledge that is inherent in cultural facts, poetry on poetry already known, painting on the basis of a painting, music on music, and so forth. Is this not what Hegel saw as the twilight side of philosophy? Philosophical discourse, accordingly, is made up of a large number of signifiers. What relationship is there between signifiers and signified? The specific problematic of each philosophy. Here, semantic analysis could be specified, diversified, qualified. It would indicate the motivations of each philosopher and rediscover circumstances, biography, context. Can philosophers not be classified into different types and species, into accepted classifications? For rationalism, for mysticism, for philosophical idealism in general, signifiers abound. Rationalism prefers to make use of borrowings from praxis, concepts, but not without adding to these some symbols cleverly drawn from the reserve. For example, the sun of intelligibility, the light of reason, clear ideas. Mysticism puts all symbols to work, mingling with them some concepts, identity, for example, boldly extrapolated from logic to contemplative or effective participation. What these signify, on the other hand, is feeble. For rationalism, it is the man of logos, homo sapiens. For mysticism, it is the human before the absolute or in the absolute. As for empiricism, its signifiers are poor and mediocre, it dispenses with them. Here it is man who is looking, observing, looking for clues. What is signified, on the other hand, is rich, it is empirical life in its diversity recovered in the name of philosophy. The abundance of signifiers gives a deceptive euphoria, which conceals disquiet and is disappointed by the poverty of the signified. Both empiricism and positivism, despite their poverty, have never lost their influence and have always reconstituted themselves with variance, skepticism, pluralism, complete relativism. Why? In our hypothesis, because they make it possible to rediscover the palpable, the sensible, and the real without, however, fully restoring these in their dignity. Can the gap between signifiers and signified not be viewed as a rather pathological symptom? There is a schizoid aspect to the philosopher, which grows with the withering of philosophy. The philosopher separates himself from the world, that is to say from praxis. He performs an epoche, suspending the real or bracketing out what it suits him to do. He reduces the world by a speculative reduction, very different from semantic reduction. Let us use the occasion to emphasize the analogy of reductive operations, the sterility of the one, which remains within philosophy the phenomenological reduction in the speculative line that runs from Descartes to Husserl, and the productiveness of the other. By epoche and reduction, the philosopher drives to their ultimate limit the troublesome consequences of the division of labour, separations, dissociation, the schizoid state. He hides these consequences from himself, strolling in the midst of a crowd of signifiers, amazed by their abundance, forgetting the signified which he encompasses in reduction. As a result of the technical and social division of labour, the intellectual generally thinks in terms of signifiers, he moves among them, he is among them. Other men, and manual workers in particular, are rather among the signified. The rupture and uncoupling in language, a social fact is also that of social facts. There is a convergence between the analysis that starts from the commodity and the analysis that starts from language. We shall not press this hypothesis any further here. Let us be content to note that the philosopher drives the situation of the intellectual to its limit. Marx's so-called philosophical works were designed to prevent the uncoupling and inequality of signifiers and signified. That is the sense, or one of the senses, intended by the rehabilitation of the senses, organs, directions, signification, in the 1,844 manuscripts. Unfortunately, materialism of Marxist inspiration has simultaneously impoverished both signifiers and signified, ensuring their correspondence by this procedure of impoverishment. The stubborn philosopher has the choice between a philosophy that is poor and ashamed of its poverty, a materialism more or less dialecticized, which signifies above all homo faber, and a philosophy rich in signifiers but deprived in terms of signified, the good old idealism. Modern philosophy struggles in its own way against this impoverishment, desiccation, and anguishing distortion between signifiers and signified. To effect this disalienation, it turns to poetry, literature, physics, biology, and so forth. What conclusion can we draw for the knowledge of philosophy as such from the distinctions that seem established in linguistics and semiology between symbols, paradigms, syntagms? As far as syntagmatic connections are concerned, we have indicated that they tend, in philosophical discourse, towards logic, pure and simple. The philosopher inflicts severe constraints on himself as he lays claim to rigour, to demonstration. Logic tends to become the syntax of this discourse, which differs from everyday learned language in the same way as it differs from the discourse of dream or poetic speech. Philosophical discourse only becomes institutional in the same way as everyday language when a philosophy becomes official as state ideology, a state that could be a church. Moreover, philosophy, vocabulary, and syntax can react on everyday language. As far as symbolism goes, we have noted its origin, its importance, and its nature. There is a triple dimension in philosophy, starting with its symbols. Light and darkness, height and depth, rise and fall, nobility and baseness, good and evil, pure and impure, divine and demoniac, vision and hearing, speech heard, and understood, progressing and straying, vicinity and distance, and so on. Likewise, tree, fire stream, horizon, sky, earth, sea, flower, mirror, and so on. Then the paradigmatic dimension, the paradigm of concepts arising from praxis. Practice and theory, need and desire, disquiet and serenity, attachment and detachment, work and rest, power and weakness, capacity and incapacity, cause and effect, agreement and struggle, and so on. And finally, that of categories, philosophical, subject and object, subjective and objective, infinite and finite, relative and absolute, partial and total, true and false, confused and clear, intuitive and discursive, empirical, and rational, palpable, and intellectual, causality and finality, determinism and contingency, necessity and chance, essence and appearance, reality and phenomenon, identity and contradiction, conflict and harmony, in itself and for itself, substance and accident, being and nothingness, actual and possible, space and time, and so on. The seduction of philosophy arises from the fact that the philosopher can, with a great freedom of choice, draw from this reserve of paradigms whatever he needs for expression or formulation. The wealth of this reserve contrasts with the severity of constraints syntagmatic, that is to say, logical. The philosophical operation thus contains several phases, drawing from the reserve, that is to say, from this or that class of signifiers, confrontation between the elements selected. Elaboration under rigorous constraints, which eliminates certain combinations in the name of the fundamental demand for coherence. Each philosopher conducts these operations in his own manner, as a function of his problematic, which he receives from his predecessors or obtains from his age. This analysis, for philosophy as for praxis, several analyses are possible, offers us three elements. One coming from the philosophy of the past, problems, concepts, the other from the philosopher's environment, and a third from the exploration of the possible, which he transmits to his successors, concepts, problems, projects. The seduction of philosophy hides more than one trap. In its time of withering away, it becomes an intellectual game, a relatively easy combinatory, which facilitates the recruitment of philosophers and gives them the illusion of following the path of great creators. Those who discovered an enlightening or productive combination, those who poetically employed a symbolism. How is philosophy taught? How does one penetrate into past philosophy, into philosophy in general, and into each particular doctrine? By way of paradigms, and also by the syntagmatic connection, taking logical rigor as implicit or explicit reference. The paradigms of philosophy make it possible to conceive the internal architecture of each system, its own combination of symbols, concepts, bound together with an optimum degree of rigor, categories that are legitimately or illegitimately postulated. They reveal to us the code with which the historian can subsequently decipher messages. The structural study of philosophies and of the conceptual architecture of systems is successful. Do its promoters clearly understand that this success seals the withering away of philosophy by reducing it to the status of a dead language? What are the connotations of philosophical language? Here we get into the delicate study of the figures of rhetoric, the use of symbols, of what philosophical discourse has in common with speech or written literary style. The straight line of logical discourse with its propositions, denotations, is constantly inflected by fine impulses, irony, reserve, embarrassment, reticence, euphoria, emphasis, depreciation, and so forth. Sometimes it is sharply broken off. Broken by what? By the introduction of an image or a symbol, by the arrival on the scene of a great classic figure of rhetoric. Metaphor or metonymy, hyperbole or parable, prosopopoeia, redundancy or ellipsis. Borges, in A History of Eternity, began counting the figures or quasi-figures of philosophical rhetoric. He listed them as necessity, reason, adjournment, relationship, consideration, format, order, slowness, position, declaration, disorder. It is clear that Borges is mixing categories and figures to this incomplete and confused list of stereotypes of discourse on truth, which we distinguish from discourse as such. And from true poetic speech that makes the truth of discourse, we would like to add emphasis and reticence, injunction and prohibition, praise and depreciation, extension and restriction, width and contraction, exaltation and abjection. Jorge Luis Borges, A History of Eternity, in Selected Non-Fictions, London, Penguin, 2 pp. 123-39. Superfetation and derision, irony and naivety, strength and relaxation, classification and derogation, diversion and avoiding, trust and disarray, eternization and temporization, and so on. This list could be extended and completed. It already has a fairly precise meaning. Empiricism is a reticent philosophy, prudent and attentive not to exceed the signifiers that it draws from praxis. Skepticism was and remains a philosophy of reticence, reserve. Emphasis unleashes the philosophical mystic and releases him from constraints in order to speak and claim his beautiful soul. It enables him to free himself from constraints, coherence, and detach signifiers from signified. Systems with a strong denotation and poor connotations. Empiricism, skepticism. Positivism make little use of rhetorical figures. On the other hand, connotation and figures play a dominant role in metaphysics in general, in idealism, rationalism, and mysticism. To this first list of figures we can immediately add another. Assertion, negation, denial, use, rejection, misuse, knowledge, ignorance, misconception, approval, refusal, contestation, understanding, conflict, misconception, comprehension, externality, misunderstanding, trust, challenge, defiance. It is important for our line of argument and our method to emphasize the triple grouping of these categories. Starting from dichotomous oppositions, they lead to the restitution of dialectical movements. Besides, they attain affectivity and ambiguity, whose role is incontestable but escapes dichotomies. The affective connotations, trials, and errors of social communication and expression return into the research. The rationalism inherent in the fetishization of the discursive is corrected without being dislocated. It is here and in this way that we grasp again, starting from the reduction to language and discourse semantic reduction, the realities that this reduction brackets out, but makes it possible to order and situate. We thus have different partially ordered 10 structures of dichotomies and rigorous structures of pure discourse and logic, inclusions and exclusions, inherencies and non-inherencies. We may think that the old rhetoric has greater meaning than a repertoire of outdated and outworn literary procedures. Is it not one of those great forms handed down through the ages which cross historical periods and modes of production, and which we have already met with logic, law? The forms of discourse and speech, the connotations of language, are as equally important as the forms of connection of concepts and those of exchanges and contracts. They differ from these. If this is the case, the forgetting of rhetoric amounts to a destruction of organized discourse, but its rehabilitation risks being accompanied by a fetishism of logos, the corollary, as we know, of self-destruction. Philosophers certainly use metaphors. They insert them as they can into their syntagmatic connections, as rigorous as possible, each defining in his particular way the order of rigorous reasons, but always with reference to pure logic. From the classes of signifiers that they have available, they take this one or that to substitute for another. Among these signifiers, certain are privileged due to their visual light, idea, clarity, view or vision, perception, etc., or auditory origin, hearing, understanding, listening, etc. These are most frequently used in metaphorical substitutions, when the philosopher abuses them and each page he has written contains too much clarity, light, illumination. Perspective, darkness, he is close to a pathological state. The philosopher also uses metonymy. Sometimes he abuses it. Consider the famous declaration, I think, therefore I am. If we accept it in the declarative mode, we are drawn defenseless into Cartesian thought. That is what generally happens to the student in philosophy. The semanticist, more demanding, will demand the exact signification of each term. In each case, he will find several meanings. We can go still further. We note that this famous formula is caught in a dilemma, either tautology and pleonasm, or else metonymy. Even. The tautology is double. When I say I, the I means thought, Hegel. When I say I think, I utter an initial tautology. When I say I think, therefore I am, if this formula utters a definition of being, and if it defines being by and through thought, then it repeats the same utterance, unless I consider the formula as an extension. A substitution of the part the thinking I for the whole being thought and defined by thought, or of the relative the self that reflects for the absolute thought thinking and thought taken universally. In which case the Cartesian formula constitutes a metonym. If it does not intend to identify being and thought, it can only be seen as incoherent. If the Cartesian formula is conceived as tautology, it is perfectly clear, rigorous, coherent. It is a deduction, but it is empty. The signified is not only analogous to the signifier, but identical with it, I think that I think. On the other hand, if it is conceived as metonymy, it is rich in signification, but lacking in rigor. It floats between empty rigor and complete incoherence. What does it signify? The philosophers claim to define being by thought, excluding will, emotion, action, etc., and indeed define it by his own thought, by his thinking self. Also the rationalist individuation of the rising bourgeoisie, and the pride and generosity of the honest 17th century man who has won certain new virtues, those of the bourgeoisie in its finest era, without losing the older ones, those of nobility. And again a stoicism, a firmness full of strength and dignity and so forth. We observe a conflict between logical rigor and productiveness by way of the figures of rhetoric. At the lower limit, thought loses itself in repetition, pleonasm, tautology, redundancy. At the upper limit, it strays into paradox, surprise, leaps from one term to another. Unconsidered substitutions, the abuse of metaphors and metonymies. The importance of these figures must not justify the omission of others. The philosophical connotations are far too complex to be reducible to two figures and their opposition, all the more so in that we do not think that. Philosophy, caught in the completeness of its utterances and propositions, can be exhausted by the study of paradigms, syntagms, figures. In particular, symbols belong to a class of signifiers, thus to the paradigmatic reserve. They submit willingly or otherwise to the syntagmatic connections. To rigor conceived by the philosopher as the rule of his discourse, syntax, grammar. They can be used rhetorically, that is to say, they do not reject metaphors and metonymies, emphasis and reticence, irony and prosopopoia. And yet they may disturb the continuity of philosophical discourse, and the transition by denegation from one philosopher and philosophy to others. The leaps of thought, the introduction of images and symbols, bring discontinuity and incoherence into this discourse. Sometimes, not always, do they not deliver its most valuable content? By way of signs, in the relationship of signifier and signified, a wide and imprecise project appears, the project of man. I think therefore I am also signifies the proposition of a consciousness that would fully think its content, that would dominate and appropriate both the external and the internal world. G is the study of philosophy, a system of significations confined to these generalities. Can it be summed up as an attempt at a classification of systems? Certainly not. The semantic and semiological analysis of texts could be pursued in detail in philosophy as well as in poetry, and still better than with advertising texts or fashion. We are scarcely approaching the specificity of philosophical language. In fact, we have simply established that philosophical systems constitute a corpus, to continue to employ here the terminology of the semiologists. Is it possible to conceive the breakdown of philosophical texts into signifying units, configurations of elements? No doubt. This dissection would involve the indexing and comparison of figures, metaphors and metonymies, reservations and reticences, emphases, prosopopoeias, euphemisms, ironies, and so forth. Also symbols, categories, concepts, with introductory texts. How do mirror and reflection, the tree, the seed, the flower, the horizon, the path, the flock, these solitary symbols that do not exactly form part of a paradigm, penetrate into philosophy, along with darkness and light, a manichaeism latent in many systems? Research in this direction could eventually show that the connection of concepts and systems obeys the principle of economy, 11 of least. Difference between consciousness, self-consciousness, for itself, with itself base-ish, or again between being, substance, absolute, in itself, are the differences not as small as possible? Are completely established paradigms not composed of symbols and concepts that, though different, are as little different as possible? Considering systems according to this synchronic connection, perhaps we would find a philosophy in each place determined by the least difference. Each system would differ as little as possible from the neighbouring doctrines, but sufficiently to be distinguishable. Perhaps we would even discover forgotten doctrines by positioning them in the ensemble of philosophy. Taking the hypothesis to the point of paradox, we would keep only a single dimension of philosophy, internal coherence. We could then show in the history of philosophy and the succession of systems taking into account abandoned and forgotten doctrines, a chain, that is to say, a succession of significant units. Random elements intervene between them. We could even amuse ourselves by constructing the matrix of transition that results from the table of probabilities of transition from one state of equilibrium to another among possible states. In this formalization, those elements that have been seen as determinant biography, historical and social context would, on the contrary, be seen as simply the intervention of chance in the transition of the system from one state to another. It would be still more amusing to demonstrate that the system tends towards a final state of equilibrium, which occurs mathematically speaking, when the Markov chain is regular, and the matrix of transition possesses at least one column made up of positive terms. This final state, naturally enough, would be Hegelianism. We would thus develop the notion of a philosophical system to its logical conclusion. We would particularly develop the idea of the paradigm in philosophy, considered as the most coherent discourse. We would show the role of formal rigor as constraint and condition of stability of systems, a role increasingly great through to complete systematization. We would go as far as showing in the philosopher's effort and the philosophical system an institutionalization of the boldest subjective aspirations of an age. We would take account of the double role of circumstances, biographical and historical, the environment of the professional thinker. On the one hand, these stimulate aspiration and reflection. They pass into speech, given how speech dominates the discursive message, and to the extent that it does so. But at the same time, the coherent construction of philosophical discourse works against the inextricable interconnection of circumstantial, aleatory phenomena in nature. Society and the individual, it fights for the regularization of thought and the thought work, against the chances of subjectivity and praxis. Philosophy, considered as structure of communication, imposes a type of order, discourse, logos itself. The philosophical game, or philosophy considered as a game, would thus have had its strategy. Theories and problems handed down from one philosophical generation to the next, from masters to disciples who accept the yoke of the master or free themselves from it, would thus play the role of filters series. recurrent units, regular assemblages and associations of units forming the network of discourse. We would thus place philosophies and philosophers completely in the general rules of assemblage, and composition that are those of every message or discourse, any work considered as message and discourse. We would attain the specific rules of philosophical arrangement, agentsment, in the formal context of the most general laws of arrangements. We would thus hold the broad lines of a science of philosophical systems and philosophy in general, considered no longer diachronically but synchronically. We shall not go into this detailed analysis. Why? What has already been said here is enough for our purpose. Drawing inspiration from an ironic remark of Hegel against those who sought to deduce everything, even this pencil and its place in the universe, we deem it useless to pursue this level of detail. And then, what is involved is a game. We would play with the great systems like a puzzle. Finally, this application of structuralism to philosophical systems would risk obscuring our purpose here. We also want to indicate that the triumph of structuralism marks its loss. As a philosophy of structure, revealing the structure of philosophy, it contributes to the superseding of philosophy at the same time as to its own criticism as philosophy, and its superseding as one of the last forms of philosophy. By driving it to an extreme, using the concept of structure to the full, we turn structuralism against itself, showing that it reveals deep contradictions that shatter its form and its formal theory. Philosophy as discursive imitation of the universe, cosmos or world, finds its limit in a theory of mimesis. The philosopher was the simulator of totality, and constructed in his system a simulacrum of the whole. He denounces himself in the formalization that perfects this in the general theory of models, analogies and homologies, simulations, this theory of systems which besides is embodied, if we can say so, in machines, and may be entrusted to robots. Beyond a certain limit, the structuralist analysis of philosophical systems and philosophy falls into error. It defies history and the historical changes in praxis, extrapolating synchrony, the system and the systematic character, to the detriment of diachrony. The development of the theory reaches absurdity. It is absurd to systematize the study, critical or not, of systems. By escaping its limits and its area of validity, analysis based on a preliminary reduction becomes unreason. Philosophical discourse never manages to be pure discourse. It is never reducible to communicability and communication. Speech here orients discourse more or less, speech that seeks to change something and not simply communicate something acquired and established. Philosophy was act, project, and thus image and poetry, thus history and historicity. If it exhausts itself, if it supersedes itself, this is by redeeming and realizing this project. Even in this exhaustion of philosophy as such, an irreducible element is manifest, which to the structuralist understanding appears as a mere residue, but for us is what is most precious. For right down the line we wager on this residual that the analytical and operational understanding does not manage to exterminate, and that we name poiesis. We may say that philosophy is not completely suspended on a timeless paradigm, only a semantic reduction maintained at all costs ties it to such a determination. Philosophies are not reduced to the philosophical logos. It is barely probable that translation machines will ever succeed in bringing them into a meta-language. Something will remain, as in poems. Philosophy will be irreducible because philosophical mimesis had an aim, inaccessible to it as philosophical discourse, but which it opened towards. Life, totality, universe, cosmos, or world. It aimed at this without being able to grasp it, and still less, so to realize it. And there intervenes in it more than elsewhere this irreducible element that it would be particularly interesting to study, the perpetual conflict between inertia of what is expressed in language and the demands of communication and expression when there really is something to say. Philosophical discourse, as arranged and structured discourse, makes manifest the limits of the structurally intelligible. Conversely, the analysis effected by structural understanding on philosophical systems, as on any system, manifests the limits of systematization and discerns that which already supersedes this in any philosophical systematization. These remarks suppress nothing of the other criticisms that can be raised against fundamentalist semanticism and structuralism from various points of view. The significations are worn out, and the signifiers remain without signifieds. Nothing is more empty and more disappointing than a world of significations, of meanings lacking substantiality. Are not money and commodity, analogously to language, signs of signs, supreme signifiers and signified, in an economic and social structure that language including denotations and connotations lets us see? Are the functions of language not more complex, more numerous than communication theory suggests? Along with its function of social communication, it also has a function of expression, externalization, elaboration. By restoring movement into language, this is reintegrated into dialectical becoming, as Marx reintegrated the commodity into the internal conflicts and contradictions of labor. Let us remember once more that the fetishism of language, its destruction and self-destruction, go together. Is it not quite dangerous, however, to privilege the symbolic dimension, to revive the aged concept of expression to equal that of signification? If philosophical discourse is analysed in a triple dimension, paradigms, syntagms, symbols, why suddenly erect the symbolic dimension above the others? Does not this amount to returning to an almost mystical theory of symbolic participation, a theory by which sociologists who believed they were explaining religion themselves converge strangely with religious thought? If we leave symbolism aside, philosophical reflection is no more than a particular case of mimesis. It loses any connection with creation, with poetry or poiesis, and likewise with praxis. It is no longer anything but concealed redundancy, discourse on discourse, repetition of the accomplished in representations issuing from empirical activity. The real and true that it aims at, that it never attains and that never give themselves to it, place it still more clearly in the zone of mimesis. Image and symbol are facts of nature, charged with a meaning designed to express the relationship between man in general and nature and being. We emphasize this double determination of the image and symbol in philosophy. A fact, for example the tree in itself and in isolation, devoid of general meaning, is charged in a context with significations. Freed from the empirical, from immediate practice, the fact attains the universal. The philosopher expresses himself with images and symbols. Sometimes he says something that transcends him and glimpses the superseding of philosophy. Is there not in certain pages of the philosopher's a dream thought that links the internal and the external, subjective and objective, and brings dynamism and movement to reflection? In any case, image and symbol are not without danger. They lend themselves to rhetoric, as we know. They substitute themselves for concepts. They permit the abuse of this narcotic that is not the image but includes images, the signified decoupled from the signified. Philosophy has received a part of its stock of images from cosmogonies and mythologies. Several great philosopher-poets have introduced their images and symbols into this repertoire. Plato. Other philosophers have sought to dispense with images and symbols, but it would be curious to discern these in them through a fine-grained study. Cf. Leibniz and the concept image of harmony. Finally, there have been great inventors of images, such as Augustine, who was also a great rhetorician. This study restores to history diachrony its primacy over synchrony. The inventory of Augustinian images and symbols is particularly interesting, as we rediscover here the long line that goes from Janssen and Pascal to Freud, even to Heidegger. In the works of Augustine, the reader notes a profusion of cosmological images charged with signifying the human condition: storm, wind, tempest, swirling currents, the abyss. The cross is the ship that makes it possible to cross the tumultuous ocean of life. The abyss, mundus, is rather terrestrial, with its opening and issue towards the divine. Certain images are borrowed from the desert, losing one's way, the void. Others are physiological images. Sin is a disease, an ulcer, an itch. Who is the doctor? Christ. What is the remedy? Grace. But the great image taken up by Augustine and launched into existential thought by him is the image of the voyage, peregrinatio. The soul takes the path of salvation or of perdition. It has lost, in the course of its wandering, the house of the Father, the dwelling, the home, the native land. It seeks the route to the heavenly city and eternal rest, which would also be a return to the lost homeland. 13. The questions and answers above are clearly far from exhausting the study and debate undertaken. Let us try, however, to give an overall picture. We shall recapitulate the argument and sketch a history. We take it as long since accepted that philosophy as such involves a double project, that of a discourse total and complete, and that of a representation that designates the possible plenitude and even brings the satisfaction of real achievement. For all that, this notion of philosophy does not escape the desert of essence. It does not yet become a whole philosophy, its essence along with its manifestations. The general project is perfected in the course of the philosophical history. It is made explicit. At the same time, it has revealed its truth, reflection on the discourse of naive and common opinion, discourse on discourse. This character has steadily advanced to the foreground, displacing and supplanting the wider project that concerned man. To the extent that all discourse has a structure, it is likely that all philosophy increasingly consists of a highly structured discourse. We have been able to discover the general structure of philosophy and that of all particular philosophies, within the project of a necessary and sufficient discourse, each. 13 on the house and the home, cf. St. Augustine Confessions 12:11:1, on wandering 10:11:37 and 10:5:7 and so on, on the homeland 7:10:11 and 1:6 and so on. Lefebvre's references are to book, chapter and section, though the philosophy contributes its particular propositions. It proposes its figure of the human being, which forms part of a prospective inventory of the human situation or situations. Circumstances, biographical and historical, the immediate and more remote environment of the philosopher, his umwelt, play a role, not negligible but still poorly defined in the formulation of what he proposes. Subsequently, however, the accidental and secondary aspects of philosophical reflection fall away. They appear as fantasies and ideologies bound up with individual situations, group attitudes or historical contingencies. They are the failed elements, general history and the history of philosophy, inasmuch as it is possible to speak of a history of philosophy, effector sorting. Those philosophies that are no more than ideology, in the service of temporary interests of this or that social group, disappear sooner or later. They are superstructures in the precise sense of the term, amplifying and dressing up these conjunctural moments of history into generalities. Other philosophies, the more profound, appear in retrospect insufficient as systems allowing a part of the real to escape. Their contributions, however, are integrated into the growth of culture, civilization, knowledge, praxis itself. The interest of these contributions forces reflection to return retrospectively over the entire work of the philosopher, to reconstitute and locate it. This work then appears in full with its character of a systematized discourse, with an architecture, a structure. That gives rise to the history of philosophy, and the appearance of an autonomous history of philosophical thought. In order to recognize the integrated elements, the moments in this particular sense, we have to take up the periods mentioned and pursue the analysis under a different light. Socrates and Plato discovered that man with the implication, man in his natural and social, thus historical environment, does not simply make use of material instruments, tools, which in antiquity, moreover, he left to slaves, he makes use of concepts, ideas, signs, he uses logos. The correct use of discourse demands the subordination of occasional discourses, opinions expressed in diverse and contradictory discourses, to exact judgments, to concepts, that is to say, to coherent and rational discourse. The philosopher knows the laws of coherent discourse and masters them in truth. The age of Socrates and Plato was also that, when discourse, recognized as mediator in social praxis, was taken as a means in political praxis. If discourse is the site of truth, it cannot be the instrument of power. Recognition of discourse discovers this internal contradiction. Socrates died from it. Plato sought in vain to resolve it in the quest for a political truth and a politics of truth, the laws and the republic. Was this contradiction not also that of democracy in the Greek cities, that of Greek culture? Logos there became sovereign. Knowledge became specialized into the formal knowledges of logos, grammar, rhetoric, sophistic. At the moment that it was proclaimed as supreme form and end in itself, logos precisely fell to the rank of means and instrument of power, that of a commodity sold by rhetoricians, sophists, grammarians, the structuralists of the age in question. The structure of Socratic Platonic philosophy was determined in the face of the analytic understanding, because this understanding was already at work in this philosophy. We recognize in this, a great poetic image, the maieutic. Man is born from physis, with the risks of any birth. The birth of man, if it is to be successful, requires on the part of the philosopher a double investigative regard, towards the origin and the mythic past, towards the possible and impossible. As a project of man, the maieutic is unable to define man. It asks what he will be. It grasps him in the risk of childbirth. B. The theory of a technical practice. The rational use of discourse. The correct employment of everyday concepts. The effort to extract the true concept, idea, from the variety of opinions, doxa. The philosophical critique of doxa extends to the whole of the non-philosophical. See, a metaphysical systematization, constructed around a suprasen. Seeble extrapolation, the discursive and conceptual abstraction, elevated to absolute idea. This idea, as we know, is the principle of participation metexis or participant imitation mimesis. But we do not know whether participant imitation is effected by the gaze. As the visual metaphor suggests, idea equal to that which is seen. Perhaps for Plato it was music, the highest philosophy since it is, both number and drama. Phaedo, 610, that made possible the best understanding of mimesis. On the other hand, with Plato, the idea is the son of intelligibility, through a hyperbolic use of a symbol. What would philosophy retain from this? Culture and philosophy retained almost the totality of Greek culture and Socratic Platonic thought. But they arranged its elements differently. Wherever there was the state, discourse remained an instrument of action, persuasion, intimidation. It would be cultivated as such. Grammar, rhetoric, heuristic, sophistic, dialectic, understood as art of discussion and technique of advocacy, would form part of the initiation into a culture crowned by philosophy. The image of the maieutic, no longer a great poetic word, became a metaphor signifying education, pedagogy, the relationship between master and disciples. The use of the concept as such was generalized in the sciences, technology, and praxis, without suppressing the diversity of opinions within this praxis, to the extent that there were differences between both groups and individuals. As for the theory of the ideas, it would remain a hypothesis of predilection for metaphysicians eager for eternity and depreciating of the palpable. From Plato to Hegel, the theory of the idea would be the formal expression, effect, and reason of philosophical alienation. One feature of the philosophical system was clarified by Aristotle, although he reduced the scope of Platonic mimesis closely linked, we believe, with metexes. For Aristotle, the system clearly is mimesis, reproduction, or imitative representation of the cosmos. Representation is defined as mimesis using a privileged tool, discourse. Art and technique, each in its way, imitate nature. The philosophy imitates the totality. He attains it because he, the philosopher, and not the demiurge or world mind, as with Plato, finds himself at the summit of the scale of intellects in the sensible, the highest of sublunary beings, the lowest of higher beings. The cosmos, which we shall distinguish from the world, which in its finitude opens onto the unlimited, is posited as finished, ordered in space, hierarchized. The philosophical system imitates the autonomous and automatic order, establishing itself according to its own laws and maintained within the bounds of the cosmos. It says what being was, emphasizing the past tense, which, philosophy as Message 277, accentuates the accomplished fact of a cosmos in itself, superior to the temporality of what arises and perishes in generation and dissolution. It is the pure acting intellect that is poetikos, the intelligible model creator of all intelligence and all being. This leads to a considerable difficulty, as noted by Leon Robin in his book on Aristotle. This acting intellect must be at the same time immanent to logos, to discourse, and transcendent, because absolute being. In modern language, the acting intellect is both pure redundancy and pure information. At the same time, Aristotle reveals in their pure, intemporal, form the laws of coherent discourse, logic, stable form of stability, matrix of discourse, technique and knowledge. Discourse and the discursive are finally posited on their own ground, elaborated as autonomous entities. The form of discourse, logic, is bound up with dichotomous classification, making effective use of the concept, genera, species, common characteristics, and specific differences. This methodology is applied in the sciences as well as in practice. Biological in origin, it was generalized because bound up with logos. Science defines itself as science of the general. For centuries to come, it would no longer be science of the particular or the singular individual, still less knowledge of freedom or freedom by knowledge. Logos dismissed myth and poetry, which would later take their revenge, however. Aristotle defined man with his place in the cosmos as a function of the most coherent discourse. Man, as political animal, lives in the city. There he finds his place, function, accomplishment, and satisfaction. He is the object of political discourse, which establishes the constitution of the city. The subject is the man of state. The structure of Aristotelianism thus comprises A, an image whose poetic, creative character fades before the passive and cautious recognition of the finished and accomplished the cosmos. This image, however, is not lacking in scope. It evokes in its majesty and admirable order, cause and end of the cosmos. Critique and project become blurred, while poetry disappears. Everything is accepted, explained, and justified in its place. B, a theory and a technique of the fully elaborated discursive form. The rigorous discursive form permits the mimesis reproduction and representation of all that is, in heaven and earth, in the cosmos, the city, and the intellect. Logic, rhetoric, poetic, expound, the order of perfect discourse. C, a metaphysics of substance of being represented as substantial, itty, unformed matter in some kind of intermediate place between the unformed pure potential and the inaccessible perfect form. Pure act, the stars, pure lights, celestial fires, higher realms, become by metonymy intellects and intelligible mediating forms. These elements of Aristotelianism would pass into culture and philosophy, where they would dominate for centuries. Much later, in the medieval town, new and original work in relation to the polis, logic, would provide the form for the accumulation of knowledges and techniques in the West. It would connect with the form elaborated in the Roman herbs law, the form of accumulation of capital. Subsequently, the split set in. Detached, the philosopher contemplated something from afar, the cosmos, broken up by the time of history, that of the city and society of antiquity. The temporal world still having an eminent form and order, imposed by an internal and timeless but open law. Open to what? To disaster, catastrophe, dramatic end. A critique, based on the split between philosophy and real men, denounced the madness of men. The philosopher seeks. He seeks wisdom. He thinks of the sovereign good. The good and wisdom are his own good, his own wisdom, which he offers without great hope to the mad. The alienated, an uncertain satisfaction, and an incomplete plenitude that he attempts in the crisis of the unaccomplished city. Poetic speech regains importance, and the philosopher sometimes turns poet, but in the fear and trembling of a truth little assured of itself. In its broken mirror, philosophy presents an image of what there is outside of it. For himself, as far as he is concerned, the philosopher only takes responsibility for his autonomous reason stoicism or his pleasure Epicureanism. Each time that the philosopher, and even the individual, is constituted as such, in opposition, more or less illusory or real, to the philosophy as Message 279. Surrounding praxis, he rediscovers this split and the options to which it gives rise. Individual search for satisfaction in the personal autarky of consciousness or else in pleasure. Augustine introduced into philosophy, or rather reintroduced, at the moment of the end of the city-states and the destruction of antique society, the time forgotten by the philosophers. For him, the spatial cosmos passed into the background, and the world calmed to the fore with the implication of systematic depreciation of the worldly. The world is not set out in space. It is an abyss of darkness in time and a labyrinthine trajectory towards the sun. Augustine coined the Christian slogan, Mundus est mundus, the mundus, as we know from Heidegger, who recalled its meaning, is the mouth of shadow, the hole, the abyss that is mortal yet open to the light. This play on words, mundus est mundus, deserves others. The Augustinian world is a fallen world, corrupted by original sin, yet in such a way that it opens towards God. Riven by sin, cast into the shadows, the world has a double history, profane and sacred. The profane world will disappear with the eruption of the sacred. The time that constitutes the world and the worldly turns them towards divine transcendence. The theory of substance and the metaphysical idea weakens in the face of two discoveries. The first is that man is desire, infinite desire, desire for the infinite, but broken, with the result that his essence, his corrupted nature, consists in a triple desire, which imitates infinite desire without attaining it. Haec sunt capita iniquitatis, quae pullulant principandi et spectandi et sentiendi libidine. Evil is a malady of desire. The symbols of disease and sullying are used here metaphorically, without scruple or reserve. The triple libido seeks in vain, in the worldly creature, the analogous of the divine infinite. This desire, like its failures, traverses temporality. More, it makes it. It is, by way of the temporal deployment of the fundamental desire, that transcendent God is at the same time immanent to the world. Disturbed and unassuaged desire can find peace and rest only in God. The problem of the reason and recognition of logos is replaced by the problem of individual remembrance, obscure memory of the original before the fall, gathering of scattered memories in unity. See how I have explored my memory in search of you, O my God, and I have not found you outside of it. It is here that I find you, when I remember you and that I am happy in you. 6. It is necessary to transcend that which comes from the senses and the natural light oriented to the outside, towards space, towards pleasure. I shall transcend transebo this faculty of my nature. The central theme of the Confessions is that memory imitates God, seeks him, and has a presentiment of him. It is reprise and tension dominating the distentio, which constitutes time and the world, and desire as broken totality. Each moment in the life of consciousness imitates and reproduces in its way the original failing, reproducing the distentio, this alienation that separates the earthly and worldly individual from the transcendent unity that, however, he bears within him. The distance of self to self, of memory to sense and thought, is also the distance of the self from the divine, a distance that is filled only by grace, which changes corrupted nature in its very depths and re-establishes desire. Salvation is therefore also returned to the health and innocence of desire. Only the call of God beyond memory heralds salvation. Without God, desire cannot become desire for God. Augustinianism contains an image, that of the fallen world, an image that Augustine intends as poetic, evocative of worldly dereliction, recreator of the lost unity and the path across the broken world towards regained unity and salvation. The Greek image of the world and its maieutic are replaced by the Christian image of purification and redemption by divine sacrifice. Rhetoric uses and abuses metaphors here. Metonymy is employed to present the end, death, rest as blessedness. This is not done without parables and hyperboles. Man as man is sick. Nature is not the generator of man, his mother and matrix, but the time and place of his worldly perdition. The critique of the world that systematically depreciates life becomes adhesion to the hope of another world beyond death. The world and the worldly are constituted as such by the act that transcends them. It is in God that Augustine conceives the world and the worldly. The relationship with the world is accomplished in 3 stages. The radical negation and depreciation that discovers it as world, the constitution of a higher existence in the wake of this discovery of the falsity, error, and faults of the worldly. Then, in the extreme tension of the soul, the intervention of divine grace. B. A theory on the structure of the human being as fallen and broken, totality, hence several disjointed structures. First of all, a palpable structure, naively and profoundly expressed, the 5 senses with their temptations, the entertainments that distance the soul from itself. Secondly, an affective structure, the fundamental desire and its breakage, the triple libido. Thirdly, an intellectual structure, memory reassembling the memories. And then, in a higher and already transcendent order, the suprasensible unity that is intimated by way of the knowledge of pure ideas, such as those of number. Here Augustine catches on the wing St. John's theory of the Logos word, embodied in Christ, whose metaphorical character is clear enough. C. A rhetoric. Augustine, a religious rhetorician, uses persuasive discourse, and all the known figures with extreme cleverness. He offers an apologia for religion, making use of philosophy to depreciate the world of which it forms an image. In the Confessions, he does not subject discourse to the demands of a thought founded on time, dialectical, that leads the existing to its disappearance. He uses it for the unconditional praise of an abstract thing, the church. He is an advocate familiar with all the resources of dialectic, sophistic, heuristic. The importance of St. Augustine in philosophy cannot be overstated. Against the image of existence in space, the cosmos, he sets up the image of temporality, the world. He posits the predominance of temporality, of becoming, of growth or decline, of rise or fall, over spatiality. Nothingness and the annihilation of the accomplished, the past faults committed, enter into philosophy. With Augustine, the successive duplications of the self lead him to view as a stranger both what he has been and what he is. The conscious being is defined by dereliction, error, the abandoning of existence in Heidegger's sense. In its rise, the soul becomes ecstatic. It tends towards the veiled being that offers itself and flees, that calls and escapes. There is another world, that of truth and being, whose call demands detachment from worldly life. Augustine founds, within the Christian interpretation of existence, a lineage opposed to the comfortable Aristotelian and Thomist lineage. This ties together the social, ecclesiastical, and political hierarchy with a representation of a spatial hierarchy in the cosmos. The Augustinian line would thus lie at the origin of the majority of heresies, all the more so as it tends to depreciate institutions along with the worldly, and to designate in time the strength and anger of God dissolving what was established. The apologia of religion and the corresponding institution, the Church, returns against the author's intentions. By introducing desire as an active foundation of consciousness, Augustine founds the line along which it is easy to situate Janssen and Pascal, then Schelling, and subsequently Schopenhauer, Freud, and even Heidegger. It has been said of Hegel that he was Aristotle revised by Spinoza. It would be equally correct to say that Hegel attempted a synthesis between the cosmos and the world, between Aristotle's spatialized hierarchy and Augustinian temporality. Can Augustinianism not be seen as an alienated theory, philosophy of alienation? But functional analogies or homologies in no way authorize us to combine the philosophies envisaged as successors to Augustinianism in a theoretical unity. The Freudian libido is no longer the libido of Janssen and Augustine, despite the identical name, despite functional analogies and even homologies in this or that philosophy. Obsessed with what lay behind the world, linking philosophy to religion, a great rhetorician making use of philosophy to slander worldly life and establish the transcendence of religion after having founded religion on philosophy. In the very long run, Augustine made the perishing of philosophy inevitable. Yet the superseding of philosophy is something completely foreign to Augustinianism. For him, philosophy has the same content as religion on a lower level. This makes it impossible to view Augustine as the initiator of a mental structure, thought founded on time, tragic dialectic, theory of the world, to be replaced by an ideal city. The city of God or a human city metamorphosed that would extend very far and encompass Marx and Marxism. Such an argument would reject the superseding and realization of philosophy by Marx, a superseding and realization that have nothing in common with the apologetic function that Augustinianism attributes to philosophizing thought. More broadly than philosophies, worldviews encompass these. The critique of philosophy leads a fortiori to rejecting the worldview or conception. For example, the fact of extending maieutic to several philosophies, conceiving philosophies up to a certain point as maieutic and philosophy as a whole, as a maieutic either avowed or disguised, does not rehabilitate the worldview. Maieutic is not a conception of the world, but a project uncertain, troubled, adventurous of the human being, himself considered as launched in an uncertain adventure. By pressing the reconsideration of philosophical history further in the same direction, we would be led to emphasize currents of thought, whether underground or visible by way of testimonies. These currents are not always represented and conceptually elaborated by leading thinkers. They are stimulated by images or image concepts vague and powerful. They have a long persistence, which shows that we are not dealing here with ideologies pure and simple, with superstructures built on a well-defined base, but at least with syncretisms. These are remarkable cases, sometimes aberrant, and thus particularly interesting for the history of ideas, which we are not seeking to normalize, to center around well-determined general structures, but on the contrary to divert from these well-traced paths. The Paracelsian heresy, for example, has run down the centuries. According to this heresy, the incarnation of Christ did not save the world. The operation attempted by the Eternal Father did not properly succeed. The world is worse than before, the corruption and tyranny of the Church being added to the secular powers that reign. The word logos is not enough for the salvation of the universe. The world, still enthralled to evil despite the sacrifice of Jesus, must be saved as a whole, and salvation of the individual soul is only a swindle. To lead the whole world into the age of salvation, justice, and peace, a new incarnation is needed, that of the Spirit, the third person of the Trinity. The incarnation of the Spirit is prepared in the subversive actions that this Spirit inspires. The Paracelsian heresy, bitterly combated by the Church, runs through and animates medieval thought directly or by reaction. It is particularly present in the work of a theologian who is relegated to the shadows by the official history of ideas, both ecclesiastical and secular, and who sought a synthesis of the philosophies of East and West, Joachim de Fiore. The nominalism of Abelard, who doubted concepts, words, discourse, thus the word, and paid dearly for this challenge to official dogmatism, derived from it. Likewise did Franciscan poetry. Paracelsianism, preaching contempt for the official church, the feudal world, and the hierarchies of its masters, justified the great peasant revolts. It probably influenced Catharism, a doctrine of the redeeming spirit. More subterranean still, the complete history of philosophy would discern the concrete modalities of perception of time and space, that is to say, of the social and natural environment, Umwelt. It would thus effect a conjunction and link between the lived and representation, between praxis and theory. The history of representations would connect at this level with the history of the city and the town, in which representations of time and space are projected on the ground and transformed there. The history of ideas and concrete sociology would meet up. Descartes? Here we discern first of all the fertile image. Man makes himself by knowledge, by reason, by their applications, techniques. The man Descartes, and men in general, are educated not by authoritarian education, but by reading the great book open before them. Knowledge is a tree, with its trunk, its boughs, and its branches. When the tree has reached its full growth, when it bears its fruits, the man who has cared for it and pruned it will attain plenitude. He will be master of the world. He will appropriate it for himself. Formerly, Descartes introduced into the methodical conduct of discourse the still recent techniques of mathematics. Aristotle was familiar with the Euclidean method, axioms, postulates, definitions, deductions, which he identified not entirely justifiably with a logic based on biological classification by genera and species, dichotomies. Descartes introduced algebra and the progressive construction of the complex on the basis of simple elements. For Descartes, metaphysics deliberately starts from a hyperbole. There is the methodical doubt, inherent in the rational critique of what is finished in knowledge and the real. Then the hyperbolic doubt that shakes even the most certain experiences, even praxis. In the course of this doubt, the evil demon intervenes, a quite reasonable demon, not too diabolical, who arrives in his proper place and lets himself be tamed by reason and the god of metaphysics. This Cartesian Mephisto, who appeared to him on the famous night of the stove, dissolves the unity of body and mind. He casts doubt on the external world, the body, perceptions, sensations, and so reduces thought to the pure act of thinking. By way of doubt and the disassociation of the physical, natural mixture of matter and thought, metaphysics is inaugurated. It conceives on the one hand pure consciousness, the soul, the cogito or thinking substance res cogitans, and on the other hand, matter, body, extent and its automatic movements res extensa. We truly establish ourselves in metaphysics, physics being broken by hyperbole, absolute doubt and the evil genius. The homo of the project is duplicated. Nothing can then prevent the abuse of metaphors and metonymies. By way of metaphor, the object is changed into space and the animal into a machine. In the wake of this abuse, there is no longer a place for the living. By way of metonymy, the absolute is defined by the thought that thinks it. It is duplex, after which matter and spirit, body and soul, the extended thing and the thinking thing will pursue the broken unity. Fortunately, this rupture is not an act, part fiction, part reality, and rather more of the former than the latter, the two fictions of hyperbolic doubt and the evil demon. It leaves the real man, the man Descartes, man in general, almost intact. And yet it corresponds in him to an accomplished rift. On the one hand, he is not materiality, and yet is so to a certain point, and on the other hand, he is spirituality. Hyperbole and metaphor are not entirely without content and foundation. It is precisely here that philosophical alienation is located, which, moreover, reacts on the systematized ensemble. The split between flesh and spirit, inherent to Christianity, somewhat attenuated in the Aristotelian though missed distinction between matter and form, is aggravated. Metaphysics seals it. It proliferates under the auspices of the divine demon, the evil demon. In later metaphysics, object and subject are hard-pressed to meet, and still more to recognize one another. Metaphysics, proceeding in the direction of the pure subject, philosophy of consciousness, or pure being, absolute identity, exacerbates the opposition that it seeks at the same time to resolve. Spinoza, an image of felicity, the sage understanding everything, explaining everything, accepting everything, in the vision of the whole third degree of knowledge, plus an extremely far-reaching formalization and systematization of philosophical discourse,
plus an absolute quasi-tautological position
of divine identity as cause of itself and immanent reason for the differences, modes, and attributes that it generates. Spinoza asserts the infinite infinity of substance, after which, instead of discovering an infinity of infinite modes and attributes, he perceives only two, extension and thought. The identity of the divine substance casus sui is revealed in the common belonging of extension and thought that absolute knowledge contemplates. A fascinating vision, since the same identity, substantiality, repetition, pure consciousness, and the other difference, attribute constantly pass from one into the other. We never know if we establish ourselves in perfect tautology or if we attain the genesis of the real in totality. The mirror of philosophy offers thought its double, which itself duplicates itself, seeking desperately to attain unity, totality, identity. Pleonasm and metonymy seek to meet up. In the identity A equal to A, or rather A is A, the second A both repeats and does not repeat the first. It is the same, and it is not the same, since it is the second. The second differs as little as possible from the first, but it does differ. It we emphasize the same in the other, we grasp mentally only the general form of rigorous logic, clear and empty. If we emphasize the other in the same, we have the impression, illusion, of intelligibly creating difference and differences starting from identity, thus of mentally reproducing beings and thought as thought of being and beings, from the starting point of being. Spinoza thus correctly elaborated the schema of metaphysics already implicit in Cartesianism. It is a formal schema, which tends to give itself a content and believes it does so by its own forces. It effects the formalization of thought and results from it. It passes from the form as perfected and decanted as possible, the form of coherent and rigorous discourse, to absolute assertions on the absolute, by way of an extrapolation as little different as possible from pure formal rigor. Speculative alienation takes the form of a precise illusion, the illusion, of creating with God, recreating the universe. The formal thought of the understanding believes that it passes from identity, tautological, repetition to difference, by taking a difference as small as possible. It believes in this way that it can leap from deduction to creation to production to genesis, or rather from pleonasm to metonymy. Leibniz, to understand him, imagine that he seeks to unite the cosmos and the world, space and time, that he turns at the same time both towards Plato and his conception of participant imitation, and to Aristotle and the philosophy of logos. His image is first of all poetic and musical, borrowed from the development of the theory of numbers, mathematics and physics, as well as from the music of his time, harmony and counterpoint. Descartes, in his youth, wrote a treatise on music, which already foreshadows the elements of his doctrine. Marin Mersenne developed the Cartesian theory of the unity of number and physical phenomenon in a work on the universal harmony, containing several laws of vibrating chords. Joseph Sauveur would discover harmonics, and Jean-Philippe Rameau give this discovery its theoretical extensions. Finally, Bach sought to unite the plenitude of the already well-established art of the fugue with the nascent theory and practice of harmony. By the late 17th century, this unity was already heralded by the great French musicians, including Couperin. We shall therefore try to understand Leibniz musically, and not according to the compromising metaphor of the watch or clock that would enable the divine clockmaker to harmonize the monads. Leibniz uses harmony metonymically, although without apparent rhetoric, yet the Apologia for God Iodicy is not devoid of emphasis. In his most general theory, which encompasses the partial points of view and perspectives, monads are vertically harmonized by God. Horizontally, an immense counterpoint links their perceptions and thoughts in a giant fugue. The monads hymn the praises of God, who leads an eternal choir. The philosopher perceives the harmony along with God, in God. He contemplates it and attains it by contemplation. The monad, moreover, is for Leibniz appetite and effort, appetitus and conatus. There is nothing inert about the monad, its matter being not an extended and thought substance, but the limitation of all finite reality. This real, given as will, is integral to the analysis. The same holds for the content. Leibniz passes easily by metonymy from thought in act to the thought object, and from this to will. Thus he brings new and decisive elements to the formalization. He attains a real, both continuous and discontinuous, by the double path of the continuous, differential and integral calculus, and the discontinuous. He reveals an aspect of the discursive understanding, combinatory and operatory, that was previously implicit. By an intuition of genius, Leibniz saw already in his adolescence that, by the combination of the letters of the alphabet and the analysis of the words formed on the basis of these letters, it was possible to discover everything. The ars combinatoria, according to him, did not produce abstractions. On the basis of simple and discontinuous elements, distinct, discrete, he thus constructs the real. God calculates. Starting from 0 and 1 the same and the other, he generates the discrete number and the infinitesimal continuous, the series that mathematically guarantees the connection between discrete numbers and continuous functions between measurement and combinatory order. Leibniz's intellectualism claimed to make the discontinuous and the continuous converge in a perfect mimesis of the divine productive act. With him, the understanding seizes the real, decomposes it into primordial elements, atoms, 0, 1, then recomposes it. He introduces intelligence into the real by a decisive victory over its resistance and opacity. Intellect is not added to the object from outside. By operatory and combinatory procedures, it makes a real as the given, or more so. Composition and arrangement are creation, and vice versa. Leibniz believes that he overcomes any dualism, that of extension and soul, that of object and subject, those of quantity and quality, finite and infinite, mechanism and finalism. 19. The monad contains its own principle of movement. It moves of itself. It is therefore automatic. Laws are internal to it. The counterpoint of monads lets every theme and voice develop freely. Yet the spiritual or immaterial automaton is not transcendent in relation to the material or constructed automaton. God ensures their unity, not only that of the finite and the infinite, but that of the continuous and the discontinuous, creation and calculation, spontaneity and practical manufacture. By dismembering and arranging, by operations, arrangements and combinations. Dum Deus calculate, fit mundus. God handles substances, minds or otherwise, like an engineer with his machines, though this is not without presenting certain difficulties. Leibniz thus stands at the start of a broad current of thought that has a culmination and conclusion in our own day. This current of knowledge and speculation sometimes disavows its Leibnizian origins. It erases the traces of its progress. It frees itself from metaphysics in a quest to be technical and only technical, scientific and only scientific. For us, however, it is still philosophy and cannot deny its philosophical origins in Leibniz. Leibniz's metaphysics is supplementary to his formal theory. Transposition and extrapolation are still and always effected in the name of substantiality, that is to say, by metonymy and hyperbole. In the identity of same and other, identity and difference, pure identity receives the privilege of ontological status. God, being, is the identity of 0 and 1, of unity and multiplicity, recurrence and event, is the eternal and immutable truth. This being posits itself, presents itself, presupposes itself, requires itself, such as it is, despite its infinitude and the fact of reflecting thought. In the infinite of fixed monads, it does not emerge from itself. Deus cogitate mundum. The Spinozist schema of identity and difference, same and other, is reprised with new determinations. Closer to the real, or a certain real. We shall not undertake here to rewrite the critical history of philosophy. It is enough for us to indicate certain lineaments of this. We are sketching a program. We shall not continue it as far as Hegel, whose structural elements we know only too well, the rose of the world, the apotheosis of logos, the great rhetorical figure of the idea. Our sketch has led us to use the notions of structure, a usage that in no way rules out tracing its limits, but on the contrary prescribes this. By giving free rein to a concept, the limits are indicated beyond which its validity changes into error and its importance into ideology. The philosophy of structure has revealed to us the structure of philosophy, but the critique of philosophy justified by this analysis permits a radical critique of this philosophy of structure. As work of discourse, mimesis and analytic understanding, philosophy must have a hidden structure. The concept of philosophy, spelled out and delimited in this way, has enabled us to define that of structure. And conversely, the superseding of the one leads to the superseding of the other. In the philosophies already mentioned, increasingly systematic as they are, we discern three components: a poetic image, a formal theory, and metaphors. Metonymies or hyperboles that are specifically metaphysical. The image has almost always been neglected by historians who were concerned, and rightly so, since philosophers retrace the trajectory of philosophy with discourse as such. And yet the poetic image contains the human project, maieutic in the line of Socrates, the sick man and his healing in the line of Augustine. The image borrowed from the given changes into symbol of the virtual. At the same time, retrospective and prospective, it projects the future and projects itself onto it, with greater or lesser amplitude. In our view, there is a functional analogy, homology between the poetic images in philosophical systems, even if these images and symbols differ to the point of opposition. The formal part is methodological and gnosiological. It contains both a contribution to knowledge as such and a theory of knowledge as the most coherent discourse. The metaphysical element proceeds from a superfetation, metaphor, metonymy, parable, hyperbole, etc. It swells to the point of hypostatizing as absolute truth this or that discovery of knowledge or methods. The customary history of philosophy, considered in isolation, amplifies this already inflated aspect. It sees this as the essential. It adds to the superfetation a new superfetation. Indeed, the metaphysics contained in philosophies was the most decrepit part, the ideology superimposed on concepts and projects. The image of man was its most stimulating and active element, but also the most obscure and obscured. As for the formal element, it is naturally integrated without too much difficulty in the cumulative growth of knowledge in the technical perfecting of method. Metamorphosis of philosophy, poiesis, and metaphilosophy. Acquaintance with philosophy leads to circumscribing its concept. It tends to exhaust philosophy as such, and consequently to supersede it. It indicates, before and beyond this concept, that of philosophical discourse, something else.
Poiesis in its inexplicit connection with praxis.
Mimesis appears here with a growing precision in its essential and limited function, connection and mediation between praxis and poiesis, between repetition and creation, between abstract identity and concrete differences, between discourse and speech. If mediation seeks to be totality, if it claims to dominate the terms that it links, this claim has only a certain time. The fundamental contradiction, which has moved to the fore and become fundamental for us, is between philosophy and the non-philosophical world. In itself, this is only one of the contradictions of praxis. In terms of what we're concerned with here, this contradiction is principal, essential. Praxis, according to Marx, will resolve it by actualizing philosophy in the non-philosophical world, and not by renouncing philosophy and letting the non-philosophical world follow its course. We add here that this contradiction will be resolved by liberating the higher part of human activity from its lower part. Philosophy figured both in the higher part and in the wretched part. It thereby made a powerful contribution to the definition of man. Superseding it defines him still better. To sum up, is not what remains of philosophy in the direction of its superseding, in fact, an anthropology? Every philosopher has discovered a feature, an aspect of man, and done so as a function of his own time, his experience, his environment, in existing praxis, and its 292 millions philosophy problems. Then he has one-sidedly expanded this feature, driving it to absurdity. We shall not speak here of philosophical anthropology, but rather philosophy considered as anthropology, or philosophies as attempted anthropology. Nonetheless, this term immediately demands precautions and reservations. First of all, anthropology takes man as the object of its study, and studies a definition, determination of man as object. It leads to a closure rather than opening up horizons. For the theory of praxis, man defines himself in this praxis, his determinations are multiple, none of them is exhaustive. Moreover, it is not so much a question of describing, analysing, exposing, or explaining, in short, of knowing the human, but rather of creating him, and not only of leading or educating him in the name of an already established knowledge and definition. Any definition or determination is limiting. Total man is not one thing or the other, homo faber, sapiens, ludens, ridens, and so forth. He is all this and still something other that is not yet said, because it is not yet created. Secondly, anthropology at the present time has taken a direction that is clearly structuralist and culturalist. It opposes culture and nature, defining social man by a culture. This anthropology of American origin has been transplanted into France by Claude Lévi-Strauss, even if he attenuates some of its paradoxes. Cultural anthropology emphasizes anti-nature, anti-physis, and the wager against nature in the cultural. The structure of society, of its varied communications and exchanges, is at least said to be independent of nature. This is true to a certain extent and up to a certain point, beyond which this truth changes into error and the concept into philosophy. We have given the concept of structure its place, a very broad one, the better to refute extrapolations. The relative independence of nature and culture holds perhaps for archaic societies that, without having historicity in the broad sense of the term, have all the same changed by the constitution of styles of life, wisdoms. This appears to us as the mode of evolution of societies that do not evolve in the sense of accumulation, and that keep the primitive community as their base. As far as these societies are concerned, between the thesis of the world of scarcity and those of culturalist anthropology, Metamorphosis of philosophy, poiesis, and metaph, Philosophy 293, we take a more dialectical and more flexible position. On the base of the tribal or peasant community, starting from a meagre social surplus product, privileged groups, which do not yet constitute classes, but can form themselves into castes, warriors, priests, lords, dignitaries, etc., produce remarkable works in domains that the process of accumulation is bound to ravage. The sumptuary expenses of these groups were justified to the community to which they still remained beholden. This age of scarcity was thus one of festivals, wisdoms, monuments, style not ruling out cruelty, as there have been styles of cruelty, for example, in pre-Columbian America. In these cultures and styles, a distance is established between man and nature. Man has a margin of freedom. He plays with his nature, not against it. He investigates it without losing initial and vital certainties, cosmogonies, mythologies, symbolisms, then a nascent philosophy that responds to his questions. At this time, the human was not yet detached from nature. Capitalism, with the unlimited extension of the market and the power of money, was bound to accomplish this rupture, and only it could do so. Marx was alone in proclaiming a reconciliation between man and nature, by way of the accumulation of capital and the growth of industry, by way of the abstraction of science and concept, technology and culture. Without going any deeper, without saying in what way his notion of nature differed or did not differ from the Greek physis, without falling into the abstract lyricism of uprooting and rootedness, he explained that the split between man and nature was produced only by way of an indissoluble dialectical unity. And this was one of the strongest reasons for his rejecting metaphysics. According to Marx, with the accomplishment of the industrial age, man's relationship with nature would turn out to be not instrumental but one of co-substantiality and co-belonging. In sum, philosophy as such springs up with the beginnings of the process of accumulation, knowledges, techniques, goods, and wealth, with its uncertainties. It reaches its apogee and its end when this process has taken shape and is approaching its term, despite hindrances. The industrialization process does not answer all questions. It suppresses many and raises new ones. Both necessary and insufficient, it renders interpretations useless and makes the transformation of the world and its own transformation indispensable. A new form of thought and action appears, a different relationship with nature. Philosophy has too often destroyed or shrunk the notion and images of physis, especially since Descartes caught on this point in a conflict between the concrete unity that he detected of body and soul, particularly in his passions of the soul, and the separation that his theory of substance demanded. With Kant, another example of this shrinkage, nature is reduced to the dust of phenomena informed by the categories and unified in a more concrete manner only in the work of art by a transcendental finality. Metaphysis followed the lines of Christianity, a split always further aggravated, a disdain for the sensuous and the flesh for the world. The sense and sentiment of physis, during the domination of metaphysis, was preserved above all in underground currents and heresies. Paracletism, the doctrine of the Rosicrucians, the recall of ancient Dionysianism, Rabelais. On this side, traditional philosophy and metaphysical systems fit well enough into a structuralist and culturalist anthropology. But we know that this aspect of systems does not exhaust them. The contribution of philosophy in general and of particular philosophies to an anthropology does not authorize us to define man outside of nature, for example, by culture and culture alone. A determination of this kind accentuates the abstraction and extrapolation one-sidedness of speculative philosophies. Anthropology, the study of man as such, refers us to an elucidation of the human relationship, in praxis, in history, with nature and being. It is not therefore a question of defining man and the human, but rather of dismissing those representations that claim to define him, leaving him free to define himself in praxis. This opens the path of freedom, which is closed in any other perspective. One problem remains. If man is the highest being in the universe, or one of the highest beings, how and why is this? Chance? Essence? Success? Does man contain the secret of the world as opening and summit? How and why? Was it not on the contrary, as Louis Bork's theory suggests, a weakness? That gave the human being its chance by a surprising dialectical reversal. Further research is needed. We are not afraid to recall that it was Marx himself who on this point explored the praxis he discovered in its amplitude and complexity. Marx's thought and method prescribe for us an investigation into the relationships between the human and the natural within praxis, in the most poetic, creative part of praxis, as well as in the everyday and repetitive part. Before and beyond logos, before and beyond what historically has passed into philosophical discourse or has been brought into language by philosophers, in other words, the uncertain and deep regions of need and desire, of speech and images, the philosophical project and image of man are not without contradictions, as we have noted in passing, which the supersession of philosophy overcomes after detecting them. For example, certain philosophers have defined the human in terms of need, lack, will. They have set this determination against reason and coherent discourse. Other philosophers, on the contrary, have appealed to pure reason and rejected desire along with the imaginary. Some have defined man by finitude, whether to deplore this as the mark of a tragic fate or to assert that empirical satisfaction in limited existence can easily be determined. Others again start from unlimited desire, dissatisfaction, unease, even anxiety. To supersede philosophy also means overcoming the contradictions between philosophies. By revealing the virtual unity across contradictory particulars, it means integrating the seemingly irrational into a reason set free from its abstract one-sidedness and from confusions with the understanding, a reason returned to poetic meditation and speech. It means showing action, work, knowledge in the service of need and desire so as to change them into concrete powers. Finally, it means revealing in an adialectical move meant of satisfaction-dissatisfaction, while superseding both one and the other. This cannot be carried out without taking up the concept of alienation, without determining and consequently limiting it. Philosophers have used this concept more or less clearly when they sought to account, and further developed by a range of thinkers from Stephen Jay Gould to Jacques Lacan, for splits and gaps between the real and the true, between philosophical man and man living in praxis, between the infinite and finitude, between desire and satisfaction, etc. Philosophers by definition decided against non-philosophical man and the world, viewing these as alienated. By showing that there is also a philosophical alienation, Marx united under the same concept philosophical man and non-philosophical man, he opened the way to the superseding of philosophy. This does not mean that we have the right to abuse the concept of alienation. This abuse, by hyperbole or metaphor, perpetuates philosophy within its supersession. The concept of alienation, like that of totality, is less powerful than that of dialectical contradiction. It gives us one aspect of total history and one aspect only. One of the most serious objections to anthropology is that, by seeking to be scientific and positive, it tends to dismiss alienation, whereas this negative, critical, non-operational concept seems to us, on the contrary, essential for anthropology. It tends also to set itself up as truth against history, as philosophy. Finally, it tends to accentuate what there is that is finished and dead in the praxis studied the structure. The superseding of philosophy takes on a programmatic character, but at the same time a concrete one. It continues philosophy while radically transforming the philosophical attitude. It includes not only the analysis of praxis, the presentation of praxis in the totality real and possible, closures and openings, levels and differences of level, but at the same time the analysis of practical energy, the quest for social forces capable of intervening. This program envisages the insertion of what it holds on to from philosophy into revolutionary praxis. It has no meaning except in these conditions. Neither philosophy outside of praxis, nor philosophy of praxis. It overcomes this difference as it also does the opposition between being and what should be, sign and solemn, between fact and value. To sum up, we can say that the program contains the following articles. A critical inventory of moments, from Plato to Hegel, discerning the propositional element, poetic speech, images, projects, utopias, formalization, logos, parables, metaphors, metonymies in other, words, rhetoric, and the connotations that make possible metaphysics. It is impossible to deduce anything at all from philosophical concepts, including alienation and totality as far as praxis is concerned. And yet these concepts can be used in the analysis and exposition of praxis. They figure accordingly in this inventory as elements to retain. An explanation of the various philosophies considered as a succession of trials, projects, and propositions concerning man and seeking to define him, thus of philosophy in general as anthropology. C. A superseding of the abstract, incomplete, contradictory sharak. Of the philosophical project of man, not only of philosophy as such, but of the man of philosophy, and consequently a superseding from the anthropological point of view. D. An exposition of philosophical alienation vis-à-vis that of real and non-philosophical man. E. Confrontation of the philosophical project with the real, with praxis by cross-criticism, of philosophy by praxis and of praxis by philosophical concepts. F. A realization, or at least an opening towards realization in praxis, of the philosophical project revised and corrected. It is no longer a question of conceiving being, but of creating it, and first of meditating on the creative power released from the simulacra that this has constructed. Abandoned along the way, preserved as supports. The theme of superseding obliges us to reconsider the entire history of philosophy, and thus to rewrite it in a new way. This superseding does not replace the contradiction philosophy-non-philosophy with a complete coherence, a definitive reconciliation of the rational philosophical and the real non-philosophical. It introduces meditation and action into a dialectical movement within praxis, a movement impossible to escape, between the realization of the rational and meditation on the real and the possible. On creation, that is, on poiesis. Only the contestation of everydayness makes it possible to connect with radical critique on a new plane. A movement both double and single, impossible to understand the everyday without rejecting it, impossible to know it without seeking to transform it. Everydayness and its rejection put in question, fragment by fragment, the whole of the modern world, culture, state, technology, institutions, structures, established groups, analytical and operational thinking, the separations that these maintain, and so forth. This privileged contestation puts an end to the fragmentation of the ensemble. It reconstitutes it as a whole. It incriminates, though not in the same way, both capitalism as it exists and socialism as it exists, the broken totality of the existing. It brings to light correlations, analogies, as well as differences. Moreover, this contestation that supersedes partial contestations is inevitable. Everydayness cannot be tolerated. It is insufferable, unacceptable. People conceal it, deny it, misconstrue it. No one accepts it. The critique of everyday life, and this alone, could thus combine the multiple contestations into a bundle. The new wealth can only be defined on the basis of the new poverty, that of an everyday privatized of what makes for its wealth. We can thus detect a generalized latent malaise, and also points of crystallization for discontent and rejection, art, or what is already replacing it, questions of housing and urbanism, those of education and training, etc. We can discover direct contestations in the action of social and political forces, and also indirect ones in the clumsy attempt to rediscover playful activity, for example. Partial groups, young people, women, intellectuals, take turns in aspects of contestation, and so, of course, does the working class. The totality of contestations and the contestation of totality, that is negativity, are only reconstituted on the basis of the everyday. This general global contestation linking up with the radical negation conceived by Marx would be meaningless if there was a convergence of established systems and forms of the existing. This convergence would block the situation it would put an end to becoming, not by the definitive promulgation of a single system, philosophical state, ideological, moral, etc., but by the totalization. 2. Production relations are not changed until the various groups of workers start to have a real day-to-day control over the management of the enterprises, the working out and carrying through of the plans. Notes: Ernest Mandel, Marxist Economic Theory, Vol. 2, London, Merlin, 1962, p. 644, of existing systems. But we have tried hard to establish non-convergence. This is what the law of uneven development means, a very general law applied here to systems of significations and operations. First point, these are multiple. They cannot be reduced to just one. Second point, we have carefully noted the phenomena of destruction, destructuration, and self-destruction. 3. Third point, forms and systems close on themselves and consolidate, dissolve, or explode with a certain independence from one another, thus precisely from the fact that each of them acquires autonomy and seeks to set itself up as absolute in the real and above this real. On top of this, if there is convergence, it is rather against the systems, in the forces of dislocation and contestation, in the negativity that asserts itself against their positivity, and that contains the genuine positivity. Every system leaves a residue that escapes it, resists it, and from where an effective practical resistance can take off. In particular, the semantic reduction, which seeks to found a system, structuralism, turns against itself. It brings to light a residual element of primary importance, which is nothing other than time. Can human thought and action only grasp and realize discontinuous pieces? Discrete units or entities that they dismantle and reassemble operationally? Maybe. But time? This is said to be the common and general basis on which forms detach themselves. It does not intervene in the formation of these forms. It has neither importance nor interest. It is ungraspable, impossible to manipulate. But then, precisely, time punctuates the succession of forms, their connections. These are born in it. The residue manifested by this detour becomes the essential, better perceived and valorized after its reduction. The phenomena of destruction are not restricted to art and culture. Not only does automobile traffic threaten to destroy towns without replacing them by new creation, but cars are themselves an investment with rapid depreciation. Is it by chance that this production has become a key industry for capitalism and the automobile pilot object a system of significations? In a collection of texts published recently in France, Herbert Marcuse seems to overdo the closure of the real. He seems sometimes to think that men are entirely fashioned by molds by mimesis. A certain number of sociologists in both America and France share this pessimistic vision. Would eros be the only fissure? Do these residues come from transcendences thus manifested? Do they arise from a method of interpretation, a hermeneutic that would still be philosophy? No. The essence of each attempt at reduction, or rather the fact that it has an essence, as it tends to constitute a specific system, a world, a globalization, the state, technology, etc., shows that what we have here is no transcendence. The diversity of residues and their residual character only have a meaning in and through the systems that seek to reabsorb them. The symbols themselves, as residues irreducible to pure signification, arise from physis, nature, this residue displayed by culture and culturalism, and not from a hermeneutic. Expression and symbolism form part of the semantic field, itself conceived as a part of praxis. For Marx, was not the proletariat a residual element of capitalist society, both beyond and outside it? Impossible for this society to dispense with it, despite its efforts. Derivative, thus by essence negative, and negative of its own negation. Was this not how it attained for Marx the dignity of universal class? If it is not so for the moment, will it become so again? Perhaps, with new elements in a new situation. It remains what is irreducible in this society. For the moment, we wager on the ensemble of these residues, the unease and discontent irreducible through and beneath the fragmentary satisfactions, everyday life, youth, deviance, underdevelopment, and so on. There is accordingly a creative activity even in mathematics. Mathematics is a work. What residue does it display? Drama, which escapes number, but whose value is shown by the light that number casts on it, with the result that not only does number have to be taken into account, but also the will that it contains and dissimulates. The will to systematization and the specific nature of its failure. Metamorphosis of philosophy, Poisis and M. 8 Our Philosophy 301st. Positivist sociologists would say, you're betting on the enemy. Quite right. The theory of residues takes up in modern terms a theme of romanticism. And so we support the thesis of a new romanticism with revolutionary tendency, or rather, one fundamentally revolutionary, reprising also certain essential themes of Marxism, negativity, contestation, radical critique. An important remark, this romanticism is not based on departure and escape. It does not offer itself as a method of flight. It does not posit the essential outside of the real, without for that matter ruling out the imaginary and the utopian. Even if we grant existential thought the point that Kierkegaard legitimately protested against the system Hegelian, we no longer have anything in common with Kierkegaardian existentialism. It remained philosophically directed against the philosophy of Hegel. It protested without contesting. It returned to religiosity and the worst metaphysics, the theory of repetition, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, rendering what they had lost to those who had lost everything in becoming and by death and so on. We end up proposing a method of residues, parodying the scientific method well known and little employed by scientists, the theory of which was provided by the empiricist philosopher J.S. Mill. Our method of residues contains a number of articles, detecting the residues, wagering on them, showing the precious essence in them, combining them, organizing their rebellions and totalizing these. Each residue isn't irreducible to be grasped. Poiesis, today and now, starts from the residual. Its first act is to gather together the residues deposited by the systems that stubbornly persist without managing to constitute themselves as totalities, to globalize themselves. Religion, despite its efforts, has left and still does leave an irreducible fleshly life, spontaneous vitality. Philosophy casts light on the ludic element that it does not manage to absorb, as well as the everyday, non-philosophical man that it makes manifest by expelling it. Mathematics casts light on drama. Structure and structuralism indicate several realities, time, history, the particular and specific particularities. Technology and machinery point a finger, as it were, towards what resists them, sex, desire, and more generally the deviant and unusual. Mimesis displays poiesis. The state bitterly opposes freedom and indicates it. State centralization, and even the necessary decentralization conducted by the centralized state. A curious parody demonstrates the residual and irreducible reality of the regions. Art that has become cultural leaves a residue. Creativity, bureaucracy in vain, hunts out the individual, the singular, the deviant. Organization cannot exterminate spontaneous life and desire. As for everydayness, despite itself, it opens onto the totality reprised and renewed by poiesis. This latter gathers together the irreducibles. Its strategy is based on multiplicity and heterogeneity, on the non-convergence of worlds, on their gaps, dysfunctions, disharmonies. In a word, on their conflicts. Promoting a residue, showing its essence and its essential character against the power that crushes it and demonstrates it by trying to crush it, is a rebellion. Gathering the residues is a revolutionary thought, an action thought. This method of residues is not utopian, neither abstractly nor concretely. The residues in question are there, here nunc. No more is it prospective. What it shows is not a deceptive image of the future, despite being turned towards the future and appealing to the possible, thus to imagination. It starts from the actual, without omitting the unforeseen and unforeseeable, those residues of rational foresight that always intervene, so that the new, different from what was thought and wished for, arises from a history. It is thus act and method in act. Wagering on the residues adds nothing to them. It is nothing by itself. It is not operational, and yet it is decisive. It contains the idea that nothing is eternal, that nothing is completely durable. Not only are residues the most precious, they gnaw away and destroy from within, they explode systems that seek to absorb them. In this sense, the poiesis that takes hold of them must reveal itself as creator of objects, acts, and more generally, situations. Metaphilosophical meditation conducted in this way would be a metamorphosis philosophy, poiesis and metaphilosophy 303, method and already a style rather than a definite form. First of all, it sees itself as unclassy, not fiable. In the accepted categories, philosophers repudiate it, not without excellent reasons. Anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists consider it bad philosophy. It does not name itself. It would rather take the unnameable as its point of departure, in other words, the ensemble of residues, the disorder born of this factitious order, or more precisely, of the multiplicity of factitious orders that seek to impose themselves. It arises from the pseudo-nothingness of residues that tenaciously persist between forms and systems, like seeds between building stones. Its point of departure is non-value, that which does not have or no longer has value, everyday life, uncertain speech, the disturbed situation, ambiguity. And this is not in order to create new values, caricatures of creations. It starts from the insignificant and its meaning. In the course of this theoretical and practical gathering, the residual elements have to meet up and mutually recognize one another. They must therefore transform themselves by converging, by struggling effectively against the systems that reject them and determine them by rejecting them. It is not a question of coalescing or adding the residues to one another. Transforming the world now means metamorphosing them. Each has to take back the dignity and strength of an essence, manifested by the very fact of the attempt to destroy it, an essence that is conquered and surrenders with generosity. Will this not lead to defining a higher degree of human freedom? Metaphilosophical meditation, action thought, thus renews philosophical reflection on freedom. The struggle for freedom and freedom in history acquire a different meaning in the sense of palpability, direction, signification, and likewise totality. The duality of moments of history that the human being abandons, moments of this being that constituted as a totality, likewise acquires its full meaning. Wagering on the residues by an inaugural poetic act, subsequently reassembling them in a praxis, directing them against the accepted systems and forms, drawing new forms from them, that is the great challenge. That is the gauntlet cast in the face of powers and the established existing order. It is not yet the whole of metaphilosophy. We have so far given only a first approximation. We could also say that metaphilosophy sets speech against discourse, not meaning speech prior to discourse, archaic and folkloric, speech beyond discourse, and the logico-philosophical understanding. Or again, it is the rebellion of poiesis against mimesis and their bitter struggle, or better, the conflict between style and culture. The term rebellion simply refers to the initiative and the starting point. The aim, mastery of speech over discourse, etc. In other words, appropriation. Technology extends the sector dominated and consolidated by man like a farmland extending over marshes. Beyond the polders and swamps, there is the open sea. To get to the ocean, a boat is needed. Poiesis takes to the open sea. It is also conquest, mastery of what is not yet attained, but not in the same way as technology. It attains the appropriation by man of his own nature. It is in this sense that it defines itself by the practical relationship between man and nature, between man and his being. We should not confuse poiesis metaphilosophy with spontaneity, though their movement is towards a retrieved spontaneity. Is there not a deceptive spontaneity, unconscious, that follows models and lets itself be conditioned? We know that spontaneity is also the act of the automaton, which moves of itself. The automaton casts light on spontaneity. It is made possible by it, and motivates its critique. It renders suspect a certain spontaneity, for example, that of a femininity of which one may well ask whether it is not pilot robot of cybernetic society, modelled, mimetic, conditioned by images and objects, etc. Rediscovered spontaneity has passed through the test of tearing and split. It has revealed itself irreducible, residual to models, behaviours, attitudes. It encompasses lucidity and action. It has perhaps a foundation or an ontological meaning. It does not react spontaneously towards this or that object, this or that stimulus, this or that image, but towards the ensemble, so as to modify and recapture it. This spontaneity, higher and deeper than the elementary, is reason and resultant of poiesis, residue among residues, fundamental rebellion. Not savage mind, but savage desire. Metamorphosis of philosophy, poiesis and metaph, Philosophy 305. Metaphilosophical poiesis could also explore the unknown aspect of love, sex, pleasure. Not by the paths of sadism and masochism, though by other paths than those of the normal, of accepted customs, including conscious perversities. For love is moments, and thus modality of presence to self, to others, to the world, but it is perpetual creation of presence, of joy and pleasure, or of pain, or the two combined. At the same time, rift and totality, always attempted and always broken. The aim today is either to deny love in the name of moral order, or, still worse, make love the foundation of the moral order. But it is precisely what is irreducible to the moral order, the residue. Metaphilosophical poiesis would thus be poetry and truth. This truth would no longer have anything in common with that of philosophy, exclusive, prefabricated, constrictive, systematic, nor yet with the moral or political order. On the contrary, it starts from the disorder inherent in the always failed order of forms. It bases itself on partial truths in order to create a truth. This metaphilosophical poiesis, therefore, does not consist in a certain way of speaking of things, of people, though it may also renew the way of speaking of them, of faces, homes, landscapes, and so forth, though it may bring meaning to the insignificant, the everyday, by transforming it. It seeks to be more than poetic expression and description, to be creation. If we want to locate it better in diachrony history, let us return to the characteristics of modernity, its conflicts and problems, in a word, to the transition and the actual situation of human being. We shall thus avoid the almost inevitable reproach of prophetism from particular cultures' humanism and classicism. With their abstract universality, culture of peasant origin, bourgeois culture, proletarian culture, national cultures, we pass to world culture, which initially consists in the worldwide consumption and destruction of all past and dead cultures. And through this we proceed to the reconquest of style. From ancient art and art for art's sake, we proceed to a radical mutation already underway. The death of an art external to everyday life, the fusion of art and everyday life in a metamorphosis of the latter. But we also move, along the way, from life grasped and organised by institutions and ideas, the sacred culture, to a forsaken life, from rootedness in the native soil, the city, the milieu, to an uprooting, from man limited but concrete to the man of complete abstraction. This seems to be a necessary stage, extreme abstraction, quasi-total alienation, to the point that no one grasps it as alienation, and the theory of alienation seems outdated, lacking object or effectiveness. With the proletariat not having accomplished its task, the political and cultural revolution is paradoxically pursued within the inverted world Marx, that of the bourgeoisie, by the devalorizing of the bourgeoisie and the bourgeois way of life, by the dissolution of existing forms, by the decomposition of the individual, of consciousness, of language. Without the creation of a new style, incapable of opposing a style to the bourgeois absence of style, the socialist camp compensates for this impotence by an exasperated philosophism. Systematized philosophy, which thus falls back towards Hegelianism or below this, becomes criterion, field, terrain and stake, end of theoretical discussions. Obsolete philosophy and Manichaean moralism have supplanted for how long? Marx's realization of philosophy. Philosophy aggressively survives. It is aggravated in teaching and pedagogy, in scholastic and institutional continuations, in technicalized or non-technicalized culture, in philosophism. By becoming cultural complement and compensation of technicality, philosophy becomes picturesque, an agreeable leisure occupation like visits to museums and ancient cities, folklore. A strange mixture that is found even in the solitary grandeur of a Heidegger. Philosophy drags along with it an immense folklore, bequeathed to the industrial and technical age from earlier times. The tradition of the rural world, ideas on nature of agrarian origin, the oldest of symbolisms, are all reborn in it. Compensation and consolation is sought in the face of the aridity of the signs and significations that proliferate, but do not people the robotic desert of modernity. We know that the abundance of signifiers arouses a specific pathology. Philosophy conveys pre-capitalist representations and values, agrarian or handicraft, as well as their abstract negation. In Heidegger, and also Bachelard, we find ideas and dreams about the home, the elements, the sacred. For these great meditators, and this is perhaps a trace of philosophism, the concern for comprehension wins out over. Metamorphosis of philosophy, poiesis, and meta, Philosophy 307th. The exploration of praxis, comprehension reveals itself in profound but archaic symbolisms. This remark enables us to take a distance from both Heidegger and Bachelard, not without making clear their prestige as thinkers of transition within the transition. We may also meditate on the invasion of anthropology and ethnography into philosophical thought, a strange mixture. The meaning of nature set against technology and the cybernetization of society, but in confusion, the search for roots, a distant prefiguring perhaps of the alliance with nature proposed by Marx. Unless it is simply a parody mimed in more or less picturesque fashion. Here we again find our hypothesis, developed and supported. Philosophy pursues its globalization, along with the state, with technology, with art. Globalizations of real systems are pursued, not without conflicts between world powers. The alienated powers pursue their career. They will continue to the end of automatization. We do not say the end of reification. An automatism is not a thing in the sense included in the term reification. The robot simulates logical thought, logos, to the point of attaining and embodying this. Mimesis constitutes a thing that is also non-thing, mixed, transition and intermediary between thing and non-thing. Hence our constant reservations about the current use of the term reification. At the same time, we see in parallel the degradation of philosophy, the bureaucratic rotting of the state, the deterioration and devouring consumption of art, the robotization of technology. At the same time again, the radical critique of philosophy pursues its path, and likewise revolutionary struggle, the mutation of art into everyday life, and the effort to redeem creative, poetic speech from cybernetized and mimetic discourse. Metaphilosophical thought encompasses this fragmentary, broken totality en route towards something else, towards a planetary totality that is totally new. Along with the globalization of autonomized and automatized powers, at the same time, the true powers of the human being, his moments, strengthen and reassert themselves. Play, rest, love, poetry, and so on. Already, if we can divide it, the party of supersession of philosophy and metamorphosis of the everyday constitutes a party, despite or against philosophical and philosophical political parties. Man is total. Being and conscious thought, or if you prefer, nature and praxis, recognize one another and encounter each other in their reciprocal shared belonging and appropriation. Not without conflicts. This totality can be attained neither by philosophy, nor by some science of human reality, nor again by the ensemble of these sciences. These sciences can be neither separated nor united. As soon as they are separated, they confront each other in a formless babel. And as soon as the attempt is made to unite them into a synthetic picture, they divorce, and each goes its own way. Only a new thought, aimed at a totality that is determined neither as economic, nor as sociological, nor as historical in the usual sense of the term, and yet takes into account all these levels and elements of the real, can dominate the sciences. Only it can define starting from the real, from facts and results, but above all from absence and absences, lack and lacks, gaps in the real, empty places, or the empty place in short. From negativity and radical critique, the future, virtual, possible totality. It is not inconceivable that, during this transition, metaphilosophical meditation may support for tactical reasons a new type of thinker. The naturalist nine capable of standing at the nub of fragmentary knowledges, programming research in this direction, and contributing concrete solutions to this or that partial problem. The debate thus engaged can only deepen. We must not retreat in. Some science fiction novels go so far beyond today's reigning ideologies, raising the most the face of its depth, but on the contrary expand this. It compels us to redefine socialism and communism as perspectives possibilities of the historical movement. New elements have intervened since Marx and Lenin, which demand a redefinition. What are these elements? Technology on the one hand, with the technocratic danger it involves. The state on the other hand, and the necessity of reconsidering its enormity and its withering away, in the absence of which Marxism-Leninism collapses, leaving only a technique of rational planning and accumulation. Marxist thought on socialism is confronted with the historical experience of a century, illuminated in this way. It can be summed up in a few formulations. A process of accumulation constituted in Western Europe imposes a new situation on the world. Accumulation encompasses the two essential forms of wealth, the means of production and the goods produced. Includes on the one hand the accumulation of technologies and knowledges, on the other hand the accumulation of material objects that ensure the application of knowledges in praxis. The process of accumulation thus has form and content. It contributes certainties that abolish philosophy as vague and uncertain, thus abstract research for truth in general. But it raises new questions. First of all, it has to be assured as growth, by eliminating external obstacles and internal barriers. Secondly, it has to guarantee that the cumulative process will be in the service of the human being, social and individual. Growth and development must go together. The first aspect is necessary but not sufficient. The second aspect is indispensable but hard to realize. The appropriation of nature has two aspects, mastery of the external material world, and appropriation by man of his own nature, biological, physiological, social, psychological. This second aspect, appropriation, presupposes the first, but on this material basis a dialectical movement is not devoid of conflict. It would be impossible to warn too much against the automatization of the accumulation process. Since the death of Marx, in fact, the great novelty as a consequence of the world historical situation, failures of the revolution, division of the world into two camps. Technological race, with its economic and social base in arms rivalry, and the arms race, the great innovation introduced by history, is this autonomization of the process. On the other hand, experience shows that state capitalism and state socialism, despite their internal differences and specific tendencies, sometimes come dangerously close. The definition of socialism in terms of the absence of private property in the means of production, in terms of collective property, is insufficient. We need to spell out the modalities of the possession and social management of the means of production, self-management, autogestion in particular. Lenin was completely in the line of Marxist thought and project when he defined socialism in 1917 after the October Revolution. This definition was simple, no doubt a bit too simple, because it left aside fundamental theory and practical difficulties. Yet it was inserted immediately into praxis, and contained the essential Soviets plus electrification, in other words, economic technological growth, plus democratic organisms capable of controlling it and verifying its orientation. Today, must we not redefine socialism as a function of these two aspects and their new demands? Technology, democracy, definitions in terms of the state, workers' state, people's state, in terms of economic growth alone, in terms of the power of the party, have had their day. Would not socialism in our days be a dense network of organisms at the base in production units and territorial units, plus an ultra-modern equipment in electronic machines? The base organisms would ensure the direct expression of social needs and more generally control over the summit, without which there is no democracy. The democratic character of planning would be guaranteed by this control, and economic growth subordinated to social needs expressed, rather than detected by specialists or formulated by experts. The end of private property and the means of production would thus involve their social management. This management, bound up with the above double network in production and territorial units, would simultaneously ensure, according to the fundamental Marxist project, the disappearance of the bourgeoisie as ruling class and the withering away of the state. Without a complex network, what would be the result of electronics, cybernetics, and information theory applied to economic management? They would attribute exorbitant power to technocrats, manipulators of men and information. They would maintain the state with its prerogatives, aggravated by this power, even if politicians keep a certain part, and possibly come into conflict with technocrats. Today machines make possible the administration of things without resource to the active participation of men. Without machines and the electronic gathering of information, democracy at the base risks collapse into the inorganic, the promotion of incompetence. The two elements therefore form a whole. One is impossible without the other. Control of accumulation is certain, and the coherent, rational shaping of praxis assured. A fundamental problem is resolved, taking technology away from technocrats. This schema omits, for convenience of presentation, the inevitable contradictions between its elements. It makes sense only for the highly industrialized countries, which corresponds to a demand of the situation. The tendency to think socialism as a function of countries that are little or poorly developed, and their particular social and political needs, notably as far as the state is concerned, has become preponderant. The Hegelian and Lassallean theory of state socialism, rather than the Marxist, has covered up the Marxist theory of the withering away of the state. We propose therefore a theoretical model that makes it possible to appreciate the distance that separates this or that country in the general uneven development from the possibilities and reality of modern socialism. In the same orientation, we may mention the possibility of a political party, a site where the contradictions of praxis would be openly expressed, where options would confront one another, which would no longer be a place where contradictions are expressed and weighed only behind closed doors. This notion of the political party goes further than the customary democratic demands, free expression of tendencies, currents of opinion, etc. Is it not the Marxist and Leninist conception of the party? Who could refuse it? Many people. Those who place tactics and organization above theoretical thought. Those who pin labels on ideas and people, revisionist, dogmatic. Those who have not had this conception, despite its necessity, because they think differently, according to empirical schemas, or simply obsolete schemas in their fixed dogmatism. What we propose with this schema is simply a project, a model. Its possibility is a certainty, but not its realization. We cannot rule out the hypothesis of a colossal miscarriage of human history on the planetary scale. We must even at certain moments bring examination of this hypothesis to the fore, to assess its chances and risks. As the most dangerous and extreme hypothesis, we have to take account of it so as better to combat it. Neither planetary miscarriage nor nuclear annihilation can be ruled out as impossible. The miscarriage, for example, the definitive consolidation of the state, would arrive at the historical moment of success, with all the means of succeeding. The most probable, however, is a mixed period in which partial miscarriages and partial successes, failures and favourable tendencies will be mingled. If we now place ourselves at the level of individuals and their immediate interpersonal relationships, what have we gained? A conviction. We have to dissipate the myths of everyday life by a radical critique. They cede nothing, in terms of influence and toxicity, to the great ideological and political myths. Myths of apprenticeship and entry into life, of maturity and adult age, of the father.
Since the establishment of the everyday, these images are no longer anything but survivals.
Today they mask the reality of which they form part. They accentuate alienation and alienated reality by dissimulating it. Alienation? This theory needs a sharper focus. Why? Because philosophy of traditional inspiration, what goes by the name of philosophy, has been unable to assimilate it. The concept retains its meaning only by freeing itself from systems. On the other hand, literature has seized hold of it. Alienation, become a literary commonplace, has lost its critical import and trenchancy. At the same time, alienation has been transformed. In certain respects, it has worsened to the point of making protests, spontaneous consciousness and resistance disappear. There are new forms of alienation. More precisely, the new alienation is an alienation of form and through form, by models, by simulacra and simulation, by mimesis and the imitation of patterns and so forth. If self-consciousness becomes alienating, this leads to a loss of consciousness of alienation, since what should disalienate itself by reflecting instead sinks further into alienation. Some people go so far as to think that the alienation through which man emerges from nature becomes second nature for him, with duplication and reduplication, discourse on discourse, novels about novelists and novels about novels, world of image and mimesis of copy and reproduction without limit, etc. We have now long since entered into a second-degree alienation. Alienation on alienation whose limit is abolished. 10 generalized mimesis is superimposed on commodity and money without abolishing them. Alienation does not simply condition individuals, it does not weigh solely on classes, it involves the most diverse groups and society as a whole. If ideological alienation has very partially dissipated, technological alienation has readily replaced it. We can extend to the theory of alienation the concept and law of uneven development. Yet alienation tends towards a kind of totality, never attained. Since this would presuppose the convergence of all causes and reasons of alienated states, but total alienation is approaching through the disappearance of the consciousness of alienation. Alienation has thus never been so real, nor the theory of alienation so important. And yet this theory has never been so ineffective, with the result that we have, as it were, to change the position and disposition of our batteries. We gain consciousness of the limits of the theory. This does not mean we have either to relegate it to the philosophical antiquities or make it the centre of a philosophy, or eliminate it in the name of an operational view of thought, or a so-called scientific philosophy. The theory of alienation, quasi-total yet never achieved as totality, remains the other side of the theory of total man, disalienated and realizing himself on the path of disalienation. But in this latter theory, the accent has shifted. It bears on residues, for example, and no longer on the general concept of alienation. The concept does not have an ontological meaning which comes back to philosophy. It would rather be an anthropological concept, subordinate to that of historical becoming by illuminating the contradictions of history, showing the detours of human realization, the succession of alienations, disalienations, new alienations, which forbids us, as Marx thought, from substantifying, fetishizing, ontologizing the historical outside of the human. As philosophical concept, alienation turns against philosophy and questions it, since there is, among others, a philosophical alienation. The theory of alienation signifies that philosophy sought to say what man is and what he can become. It also signifies what philosophy did not manage to say, still less do. What did it say? What man is and also what he is not. What prevents Homo philosophicus from acceding to being, that is, to realization. Philosophy sought to be praxis inasmuch as it indicated the path of alienation, and consequently of disalienation. It did not manage to act and insert itself into praxis, inasmuch as the philosopher was himself alienated. Hence the split that situated it outside of praxis and poiesis in order to reduce it to a particular mimesis. At the extreme, the theory of alienation indicates in what way and how mimesis realizes illusorily human being, and loses it by alienating it. This theory cannot dominate mimesis and designate poiesis, except from outside and afar. It is not the highest theory. As regards totality, that is, total man, we detect the double aspect of the situation where we are in the radical mutation that we are living. On the one hand, total man is close. We are that, all that already, here and now, play, love, knowledge, labour, and so forth. Become what you are. This motto, one of the most poetic that any man has uttered, prescribes the possible and detects it in the real. The goal seems close, and yet it is distant. What do we have of these powers and modalities of presence to self, to the other, to the world? What does the man of today possess? Traces that are also germs, and that we have been able with this hope to call residues. It is a narrow and difficult path simply to supersede the fetishisms of commodity and money, discourse and communication that accompany disturbing deteriorations and destructions, or to dominate the reigning mimesis and subordinate the process of accumulation to man by appropriating it. The passage from the possible to the real, from the germ to the act, from the residual to the essential, cannot be accomplished by thought, still less by reflexive, philosophical thought. It implies a praxis. Man will be the supreme being for man. This has either not been said by philosophers, or said badly, attached as they are to the transcendent, true, beautiful, and good. But human being will only be the supreme being for human being, inasmuch as being nature, life with their multiple modes, attributes, and powers, is for him the supreme goal and meaning. And consequently, inasmuch as man is the supreme, being for being, something of which philosophers have sometimes had a naive and hesitant presentiment, but that only Marxism, superseding philosophy, has brought into praxis. Perhaps exploration of this being will supply some of the secrets of this world or universe, whose appropriation constitutes poetic truth in praxis. Perhaps we shall be able in this way to answer on a new level various demands from philosophers that they have been unable to answer. There will be a kind of turning point, not, as Hegel would have said, in the concept alone, but in activity. Are we then going to continue to philosophize despite claiming to supersede philosophy? Not quite. We are going to grasp our praxis, renewed by a poetic decision, and say what it reveals. Is this universe our own, not essentially, if we may say so, approximate and relative? These terms do not mean the same as ambiguous or uncertain or ungraspable. They go hand in hand with becoming. How could universal becoming create constant entities with absolutely defined contours, destined therefore not to escape from themselves? No concept suffices to grasp this universe and the realities that it totalizes. The most pertinent oppositions of concepts do not catch everything in their grip. Something always spills over. Nothing can be drawn without a wobble in the contours that gives the drawing life. Ruler and compass do not create. No line, no force, no volume, no circle, and no real sphere are perfect and finished. Concepts and oppositions of concepts are always on the side of the determined, thus the finished, the terminated. Their negation contains their dialectical truth. Negation, however, is first of all the approximation and relativity of well-determined limits. The universe is infinite, negation of the finite. This negation starts with the inexactness of limits. Is this not why the residual, which determined concepts do not manage to reduce, has such importance? That which overflows concepts and conceptual grids seems at first, from a point of view beyond concepts, a mere residue. This residue is then manifest as what is most precious. The infinite in the finite, the inexhaustible creative power, considered not ontologically or mystically, but in a concrete and historical fashion, in other words. Poiesis. Dialectical thought then appears in two ways, in the double, determination inherent to any apprehension, thus any concept, and in the overflowing of every concept, the principle of supersession. This universe would be approximate from the standpoint of the rigorous form of discourse. This character itself could not be considered as a metaphysical definition. It would be neither irrational nor absurd, nor in itself full of meaning. It would be characterized neither by meaning, nor by the absence of meaning. Man would be neither its end, nor its aim, neither its absence of end, nor its absurdity. This universe would be neither world nor cosmos, neither oriented time nor hierarchically ordered space, but infinity in time and space, producing itself in finite time and space. It would be neither stability nor wandering, neither unformed nor structured, but something other, neither play nor out of play. A universe of this kind could not be called either good or bad. It is doomed neither to success nor to failure. Neither causally determined nor determined by an end, nor undetermined. Between being and nothingness, between matter and spirit, between the in itself and the for itself, between the determined and the undetermined. These traditional concepts of philosophy, they would be the site of a plasticity without assignable limits, a domain shared up to now by three terms: praxis, mimesis, poiesis. Man and the human occupy this site. They fill it and give it a meaning, their own, by praxis and theoretical thought. This universe pertains neither to the pure categorical nor to the indefinite problematic, neither philosophical dogmatism nor philosophy, reduced to a set of problems without solution. According to us, it pertains to concrete questions and questionings, at the same time particular, specified, and general. The terms that are useful to us in thinking it, mystery and transparency, meaning and non-meaning, etc., still bear an echo of their philosophical past. Man finds himself called upon to create his dwelling, not, as Heidegger says, the dwelling of being in language, but the dwelling of man as human being, constructed by praxis. On earth, in this attempt which philosophy has accomplished for its part with its own means, its essential means discourse, it has failed as philosophy like religion. It is no longer a source of invention. It has been unable to emerge from metaphysis. It falls back sooner or later into theology, every philosophy's spot of infection, with the further role of portraying in itself the negative decomposition of philosophy, i.e., the process of its decay, as Marx boldly and brutally wrote in the 1844 manuscript Su. It is only by emerging from the mode of philosophical reflection that the philosopher, having become a different man, will have his historic revenge. The approximate character of the world makes for its plasticity, opens it to action and motivates action, praxis. It is not approximate in the sense of classical philosophy and the theory of knowledge, even relativist. We do not have a universe of precise forms or beings attained by successive approximations. We speak of a double approximation. Nothing has precise contours. Nothing is susceptible to rigorous definition, including the spherical form of the Earth, for example, this prototype of stabilities and self-regulations. Nothing is completely determined or can be completely measured. Nothing is absolutely stable. Measuring instruments, the tools of knowledge, concepts, and those of action are in the same box. Man is in the same general situation, which re-establishes correspondence and agreement between the real and knowledge, rendering useless a theory of knowledge that strives to suppress approximation, to replace it by rigor, and which by this pretension opens up an abyss between concepts and the real. The theory of objectivity in knowing is replaced by a concept bound up with the very practice of knowing, the concept of deepened objectivity. Including the double relativity of the real and of knowledge, objectivity is always won, conquered, and reconquered in this double approximation. It is always challenged. The realizing and totalizing precisions that systems aim at are all the more disturbing if they succeed more or less well, to a certain degree almost, but really, in this approximate world. A world plastic because approximate. They are dangerous because they impose a form almost finished, almost definitive on the real, and hence constituted by making it such as it is. By making it being, fortunately, we know that this systematic form always leaves a residue that gnaws away at it and breaks it. Man creates in two ways, one more spontaneous, another more lucid and intellectual analytic. This is not just a question of biological creation having children, and social creation works. Social man has spontaneously created in a history that is steadily less blind, cities, peoples, nations. Subsequently and since, he has striven to consciously create groups, towns, rational plans for these groups and agglomerations. This is not a matter of a difference between the contents of creative acts that are supposedly spontaneous and forms that are reflective. We have tried to show that history and becoming also create forms. There is no pre-established harmony between these modes of creation. One of the problems of modern man is to link up with and, if possible, supersede on the basis of analytical intelligence, the spontaneous capacity of creation. This problem is manifestly apparent in questions of art and urbanism. We can no longer believe in a harmony or convergence between man's creative capacities, but rather in their conflictual dialectical movement. Philosophical idealism posited and presupposed a divergence, attributing absolute primacy either to purely spontaneous creation mysticism or to rationalist reflection. Philosophical materialism posited, and still does posit, the natural unity of these capacities without further investigating them. Metaphilosophical meditation is concerned with the conflictual relationship between the two modes of creation. It holds that mimesis imitates poiesis, but also caricatures and parodies it. Mimesis, when it produces, does not reproduce poetic creation. It adds something else to it, something specific to itself: facticity, abstraction, autonomization, fetishism, pleonasm. The function of the creative capacities, therefore, cannot be easily grasped. We perceive the unity rediscovered or one which would supersede the tearing split in a redemption of poiesis, restored in the project, after the trajectory it has pursued. Thought and reflection are a certain manner of not being. Conscious and thinking being, I, me, we, etc. It is in the duplication, self-consciousness, reflection of this manner of not being, of seeking to seek its being on the basis of a being that is both actual and open. Body, historical situation, practical activity. If consciousness in a sense is, in another sense it is not or is no longer, it seeks and seeks itself. What does it seek? It does not know in advance, and when it believes that it does know, it is mistaken. It has error and errantry, but on a path, that of praxis and that of knowledge. It is the negation of that which it was. Becoming conscious, something philosophers tend to overestimate on account of the philosophical attitude, is not taking hold of a reality, but dissolution, loss, distancing in relation to this real that is seemingly taken hold of. Consciousness is thus finitude. Consciousness of self as limitation. Consciousness of what finishes and what is already finished. Consciousness is thus always critical. That is to say, always at a critical point, in a state of crisis. Once assured, rooted, securitized, it is lost. It is no longer. It is substantialized and goes astray. It repeats itself and disappears into misery, but surprises that are too frequent or too rich crush it. Consciousness, the residue of everything that has been, residue of residues, would thus be in large part reminiscence, recognition, and this right through to the hope for resurgence and novelty. It hesitates between, on the one hand, repetition, redundancy, discourse, rememorization, reflection, and, on the other, surprising adventure, discovery, poiesis sought intensely if not found. Meditation puts an end to certain useless torments of reflection. It converges with being by rediscovering or creating it. Each human being stands between two beings, a situation that is never linear, always double in relation to itself, to others, to the world. Each consciousness, precisely as what it is not, is a project of being someone or something. It therefore is essentially transition passage from one state to another state. In each of these states, it disappears. It is the project of rediscovering lost being or creating another being. It is thus project of totality, project of the world. Being is thus double in the sense that it implies consciousness, and consciousness is double in the sense that it implies being. That said, philosophers have sought to define this being, either before or during or after consciousness, itself represented sometimes as act, sometimes as state. Metaphilosophical meditation refuses to define it. It recognizes the double determination of the real, the particular, the limit, the determined, the finite, the infinite, the undetermined, the possible, the universal. It refuses, therefore, to speak being, to posit the general, since, and because being is to be created. Each being invents or reproduces, according to its finite power, an infinite being. It moves between the lost being and the being attained, without either one or the other having to be determined in a general way, for they are always concrete. They are situations. There is not, therefore, a philosophical problematic of being or consciousness. The problem is always resolved in the act. It remains to investigate these acts by distinguishing active consciousness reflexive from conscious act, inventive and creative. The active consciousness has a role, inventory, shaping, establishment of the most coherent discourse. The conscious act differs from this. It has two characters, that of being conscious on the basis of a determined and open being, and that of inserting itself into a praxis in order to contribute something new to it. Thus, the conscious act is always transitory. It moves towards the other, the object, the act that modifies this object and appropriates it. It is this act. There are, moreover, degrees of conscious act, degrees of freedom, so that the active consciousness, duplication, reflexivity, is everything that it can be. We have already emphasized the double determination of moments, moments of history, periods, stages, constitutive moments of human being, love, knowledge, play, etc. We discover this notion of double determination everywhere. It permits and presupposes a step forward in the dialecticizing of concepts, the grasping of the real. Dialectical thought that was external, reduced to a reflection, a manichaeism, believed that it grasped entities and the conflictual relations between these entities. Yet no entity, no force, no being is simple, all are double. Purely reflexive determinations taken literally are one-sided because simplified. As we know, linguistics has displayed these dualities, connotations and denotations, signifiers and signified, diachrony and synchrony, non-signifying units and phonemes, signifying units and morphemes, etc. These dualities do not correspond to dialectical relations, they remain formal. They are conceived as oppositions and dichotomies. However, they draw attention to the non-one-sidedness of everything that can be grasped. The forms themselves are double or dual, all the more so do form and content differ, as well as the contents themselves. This dual or double character cannot be identified with the ambiguity that results in certain cases and situations, rather than being the M. Etymorphosis of philosophy, poiesis and M. Etaphilosophy, 321. Origin of this. We express the generality of this fact by positing the principle of double determination. This will display the principle of the meditation we are trying to promote here. According to the principle of double determination, the infinite is in the finite, and the finite in the infinite. Philosophy separates them. The philosopher reflected on them separately. Was this not the essence of metaphysics? The metaphysician stood either at the heart of the infinite not without pretension, and the finite escaped him, or he stood in the finite, and the infinite seemed to him transcendent or ungraspable. We cannot think being either as finite. It is always and everywhere, here and now, infinite, or as infinite. It is always determined, posited, situated, thus finite. This is how the legible truth presents itself. This is how the accessible unity, man-world or praxis nature, offers itself. Freedom can no longer be thought of as either finite or infinite. It is both, and as a consequence always between the two. It is first of all, as thought, negation of what the being was that delivered itself. In the course of this negation, the human being is free, has his degree of freedom of concrete negation. He chooses what he will be. There is risk, wager, quest in the choice. There is ambiguity even in a trenchant decision. In order to act, the human being constructs forms. Between forms and contents, freedom seeks its way and its means. The forms both support it and imprison it. They enclose it in its work. There is thus a perpetual gap, always reborn, between freedom and itself. Hence the malaises, discontents, misunderstandings, disagreements, disarrays, ambiguities that attach to freedom and the trenchant decision. These situations show that freedom is not foundation. It is founded on a foundation of being from which it separated in order to be, that is, to create, to become what the free being was and yet was not. Human freedom involves a liberation in relation to needs. It has to detach itself from them, but only by multiplying them, intensifying them. It does not involve any liberation vis-à-vis desire. On the contrary, it restores this, or rather creates it as desire. Desire supersedes the conflict between essential natural needs and factitious needs, between determinate and thus limited satisfactions and the dissatisfaction that seeks to escape from these limits. It is the same as need and not the same. It does not kill need, it starts from need, supersedes it, and yet returns to the original. In and through love, for example. The nature that it rediscovers is prior to the birth of precise and localized need. Desire is infinite, infinitely vulnerable, yet it bears within it its certainty. Creation and recreation rising back to the source, the heart of the new totality. Is this not Hegel's rose of the world? Hegel was mistaken in finding this flower in knowledge. Marx, in the wake of Goethe, rediscovered it in total life. Culture stands at the level of needs, satisfied or unsatisfied. Style, poiesis, stands at the level of desire. Philosophy, for its part, does not find a place to stand. When it placed freedom at the foundation, it freed this from need and desire. When it took account of needs, it imprisoned man in satisfaction. It left aside desire, uncertainty, and adventure founded on the relative stability of needs, but also on the lack of satisfaction brought by needs, always partial, need for this or that. Here, at the place and moment that we are, metaphilosophical meditation proves to be the restoration of desire, which encompasses the other inaugural and constitutive acts that we have traversed. In the very name of philosophy, the philosopher no longer has any more than a philosophically recognized right. That of envisaging the realization of philosophy, that is, simultaneously its globalization and its withering away, its radical critique and its supersession. The universal that we foreshadow here, in the name of an exploration of its enigmas that starts by denying the mysterious character of its secrets, this universal would obey only one law, the law of the world. The law of the world does not stipulate what the world is or ought to be, but that there are worlds. That is to say, that the finite imitates the infinite according to its capacities, being infinity and finitude, with the result that the two determinations of praxis, mimesis and poiesis, were initially fused together before mimesis separated out, finite in the infinite, subsequently managing to dominate poiesis. Infinite in the finite, with the result finally that each being sees itself as a world, and each finite world must go to the end of its capacity, traverse it and prove itself in praxis through to its term and its end. A finite power only disappears after deploying all its virtualities, after trying to fulfill everything, to call everything to itself. Each power has to proclaim itself and wish itself, and make itself totality, religion, philosophy, economy, state, art, and finally technology. Essence consists in this deployment, and totality in this global process. Each power tends from its side, and for its part towards the great pleonasm through which it supersedes itself, because it loses itself in it as sufficiency. In the course of this deployment, and only after this excessive and illusory proclamation, the negative that this world always already bore within it gnaws at it, dismantles it, destroys it. Only an accomplished totality reveals that it is not totality. Each of the worlds, moments or powers, welds itself or strives to do so. Accomplishment is at the same time defeat. The earth as planet, stable sphere, wandering is the figure, more than figure, and symbol, more than symbol of the law of the world. It bears this, and shows it to us. As Marx saw, in this clarity that we seek to maintain for ourselves, investigation bears on realities and virtualities that are in themselves neither economic, nor sociological, nor psychological, nor political, nor historical in a narrow and partial sense, nor philosophical. They are that, and yet something other, that are sustained and encompassed by the creative capacity, inexhaustible presence of the infinite at the heart of the finite, of its life and its death. Metaphilosophical investigation bears on this poetic power. The law of the world, of what becomes worldly and worldwide mondane and mondial, can be uttered differently. We no longer have to choose between the determinations and propositions that philosophy distinguished, between which the philosopher chose for the needs of his reason. In a sense, up to a certain point, all is total or becomes so, or seeks to become so, every human fact, physical, biological, economic, sociological, etc., and every human work, philosophy, religion, mathematics, the state, art, etc. In a sense too, nothing is total, nothing exhausts the totality. By placing itself within a particular entity, state, philosophy, mathematics, etc., a residue is displayed which becomes essential. Every fact, every work, presents gaps and voids in relation to the virtual totality that never offers itself except fragmentarily. in relation to the infinite that never gives itself except in the finite, the contradictory and determined contradictions. It is scarcely paradoxical to reprise here, on the planetary scale, apropos entities, systems and powers that substantialize, autonomize, and automatize themselves, and apropos those that reject automatism. The illustrious words of Anaximander, with which philosophy began. Whence things have their birth, thence they have their loss, according to necessity, for they give to each other justice and recompense for their injustice, according to the law of the world, loi du monde. 2. Thus philosophy ends with the words that inaugurated it, Strasbourg, August 1963 to November 1964. 12. N. We have translated Lefebvre's translation, which fits with his overall argument, rather than follow an existing English translation. For comparison, see Patricia Curd, a pre-Socratic reader, selected fragment.